Hey everyone, I sincerely appreciate your support. If you enjoy my audiobooks, I would be truly grateful if you could subscribe to the channel. And if you'd like to support even further, you're welcome to become a Patreon member, where you can access audiobooks of novels as long as they are freely available on the internet. Your kindness and support mean so much. Thank you.
Aren't you very different from the rumors? In what way? You're rather bold with a princess. You didn't even ask for permission. You just called it something bad and went ahead. Murrigan, her upper body covered by a blanket, spoke. Robert, clad in a robe, chuckled. She hadn't exactly resisted, had she? He touched his stinging back and frowned, seeing a trace of blood. You seem to enjoy it, more than I expected, actually. That's because it hurt. It was my first time. It was my first time as well. I've never been with my fiancé. He wasn't lying. He hadn't been intimate with Teresa. It was ironic. They had declared their love for each other countless times, yet they had never slept together. This was Robert's first time, and it was with Murrigan. Why was he so experienced? He dismissed the thought. Perhaps it was just good compatibility. He stared at the bite marks on her neck, and Murrigan quickly pulled the blanket up to her chin. She was wearing undergarments. Why was she so shy? They had already seen everything. It had been sudden, but their relationship had undeniably changed. He had confirmed his feelings. This wasn't a fleeting infatuation. They were in love, Murrigan and Robert. Their relationship had started with a brief encounter, but that didn't matter. It was ironic, considering Robert had initially approached her with ulterior motives. Well, it's over now. What's over? Robert sat down on the bed and patted Murrigan's shoulder. She was no longer hiding under the blanket. She was wearing a robe. She flinched at his touch and looked at him. What did he mean, it's over? Did he mean their relationship was over because they had slept together? Her heart pounded nervously. Robert looked at her and spoke. The love play. We can't just keep dancing around our feelings, can we? What do you mean? His words sounded like he wanted to end things, just as she had feared. Her hand, gripping his sleeve, trembled. She opened and closed her mouth several times, speechless, then pushed his hand away. Murrigan, are you breaking up with me? Yes, we can't go back to how things were. It's only natural. It wasn't natural at all. Murrigan frowned. Robert realized she had misunderstood and chuckled softly. He had phrased it poorly. He hadn't meant to break up with her. He had meant to take their relationship to the next level. Murrigan was on the verge of tears. Robert grabbed her wrist and pulled her into a hug. He held her close until her struggles subsided, then stroked her hair and sighed. I seem to have caused a misunderstanding. I didn't mean to say I wanted to forget what happened. You meant what? I want us to officially date. We said we liked each other, but we're not actually dating, are we? Murrigan blinked, nestled in his arms. Had she heard him correctly? He wanted to officially date. Her anger melted away, replaced by a fluttering in her chest as she realized she was in his arms. Officially date. I probably won't be able to announce it publicly right away. There are things I need to do first, and well, His Majesty won't be pleased if we start dating openly. That's true. I want to be in a position where I can be open about it. I want to earn my family's approval, and ideally the emperor's and the crown prince's as well. His words were so earnest. Murrigan met his gaze, then quickly looked away, flustered. She hadn't expected him to suggest they officially date. She couldn't stop herself from smiling. She pushed him away gently and stepped back, trying to compose herself. She had been prepared to be angry, but now she didn't know what to say. I didn't expect you to say that. That's why you were about to get angry. How many women wouldn't misunderstand after being told their relationship is over? You phrased it strangely. I realized that was a mistake. I didn't want to surprise you by suggesting we date right away. But look at you, your face is all red. You're making me embarrassed. She hadn't realized she was blushing until she saw her reflection in the mirror. Her face was crimson. It was difficult to hide her feelings. If even Robert struggled with it, how could she be any different? She touched her cheeks and turned away. Robert chuckled, shrugging. He always found her flustered reactions amusing. Even in this situation, after he had, in a sense, taken a princess's virginity, a rather significant and potentially dangerous act, he felt strangely at ease. He had briefly had a crush on Teresa, but he wouldn't call it his first love. It had been one-sided. So what were these feelings for Murrigan? He decided not to dwell on definitions and instead stepped closer to her. He embraced her from behind, resting his chin on her head, and whispered, I look forward to it. I might be a bit clumsy, but please bear with me. It's my first time. Are you sure it's your first time? You mentioned your fiancé. She grumbled, but there was no real anger in her voice. She wouldn't be upset about his past engagement. She was the one whose feelings had deepened since their first meeting with each encounter. She wouldn't waver now. It's not my first time loving someone, but it is my first love. Few women could resist such a line. Murrigan burst out laughing, and Robert chuckled softly. Now what? He had given a lot of thought to what would happen after they officially started dating. He had been the hunter, but he had become the prey. Still, he had achieved his initial goal of becoming her lover. He had thought long and hard, but ultimately he had to act. Robert's subsequent actions were swift and decisive. It took him a few months to solidify his position within the Taylor family. He readily agreed to Teresa's request for a broken engagement. Rumors of his relationship with the princess spread even before the broken engagement was finalized, but Murugan took care of it. All eyes were on them, the princess and the son of the Taylor family, a family not exactly on good terms with the imperial family. Murugan stood alone on the dais and spoke. I would like to address the rumors regarding my relationship with Robert Taylor. Initially, they had agreed to keep their relationship secret. Public knowledge wouldn't benefit either of them and could be used against them. Robert's engagement to Teresa was a potential problem, so they had agreed to be discreet until the matter was resolved. Police car light, important notice, police car light. But Teresa was gone now. Robert was no longer engaged, and there was no reason for him not to date anyone he chose. And if being a princess was a problem, Murugan would use the full authority of the imperial family to silence any opposition. The stage was set. Why not make their move? They had agreed that if they ever revealed their relationship, they would do it in a way that everyone would know. A relationship known throughout the empire, a love story discussed even by commoners. If the emperor tried to deny it, he would only lose the people's favor. In other words, it's unstoppable. If he wants to deny it, he'll have to deny the hopes and dreams of the entire empire. People were drawn to stories of fated love, especially a love story between a princess and a non-royal, both sharing similar circumstances. How many would oppose them? Murugan looked at the crowd, then smiled and spoke. We are, she imagined the ripple effect of her next words. A thrill ran through her, officially dating. This was just the beginning. The story of Robert and Murugan, the lovers, had only just begun. Whenever everything went smoothly, a sense of unease would creep into his heart. Perhaps it was because of his past experiences. This strange anxiety always accompanied the slow passage of time. He reassured himself that everything would be all right, yet the thought that this might all end soon made it impossible to relax. Your Highness, the position he had gained over time, that of the princess's consort, was more significant than he had anticipated. It didn't mean much now, but it had been a year since he and Murugan had become a couple. Winter was coming, and he would return to square one. He was worried about Keitel's next move. He had been falsely accused of treason in his past lives. He had wondered how Keitel had managed to frame him, but it wouldn't be as easy this time. Accusing the princess's consort of treason? How could such a ridiculous charge be levied against him, especially with their widely publicized romance? But he had died 7 times, and Keitel had been involved in each of those deaths. He couldn't take this lightly. Now that he was deeply involved with the imperial family, he had to watch Keitel's every move. Things seemed fine for now. Keitel was focused on consolidating his power in the north after eliminating the remaining factions. It wouldn't be easy for him to kill the princess's consort now. Knock, knock. His thoughts were interrupted by a knock on the door. He knew who it was without hearing her voice. He smiled and walked towards the door. You seem to have some free time today. You didn't even show your face yesterday. We saw each other in bed. Are you that upset that we didn't see each other for a day? Of course, we're practically newlyweds. We're not newlyweds. We're not married yet. She kissed him lightly, a familiar gesture, then walked over to the sofa and sat down. Murugan's position was no longer what it had been. The north had been stabilized, and the Terranite mines there were now under her control. She had also secured several artifacts from the south, significantly increasing her influence. Some speculated that she was aiming for the throne, but Murugan's reasons were simple. She didn't want him to be looked down upon by the imperial family. He was still in a precarious position within the Taylor family. Murugan seemed to be overly concerned about it. She had taken it upon herself to secure the Crown of Memories and other artifacts related to the 4 dragons from the dangerous south. The imperial family had no choice but to acknowledge her achievements. Meanwhile, he had focused on securing his position within the Taylor family. He wasn't the head yet, but he was in a position where the current head couldn't ignore him. He wasn't just the princess's consort. He had a voice within the Taylor family. He had worked hard to get to this point, so hard that he wondered if he could have avoided all those regressions if he had done this sooner. Perhaps it was because he had something to protect. He had been powerless to protect anyone before, so he had found his own way. What are you thinking about? You seem to be spacing out a lot lately. There's a lot going on. The wedding, the upcoming imperial succession. I'll be there, so clear your schedule. You'll officially be my consort by then. Yes, but it doesn't feel real. Just me then. He hadn't imagined they would be in this position when they first met. He smiled, looking at Murugan's slightly swollen belly. She felt his gaze and smiled, stroking her belly. Their child had played a significant role in his appointment as consort. He hadn't intended to use it that way, but the emperor, who had been hesitant, had readily agreed after hearing about the baby. Perhaps he longed for an heir that Keitel couldn't provide. He still frequently inquired about the child, so they wouldn't have to worry about being mistreated. Even Keitel seemed pleased, but he couldn't let his guard down just yet. He had to be cautious. When I first met you, I thought you might be trying to use me. He flinched at her sudden words, but Murugan continued, tucking her hair behind her ear. It didn't matter anymore. His feelings for her and hers for him were genuine. Even if he had initially approached her with ulterior motives, he was truly in love with her now. He had worked hard to protect her, and he would continue to do so, Even if it meant his own death, he would find a way to ensure Murugan and their child survived. Is that so? I didn't think so after you said you fell in love with me at first sight. Such encounters only happen in novels. I was surprised myself. He felt as if fate had brought them together. It was a storybook romance, just as Murugan had said. He hadn't fallen in love at first sight, but it had only taken him a week to be completely captivated by her. He no longer felt embarrassed saying he loved her. It was as natural as breathing. Murugan had become a part of him. 1 week left until he officially became her consort, until his name was firmly etched within the imperial family. By the way, I have something to tell you. What is it? I love you. It's not very romantic, but it's plenty romantic. Their lips met, a warm, comforting sensation. He wished he could hold on to this warmth forever. I heard you were in the north. I didn't expect you to come all the way here. Secretly, no less. Duke Taylor spoke. The hooded man chuckled softly. The north, that matter had been settled long ago. His plans had been in motion for 3 years. Eliminating Adele Ygritte had been just the beginning. He had already calculated everything, including the north. He had taken care of it personally to expedite the process, to free up his time for his secret activities. The man facing Duke Taylor removed his hood, revealing his long black hair and golden eyes. The insignia on his shoulder identified him as the Crown Prince. The Duke sighed, rubbing his forehead. The Crown Prince's secret visit could only mean one thing. He had opposed the imperial subjugation of the North from the beginning, so perhaps Keitel had decided he had become too powerful. He knew Keitel's approach was far more ruthless than the Emperor's. The Taylor family had vehemently opposed the subjugation because they knew the consequences of expanding the Empire's territory. He wasn't here to discuss that. As the Duke pondered Keitel's intentions, the Crown Prince sat down and stroked his chin. He knew what the Duke was thinking. He was worried about the recent conflicts between the Taylor family and the Imperial family. Not that I care. Conflicts with the nobility were inevitable. The Taylor family was more troublesome than most, but he would have to fight them eventually. He couldn't be bothered with every single conflict. He would prove his point through results, but if the Duke thought that way, Keitel would use it to his advantage. Keitel chuckled softly, then looked at the Duke and spoke in a low voice. You've become quite bold lately. Not only did you oppose the subjugation of the South, but you also defied me in the North, even with the accusation of treason. It was an obvious fabrication. Adele committing treason, no one would believe that. Well, it was a fabrication. I needed her out of the way. Admitting it so readily makes you seem vulnerable. You shouldn't be wasting your time here. I thought you were more astute, but it seems, the Duchess. The single word had a significant impact. Duke Taylor's expression hardened. Keitel smiled faintly and snapped his fingers. You should know why she died. She died of illness. She was always frail. Police car light, important notice, police car light, frail, a convenient excuse. He knew it wasn't true. Keitel's eyes narrowed, and the Duke clenched his trembling hands, trying to maintain his composure. Keitel's aura was chilling, yet he remained calm as he continued. He had come here for a reason, to play his most important card. Robert Taylor, he had to be eliminated, or rather, he shouldn't exist. He had to be driven to his death. It was an instinctive fear, a gut feeling. He knew there was no logical reason, but he couldn't ignore this urge. What do you want? Keitel smiled and gave a short answer. Let's eliminate someone from the Taylor family. I'll make sure there are no repercussions. Just a brief silence. That was all he needed. How can one describe the feeling of realizing the tower you meticulously built is made of sand, honor, power, the stability you sought through any means necessary? It all crumbled in an instant. There had been no warning, just as before. Once again, his life began to unravel for the same reason. Treason. He had been falsely accused, yet the Taylor family offered no defense. He knew how this played out now. No matter how hard he struggled, his death was predetermined, not by divine intervention, but by a conspiracy between Keitel and the Taylor family. Why me? You still haven't accepted reality? You still have the strength to talk after all that? He didn't know how much time had passed. His body was broken beyond repair. The Crown Prince who had visited him during a sleepless night had offered a simple proposition: leave Murugan and the child unharmed and surrender. He knew then that it was over. He had failed again. He had struggled, but he hadn't reached his goal. What had gone wrong? Even as he writhed in pain, his mind raced, searching for the missing piece. He had to try a different approach in the next iteration and the next. But could he exclude Murugan? He couldn't give her up. She had become a part of him. He wondered if he would love her the same way in his next life. He probably wouldn't, unless he loved her even more. You're not answering. Have you finally given up? I suppose so. I knew from the beginning that this was predetermined. He had been suspicious. When he was accused of treason, the Taylor family should have been ruined as well, but they remained untouched. His life, his death, it didn't matter. The Taylor family remained unscathed. He had initially thought they had sacrificed him to preserve their status, offering something in exchange for his life. But he knew now that he was more valuable than that. He held significant power within the Taylor family. How could they remain unaffected by the accusations against him? What did you give them to make them sacrifice me? We didn't want for anything. I don't have to tell you that, do I? I'm talking to a traitor. Thump, thump. Keitel patted his shoulder, chuckling, then sighed and rubbed his face as their eyes met. He had lost all sensation in his body except for his eyes. All his remaining mana burned within them, resonating with something within Keitel. His eyes flickered red, tusk pointless words. Keitel stepped back from the cell bars. He shook his head as if his head was hurting, then pressed his hand against his forehead and continued. Had the red glint in his eyes been a trick of the light, his golden eyes, restored to their normal color, seemed colder now. I thought you would have figured it out by now. You'd be a fool not to. I thought you suspected something when I started dealing with the North. Was I wrong? You were rather obvious. I was prepared, but I guess I was wrong. If you wanted to manipulate someone, you should have chosen me, not Merigen or the Taylors. It's dangerous to infiltrate the imperial family and build your own power base. You knew I wouldn't be a threat. I'm sorry. Keitel grinned cruelly, leaning closer to the bars. He reached out and touched Robert's hair. I don't trust anyone but myself, not even father, not even Merigen. I'll discard anyone I don't need. Merigen, you say? He couldn't hide his concern for Merigen. Keitel chuckled, shrugging. Don't worry. I have no reason to harm my own sister if you're dead. It wouldn't make sense for a brother to harm his family. We're not on bad terms, and she'll be devastated when you're gone. He didn't care if he died. He didn't care if he was tortured, if the pain lingered into his next life. But Merigen, if she suffered, his purpose would change. He would kill Keitel no matter the cost. If Merigen died, his reason for regressing would change. But he couldn't show his anger. It would only provoke Keitel. He could be as subservient as necessary. He suppressed his emotions and stared at Keitel, who pulled away from the bars and looked at him intently. I was planning to break her anyway. Don't you have a more interesting offer? For example, a red glint flickered in his eyes again. Was it a manifestation of Keitel's madness? The Crown Prince, always praised for his composure, was broken inside. No one would consider him sane. He chuckled softly, then met Keitel's gaze, a shiver running down his spine. Was this really Keitel? When had the Crown Prince become so twisted? Beg like a dog and I might spare your life. Like a dog, beg and I'll spare Merigen. I promise you on my name as Crown Prince. Beg, the princess's consort, the son of the prestigious Taylor family. He should be killed, not humiliated. But Keitel seemed to relish the thought. He hesitated. Would begging increase Merigen's chances of survival? He had to try. He had to do everything he could to ensure Merigen's safety after his death. His parched lips parted and a pathetic sound escaped. Woof woof. He didn't feel ashamed. He would crawl on his severed limbs if that's what it took. His pathetic attempt at imitating a dog echoed through the dungeon. Keitel's laughter followed, echoing through the palace. He didn't see Merigen until the day of his execution. That was the condition for her survival. He was given 1 meal a day and barely any water. His throat bled whenever he tried to speak. He had lost his legs and his arms were useless. His empty sockets stared into nothingness. He could only see through one remaining eye. He wondered what Merigen would think if she saw him like this. If it weren't for Uria's previous torture, he wouldn't even have the mental capacity to think of Merigen. He was subjected to verbal abuse. He was used to Uria's insults, but his father's words stung. He didn't understand what was so important about the family name. At least he knew Merigen was safe. He could still speak then, and he had told her he would see her again, hoping she wouldn't realize he was about to die. I won't have a child next time. He wasn't sure if it would be the same child, even if they had another. He had already given their unborn child a name, grown attached, and now he wouldn't even see its face. Would things be different if they had met sooner, had the child earlier? No, he would probably continue to die for a while. He might escape this cycle of regression sooner if he severed his ties with Merigen and found another way, but he was too foolish to abandon her. He would meet Merigen in every life. He didn't know how long these feelings would last, but she had become more important to him than anything else. There were so many places he hadn't been, so many words he hadn't said. Would he be able to express everything when they met again? No, that would be difficult. Police car light, important notice, police car light. He would die many more times. Could he ensure Merigen wouldn't grieve even as he suffered? He would try. He would strive for a future where he and Merigen could find happiness. When a small light touched his eye, he knew it was his last day. What would he say to her when they met again in his next life, and the next? And finally, when the regressions ended, what would he say? He hadn't found the answer by the time the executioner's blade touched his neck, his eyes meeting Merigen's. He died countless more times until he finally reached his 35th iteration. He started his new life, still unable to express everything he wanted to tell her. What will I do this time? As always, he woke up in his bed on a summer day, 20 years old, a strange sensation washing over him. Perhaps it was a warning of the future to come. He had to be careful. He hoped she wouldn't grieve, even when the story reached its end. It was difficult to speak of this with a smile. It was, after all, a tragic past. He didn't know when it started. Around the time he began to question his life with Merigen, he started to doubt if he was on the right path. Could he love Merigen and end the regressions at the same time? He had died dozens of times trying to find the answer, yet he was still trapped in this endless cycle. His head throbbed. Nothing he did made a difference. No matter how hard he struggled, he always ended up dead. He had begged like a dog, crawled on his knees, tried to unravel the Crown Prince's schemes, but everything always went wrong at the last moment, as if he knew everything. He didn't know how much Keitel knew, but he was certain Keitel was anticipating his every move. How? And more importantly, why was he so fixated on him? He hadn't opposed Keitel's plans. He had even tried abandoning everything, taking Muradin and living a quiet life away from power, but Keitel had still killed him. He and Muradin were husband and wife again, but his main concern was Keitel's movements. He had gone to the north. He was probably meeting with his father or plotting something. He had killed him even after he had prevented their meeting in a previous iteration. He had already addressed the known causes of his death and even planted a spy near Keitel to anticipate any unforeseen circumstances. There had been no indication that his spy had been discovered. If Keitel knew, he would have killed him easily. He had planted the spy to gain information, after all. He had learned that Keitel had been killing an alchemist named Jay repeatedly during his travels. He had let it slide because he couldn't save her without jeopardizing Muradin, but he planned to try and save her eventually. Keitel's obsession with killing her suggested she knew something he wanted to keep hidden. His head was spinning. He still hadn't figured out how much Keitel knew. He could only be certain of a few things. He counted them on his fingers, then sighed, rubbing his face. He didn't expect this to change anything. He was grasping at straws, his hopes dwindling. He regretted neglecting Muradin in the process, but this was the only way to ensure their survival. He was on the verge of madness, clinging to the belief that his actions were justified. He had died countless times in front of Muradin. He would have been even more broken if he had witnessed her death. What had happened to Muradin after his death? Was their child still alive? He had been overjoyed to become a father, but he had died before he could even raise his child. That was why he had stopped having children with Muradin. He would only have another child when these regressions ended. He stared into space. The weight of his accumulated deaths was crushing him. He couldn't love Muradin the way he had in the beginning, couldn't be as passionate. He felt guilty, so he avoided seeing her. Muradin was in the south. She would be returning this evening. He stared at the setting sun, then a sudden thought made him stand. I should get her a gift. He had seen something she liked, but he hadn't been able to buy it for her because of his worries. He had regretted it after seeing her disappointed expression. She would be pleased if he gave it to her as a welcome home gift. Seeing Muradin's smile made these regressions bearable. His mind, slowly decaying from the accumulated deaths, felt cleansed whenever he was with her. He could endure anything as long as Muradin was by his side. He would even do Keitel's bidding. If his current plan failed, he would consider becoming Keitel's confidant in the next iteration. Keitel wouldn't be able to target him directly if he was close to him. He waved to the soldiers who greeted him and walked towards the shop they had visited together. He would be able to return just in time if he bought the trinket now. He knew Muradin's schedule. His steps were lighter than usual. The thought that this piece would shatter filled him with dread, but thinking of Muradin calmed him. She was his anchor. It was ironic that a single woman could resolve most of his problems, but after living dozens of lives intertwined with hers, it made sense. He was already offering the gold coins before he even asked the price. He had intended to buy it regardless of the cost, but he was surprised by how inexpensive it was. It was too modest a gift for a princess, but she had wanted it, so he would give it to her. He pocketed the trinket, then a sudden chill made him turn. Caw, a crow cawed. Crows were considered bad omens in the empire. They were said to be harbingers of misfortune. They were creatures of the night, disappearing like shadows under the moonlight. The ominous sound, echoing from beyond the palace walls, filled him with unease. It's not time yet. Muradin wasn't due back for a while. He dismissed his worries and continued walking. Then he heard a frantic voice. Disaster, disaster. Whoosh, flames engulfed the palace. The sudden inferno was so intense that even his mana-insensitive body reacted to the surge of magical energy. What was happening? As his mind reeled, a knight grabbed his sleeve, his face pale with fear. A chilling premonition washed over him. A coldness gripped his throat and his breath felt like scorching lava. In that fleeting moment, he heard the knight's words, and his body reacted instinctively, sprinting faster than ever before. Her Highness, she's been attacked. Logic and impulse. Keitel considered himself a rational man. He had believed that until 2 years ago. He had become somewhat emotional since he started handling the residual thoughts of the 4 dragons, but it was a minor side effect. He had deemed it an acceptable risk. He remained silent about the things he did unconsciously. Did I kill this person? Yes, Your Highness, you said you didn't like them. I don't have a hobby of killing people. Blood on his hands, flesh clinging to his sword. He would often wake up to scenes like this. It hadn't been this bad before. The frequency of these episodes was increasing. He had been fine when he first received the residual thoughts, but the changes were accelerating. He used to lose control once a year, but now it happened several times a week. His eyes would turn red and he would go on a rampage. He had to hide this if he wanted to become emperor. That was why he had recruited the masked figures. He had been suspicious when they approached him, offering to help him research the residual thoughts of the 4 dragons, but they were more efficient than any of his other subordinates. They helped him control his impulses, preventing him from killing people when he lost control, protecting him from the influence of the 4 dragons. He was the crown prince, the future emperor. He had to maintain perfect composure. Everything was going according to plan. Once Robert Taylor was eliminated, everything would be fine. Why do I have to kill Robert Taylor? He asked himself in a low voice, and a sharp pain shot through his head. His eyes, reflected in the mirror, were crimson. The red glow intensified, as if trying to extinguish the fleeting gold within them. The dark room was illuminated by the eerie light. Whatever the reason, Robert Taylor had to die. The reason didn't matter. Robert Taylor was meant to be broken. He was the only one who could potentially ruin him in the long run. He had to crush his spirit before that happened. It seems you're losing your mind, Your Highness. I'm fine, I'm the Crown Prince. Then can you clearly state your current objective? Strange thoughts of eons and forgotten times swirled in his mind. He shook his head, trying to clear his thoughts, then spoke. His plan to break Robert Taylor. He seemed obsessed with ending the regressions, but Murugan was his weakness. His sister, she would be instrumental in his future plans after he became emperor. He would give her the North and conquer the South together. No, she was a sacrifice necessary for Robert Taylor's demise. His eyes turned crimson again, and Kane smiled, seemingly pleased. What are you going to do? I'll kill him. Everything is for the Empire. Even my sister, she can't be an obstacle. He was slowly forgetting whose plan this was. He stared at the flames engulfing the palace, rubbed his crimson eyes, and chuckled softly. He had been living in a fantasy. He knew that his struggles were futile, that his death was inevitable, yet he had clung to the naive belief that Murugan would be safe as long as they were together. Murugan, burning debris struck his shoulder. He didn't feel the pain as blood flowed from the cuts and burns. He was too focused on finding Murugan walking through the inferno. His clothes caught fire and the scorching heat dried his eyes. He no longer had tears to shed. He rubbed his bleeding eyes, his vision blurring, and looked around. Crackle. The sound of burning wood filled the air. The silence was deafening, amplifying his sense of helplessness. If he had been able to sense mana like a knight, he wouldn't be wandering aimlessly like this. If he had been faster, if he had sensed the attack sooner, he dug his nails into his flesh, regret gnawing at him. Tears of blood streamed down his face, his lips twisted in a grimace of anguish. None of this would have happened if he had given up on Murugan sooner. He had promised to make her happy, but it always ended in tragedy. Nothing ever changed. Murugan always witnessed his death. If only time could be reversed. It wasn't that simple, he remembered. No matter how many times time reversed, he remembered. Could he truly erase those memories? He had been living in denial, pretending he was fine, believing he could continue to love her with the same intensity, even though he knew it was impossible. He hadn't realized he had become complacent. If he had continued to love her with the same fervor as in the beginning, he wouldn't have left to buy her a gift. This was the first time he hadn't been there when she returned. He had been careless, foolish, but self-blame wouldn't change anything. He had learned one thing during his 35 lives: how to channel his mana. He had avoided using force. His body was too weak to wield a sword effectively. He hadn't made any progress in a year. He had given up, thinking it was a waste of time, but what did it matter now? If he had even the slightest ability to deflect these flames with his sword, he wouldn't feel so helpless. He could only run. He overturned debris with his bleeding hands, following the ominous trail of blood. He prayed she was alive. If she had been lucky enough to find shelter, to escape unharmed, that would be enough. She could resent him, blame him for his incompetence, for not being there. As long as she was alive, please let her injuries be minor. He prayed, invoking the name of the god he had so often cursed in his past lives. He clutched the rosary he had received from the church. Murugan. He gritted his teeth, a spark grazing his forehead as silence met his desperate calls. She had to be alive. She had never died before. He clung to that belief, to the memories of his past lives, despite having no proof. This feels familiar. I've never been here before. Have you been here before? He hadn't answered. He couldn't tell her he had been there with her in a past life. He often found himself lost in bittersweet memories when he revisited places he had been to in his previous lives. He wondered how she felt, seeing him with a melancholic expression when she smiled at him the way she had in his memories. He hadn't understood then. I'm happy just being with you. I was a little surprised at first, but I can't dislike someone who loves me. She had accepted him despite his sudden advances without any explanation. She had never accused him of using her, even though she had every right to. After they became lovers, he had spent most of his time in her room, plotting against Keitel, yet she had never complained. You love me, don't you? When had she started asking that question? After he had died 10 times as her lover. He had been annoyed by her question then, but now he understood. His steps faltered. He had already realized what was happening. The debris thinned as he walked, revealing the pale starlight above. The red glow intensified. He stepped in puddles of blood, his expression hardening as if someone deeply wounded had barely managed to move. An unseasonably cold wind blew. The cold sweat on his forehead froze, his breath misting in the air. The blood on his body congealed. A tingling sensation spread from his fingertips up his spine, and then he saw her. Murugan, Murugan. He whispered her name, the name he had cried out hundreds of times in this short span of time. She lay in a pool of blood. The sight filled him with denial. It couldn't be. He had only been gone for a few minutes. This had never happened before. He reached out and touched her cheek, usually warm, now cold. He pulled her into his arms, her body lifeless. Murugan was dying. The thought echoed in his mind, but he couldn't comprehend it. He stroked her lips, which were moving slightly, his gaze fixed on nothingness. Robert, you came. Murugan, what? What should he have done? Where had he gone wrong? Her eyes were dull, lifeless, but she seemed to know where he was. Her hand reached out and touched his cheek. It was cold. He felt the blood soaking his clothes. He tried to stop the bleeding, but it was useless. There were too many wounds. Had Kyril done this? He asked urgently, and Murugan replied weakly that she hadn't seen her attacker. She had woken up after being knocked unconscious. The fire had been set to cover up the attack. She had been stabbed and left for dead. It was too late. He laughed hollowly, his fists clenched so tightly that his nails drew blood. He forced a smile. He didn't want Murugan to see his despair. He knew his smile looked unnatural. It's my fault. It's not your fault. These things happen in royal families. It's not your fault. I was just unlucky. That's not. Don't blame yourself. You know I can't talk much now. Will you listen? He swallowed his words, and Murugan's expression softened. She reached out and touched his cheek. The cold touch almost made him burst into tears. He bit his lip, and Murugan chuckled weakly. I'm worried about you. You'll blame yourself when I'm gone. You'll try to do everything yourself. I won't. Liar. They both knew he was lying. If Murugan died, he would blame himself forever. Nothing would change. He would find her killer and take revenge. He would gain power. He would only confess his love to her again when he was ready. Nothing would ever change. You always overreact whenever I get hurt. You lock yourself in your room trying to figure out what went wrong. I've never blamed you. This isn't a lie, it's true, okay? I know, you've always said that. I'm sorry for leaving first. He wanted to argue to tell her she was wrong, but her fading pulse silenced him. Murugan was dying. She would be gone tonight. He would see her again when he regressed, but this Murugan, the 35th Murugan, would die before him. This unchanging fact would haunt him forever. I have something to say. Can I tell you? You can. He took a deep breath, trying to control his emotions. Murugan smiled faintly and stroked his hair. I've always wanted to say this. When we first met, you were the only one who confessed. It bothered me. I never told you I liked you. He knew she had been uncomfortable with his one-sided confessions and their subsequent encounters, unlike their first meeting. But he had reassured her, knowing her feelings. They had lived like that, shared several lives like that. How would he react if he knew what she was about to say? Would he break, or would he be able to stand again? He wasn't sure, but he wouldn't stop her. I liked it when you said you fell in love with me at first sight, something I've only read in novels. Is that so? I wanted to say it too, but I'm not good with words, so I'll confess a little awkwardly. I hope you like it. I really wanted to say this. Her pale lips moved and a faint whisper escaped, a whisper only he could hear. Robert, blood welled up in her mouth. He panicked, but Murugan smiled faintly, stopping him. Her lips twitched, then stilled as if she had used all her remaining strength. Can I like you? He couldn't speak. He was too choked with tears, wiping them away frantically. He couldn't answer her last question. He could have told her 1,000 times that she could like him, but she couldn't hear him anymore. Her soul had left her cold body. His words couldn't reach her. You told me not to blame myself, so I won't. He wouldn't blame himself. He would honor her wish, but he would curse his weakness. He would resent his powerlessness, his inability to protect the woman he loved. Plunge. He plunged the sword into his heart. It was a simple act. He had lived through countless happy fantasies, so this pain was nothing. If his weak body couldn't wield a sword, he would find another way to reach her. Somehow, he would find a way. He swore his 35th self that he would save her next time. He regained his senses after taking his own life several times. He couldn't continue like this. He had become numb to death, a small mercy. He could maintain his composure even with a blade at his throat. He could plan his next move even as he died. It was an impulsive decision, but he grabbed a few swords and fled, seeking refuge in the remote mountains of the east, far from the Empire. The rugged terrain offered him the seclusion he needed. This was the first time he had left the Empire. He didn't want to waste time wondering what to do. He picked up a sword. He didn't just want to be proficient. He wanted to master the blade, even if it killed him. Could he do it? He didn't entertain the possibility of failure. He would make the impossible possible. He knew he lacked talent. His body trembled when he held a sword, unable to channel his strength. A year of practice had yielded minimal results. He wouldn't improve much even after a decade. He restricted his food intake to sharpen his senses. He had brought enough money to buy food, but he chose to forage instead. He starved if he couldn't find anything. He had initially relied on the food he had brought, but he eventually stopped eating altogether, his body becoming emaciated. He felt like he was starving to death. He realized later that his approach had been wrong. His malnourished body couldn't develop properly. Still, he practiced every day until he collapsed. He had no teacher. His previous teachers had given up on him. He assumed any new teacher would do the same. He mimicked the movements of the knights he had observed. He swung his sword, drawing lines in the air. He knew he wouldn't improve much this way. He lacked talent. It took him a month to master a simple movement that others could learn in a day. He persisted out of sheer stubbornness. If a simple movement took him a month, he would repeat it countless times until he could move on to the next. He analyzed the knight's movements, trying to understand the principles behind them. Sometimes understanding the theory allowed him to learn faster. One day he realized he had died of exhaustion. He saw the familiar ceiling and chuckled hollowly. His swordsmanship remained, but his body had reverted to its weak initial state. He fled the Empire again, seeking a new training ground. This time he wanted to test his skills. He didn't need to fight honorably if he could protect someone. Winning was all that mattered, even if it meant resorting to dirty tricks. He encountered a group of bandits and barely survived. He realized he was still far from his goal and returned to the mountains. Not enough. He had almost died fighting bandits. He was nowhere near the level of the knights he admired. Even ordinary knights could single-handedly defeat a group of bandits. He had been training for 5 years, and this was the result. He cut his hair, renewing his resolve. He wouldn't be discouraged by a single setback. He continued to train. He practiced from sunrise to sunset. He didn't stop, even when his body was drenched in sweat and blood, even when he shivered in the rain. He wouldn't give up. He hadn't picked up a sword for such trivial reasons. The memory of Muradin's death haunted him. He couldn't forget. He fought the urge to end his own life, but it would be a waste to die now. He hadn't mastered the blade yet. Why give up? It was an obsession bordering on madness, to be consumed by the sword. He had abandoned everything else, dedicating his life to the pursuit of swordsmanship. He looked around and realized the trees, once dense, had thinned. It was time to move on. He had died 4 times here, spending 20 years in these mountains. He knew it wasn't enough, but he couldn't improve any further on his own. He needed to test his skills against others. He had learned that he had no talent for the sword, but he had a good eye. He had a photographic memory. That was how he had been able to mimic the knight's movements. He still flinched whenever he heard Muradin's name in the news from the capital. He had tried to forget, but he couldn't. It was pathetic, living in the past. He was the only one who remembered. She would probably dismiss it as a fantasy if he told her, yet he couldn't forget. He rubbed his forehead, then sighed, running a hand down his face. This was his choice, to carry the burden of his memories. He would never forget. He hoped that if he ever lost himself in this pursuit, if he ever forgot his original purpose, he would die by her hand. He picked up his sword again. The title of Sword Saint had never been bestowed upon anyone in the history of the continent. There had been discussions of awarding the title to those who reached a certain level of mastery, but even the legendary King of Knights had refused it. A being as revered as a celestial star, yet no one knew what level of skill was required to earn such a title, until the day a unit of the Imperial Army was annihilated. 300 knights annihilated, by a single man, Your Majesty. The surviving soldier described him as a madman. Keitel, now Emperor, chuckled dryly. This had happened just as the unification of the continent was within his grasp. His subordinates cowered at his laughter, remembering his madness from his days as Crown Prince, who knew how many more he would kill if he was displeased. A red glint flickered in his golden eyes, the symbol of the imperial family, then vanished. He looked at the kneeling knight and spoke. Is the knight commander dead as well? Why, yes, Your Majesty. He was killed in a single blow. The other knights were thrown into disarray. If we assemble another force, enough, how pathetic. He didn't know the identity of the madman who had defeated his knights, but he had a feeling he knew who it was, a name that had been haunting him. He whispered the name, Robert Taylor, and chuckled softly. So he had been training. He wondered what kind of chaos Robert Taylor's return after 10 years of absence would bring. He rose from his throne, ordered the Grand General to lead the subjugation force. The name that came to mind was Muradin, the current Grand General who had led the Imperial Army since he became Emperor. She was far more skilled than the deceased knight commander. If even Muradin couldn't defeat him, he would have to mobilize the entire Imperial Army. He smiled, looking at Muradin, who bowed her head with her usual impassive expression. He didn't understand why he was smiling. He should be furious at Robert Taylor for killing his knights, yet he found himself amused by the thought of their reunion. Is the madness returning? Muradin stared at Keitel for a moment, then sighed and left the throne room. She knew he was unstable, but his reaction to this incident was strange. She had never understood his thoughts or why he had appointed her as Grand General in the first place. It's the first time His Majesty has ordered you to personally lead a subjugation force. I know, he usually sends someone else. I wonder why he chose me. It's a good opportunity to earn some merit. There haven't been many battles since the subjugation of the South. Merit. Muradin wasn't interested in war. She would have resigned long ago if she hadn't discovered her unexpected talent for swordsmanship. She had only practiced swordsmanship for self-defense before Keitel became emperor. She still didn't understand why he had appointed her as Grand General. Muradin received the report from her adjutant and frowned, seeing the name written in the document. She had been told the attacker's identity was unknown. Why was his name here now? Robert Taylor, she whispered the name, then her eyes widened in realization. Isn't he the one who ran away with a few swords? Why did he kill the knights? Who knows? He's being called a madman, so perhaps there's a reason. It was reckless to assemble a subjugation force without any information. They had to gather intel on this madman. They couldn't afford to waste time. Reports poured in from all over the empire. The problem was they were all outlandish tales that belonged in fairy tales. Muradin sighed, rubbing her forehead, looking at the pile of reports. Was this a joke? Did they expect her to believe this? A single man clearing an entire mountain. There was even a legend about him obliterating a mountain in the east with a single sword strike. I ask for information, not children's stories. I wish that were the case, but these are the only credible reports we have. Muradin looked at her adjutant Loken skeptically, then picked up a report and started reading. The reports described a man who single-handedly slaughtered countless soldiers, achieving feats beyond human capability with a single sword. She had never heard of such things, even in ancient legends. One soldier even claimed to have seen a cleanly bisected mountain. Murugan touched her sword, a strange feeling unsettling her. She was annoyed by her own unease and by the existence of such a man. They expected her to face this monster, even with her elite troops. This was a suicide mission. She couldn't comprehend the extent of Robert Taylor's power, so she decided to examine the images captured by the mage who had been dispatched to the scene. Magic could reveal traces of the battle. Police car light, important notice, police car light. It was absurd to send an army against a single man, but it was better to be safe than sorry. But what she saw defied belief. They want me to subjugate this? She couldn't believe it. Even the most skilled swordsmen had limits. They could kill people, but that was it. They couldn't cut down castles, and they certainly couldn't defeat monsters larger than themselves. The image showed a mountain that had vanished from the map. A single sword strike altering the landscape. Was that even possible? Loken gasped, remembering a passage from a childhood book. A passage that described the ultimate swordsman, one who could cleave mountains, as worthy of the most glorious title. Sword Saint. He wondered who was actually being subjugated. The desolation was palpable. There was no sign of life. Realizing he had created this wasteland himself, he felt a sense of emptiness. He had swung his sword to reach a higher level, but he was losing sight of his goal. When he had finished off the knights, he had deliberately let one escape. He knew they would send a subjugation force. He had chuckled when he heard that the Grand General was Murugan. How had someone who had only swung a sword for self-defense become the Grand General? Keitel had become emperor, and his cruelty had remained unchanged. What had twisted him? He had been intelligent but not cruel. Why had he suddenly subjugated the North? Why was he so eager to kill him? His gaze swept across the horizon, spotting the approaching subjugation force. Murugan's subjugation force. His grip on his sword tightened. The sword he had picked up in the east had never broken. It was probably a famous sword, but he didn't know its name. It had been able to withstand his power, unlike his other swords, which would often shatter from the force of his swings. It's been years. He hadn't seen Murugan since her death. He had always left the tailors to train with his sword. He had recently started to gather information about her, but that was all. She seemed to be doing well. He hoped she hadn't been injured on the battlefield with so many lives lost. He hadn't needed to kill the knights. The problem was they had been incredibly hostile towards him. They had had the same red glow in their eyes as the knights he had encountered before. The approaching force didn't seem to have that aura, but the first group of knights hadn't either. He wasn't sure what to say to Murugan. She didn't know him. She might consider him a powerful enemy. The Murugan he knew was no more. He knew it, but he couldn't accept it. What should he call this feeling? As the wind rustled his hair, he smiled, seeing her face. He might have looked somewhat decent if he had shaved, but he was the only one experiencing these complicated emotions. He's smiling, even when facing the subjugation force. 500, it wasn't a daunting number. He knew his own strength. He knew the power of a single sword strike that could cleave a mountain and the gap between him and others. He was the strongest swordsman in the world. But he wasn't here to kill them. He felt this life was coming to an end. He had to let go of his attachments. He placed his hand on the hilt of his sword, and all the knights drew their weapons. He saw Murugan's tense expression and smiled. He knew he wasn't in a pleasant situation. Should he flee, or should he defeat them all and head to the capital? He pondered his options, then sighed, a self-deprecating smile on his lips. Ultimately, it would all depend on Murugan. He had always been weak in front of her. He wondered if his sword would slow down when she was near. The knights felt a terror that transcended anything they had ever experienced. Their bodies trembled at the mere sight of him. Every time Robert's sword moved, they checked if their heads were still attached to their bodies. They had heard about his feat of bisecting a mountain and slaughtering 500 knights. The knights, fueled by their ambition, drew their swords, their hands trembling with fear. They couldn't move rashly. Loken had warned them about the Sword Saint before the battle. Don't blink. Even a fraction of a second is enough for you to die. The Empire's expansion had hardened the knights. They had faced hundreds, even thousands of opponents, yet this was different. This was in a completely different league. Grind. Robert drew a line on the ground and looked at the knights. They were too nervous to fight effectively. Even if they were elite, they couldn't fight at their best in their current state. He intended to subdue them if they didn't attack first. He looked at Murugan, then took a few steps towards her, his sword in hand. He stopped, close enough for her to hear him. Murugan flinched, realizing he was looking at her. There was a strange emotion in his eyes, but she realized it was a sign of goodwill. Why was he showing her goodwill? Before she could fully grasp the question, Robert spoke. I'm glad you're doing well. He had taken up the sword to protect her, but he had strayed from that path. He had become too distant from her. He had probably died over 20 times since then, almost 100 years in total. He looked at Murugan, then his gaze drifted into space. If he let things be, the knights would have their way. He was speaking to a Murugan he knew, a Murugan who no longer existed. He had been expecting this reaction. It made him feel strangely at peace. What would happen if he fled now? Would Keitel leave Murugan alone if she returned empty-handed? You wouldn't understand. It's a story only I know. a story of a man trapped in an eternal loop, a man who had become obsessed with a woman. It was a boring story that no one would care about, a story that wouldn't earn him any sympathy. But he hadn't wanted anyone to understand him. He had only wanted to protect her, to ensure he could protect her when they met again. That was why he had picked up the sword. Thump! Robert's lips twisted as he sliced through an approaching knight. He was the only one who was free amidst the chaos. The knight's eyes were turning red again, filled with madness. He and Muradin were the only rational people here. Why were the knight's eyes like that? They had been trembling with fear just moments ago, but now they were all trying to kill him. Is Keitel behind this? He wasn't sure. He didn't know what Keitel was planning. Perhaps he would understand if he found the alchemist Arwen whom Keitel had been trying to kill, or maybe he would find a clue elsewhere. The saint, or perhaps he would find a connection in the north. He had no attachments to this life. He would be satisfied if Muradin was safe and happy. If she completed her mission and returned to the palace unscathed, he would be content. What's your name? Robert asked, looking at Loken, who had stopped approaching. He knew Loken wouldn't understand. His eyes were already red. But he didn't like the fact that he was standing next to Muradin. Thump! He wouldn't kill the knights here. He didn't want Muradin to be blamed for their deaths. He roughly subdued Loken, then looked at Muradin. Her expression was more complicated now. He had seen some of that emotion before. They would all look dead until the end of this fight. She would hate him for that, and if she killed him because of it, it would be the perfect death. He wouldn't blame her. He would be happy if that's how his life ended. He had lived for too long. He would finally be free. I'll see you again, I promise. He looked at her, his eyes full of a complex emotion. He wouldn't see her for a long time when he started his next life. He would have to find a way to escape this cycle of regressions without her. He hoped that when they met again, this curse would be over. Then he could have a child and live happily without worry. His 35th life, where he had lost her, and his 55th, where he would die by her hand, were the most beautiful deaths in Robert's memories. And that was why he wanted to tell her. He had never resented her. He had smiled even as she killed him. He didn't want her to grieve. I never resented you, Muradin. Robert murmured, stroking Muradin's body as he finished his story. Will she be all right? The thought echoed in his mind, but he knew the question was pointless. She wouldn't be all right. If someone else recalled the memories that Adriana had seen, they would be shattered. He had been jealous. He had been forced to witness the deep bond she shared with others. He wished he had been a part of it, but there was nothing he could do to change the past. He could only focus on the present. He had never expected that others would regain their memories. He had seen it through the casket of memories, but if someone else recalled their past lives, they would be in immense pain. Adele might be able to endure it, but Muradin, who had spent so much time with Robert, would surely break. How many women could withstand the guilt of killing the man they loved with their own hands? Robert's arrival in the capital had triggered a series of rapid changes. The masked figures, the crown prince Keitel, the 4 dragons. No one else seemed to realize the danger posed by the 4 dragons except for Robert. Adriana, who had heard Robert was heading towards the capital, stared into space, her expression cold. Sometimes it was better to remain ignorant. She wouldn't be experiencing this feeling of loss if she hadn't read Robert's memories. Muradin was probably enduring that same agonizing pain right now. It would be excruciating. She would probably tear her own heart out, her body covered in wounds. If there was such a thing as a fated connection, it was between those two. Their bond was so deep that the pain that came with it was unbearable. She didn't like it. She didn't like that she was shut out, that Robert and Muradin, Robert and Adele shared emotions she could never experience. But she couldn't hate them for that. Perhaps there would be a future where they could laugh together. She wasn't even sure if they would remain by Robert's side in this life. Adriana worried about one thing. She worried that Muradin would be so broken that she might never recover, that Robert would be devastated by the sight. She could deal with everything else. She might be harboring selfish emotions for a servant of God, but she had no intention of abandoning her feelings. Her faith had started to change after she had seen Robert's past, after she had realized her own feelings for him. I'll pray for you, even if it doesn't help. She hoped everything would return to normal, that the destiny starting to take shape would lead Robert Taylor to his desired outcome. The rosary in her hand glowed, bathing the dark room in a radiant light. The sensation of a blade piercing her flesh, tearing through bone and muscle, the feeling of blood flowing and a life ending, a normal person would go mad. Even skilled knights sometimes faltered after killing their first person. She was slowly becoming accustomed to that feeling. She had experienced too many lives where she had never met Robert. The feeling of killing someone she loved with her own hands. How could she remain sane? She couldn't lift her head. She knew Robert was there, but she couldn't face him. She had seen his suffering, and she couldn't pretend to be unaffected. He had told her not to blame herself, but his words had only made her feel worse. He had suffered for centuries while she had been at peace. Could she say she understood his pain? Could she ask for forgiveness and ask him to love her again? It was impossible. Red blood flowed from her trembling lips. She had tried to forget the memories, but the pain only made them more vivid. She had beheaded the man who had smiled at her. She had loved him, but she had killed him out of resentment. Her legs trembled, and she was about to collapse when Robert caught her. He sighed softly. Are you all right? Ugh, ah. She couldn't speak properly. Her mind was crumbling. Her eyes were empty as she silently confessed her sins. She had realized her fantasies were real. She couldn't help but blame herself, even if Robert didn't. Merigen's feelings for Robert were just as intense as his for her. The man she had met when she was worried about her position. The man she had encountered in a fated meeting where they had shared a fairy tale romance. The happiness she had felt when they first met was the most fulfilling in all her lives. That feeling had never changed. Sometimes she had seen Robert confessing his love in the palace. Sometimes they had met at the same ball. Robert had been an ideal lover. He had never lost his temper and had always shown her a smiling face. But the Robert she remembered from this life was different. He was dark, empty, and devoid of emotion. He was more likely to frown than to smile. She had been worried about him, thinking he was close to death, but she now realized it was all her fault. She knew he wouldn't blame her. She had lived countless lives with him. She knew his heart, but she couldn't help but feel guilty when he held her. The blue eyes that gazed at her were filled with so much concern that it made her heart ache. She had been silent for so long, but she finally looked up. It hurt to meet his gaze, but she knew she couldn't keep avoiding it. Robert. She wanted to say sorry, but the words wouldn't come. Every time she looked into his eyes, she was reminded of all the lives they had shared. The deaths he had endured, the pain she had witnessed. She had watched him die countless times at the hands of Keitel. He had been falsely accused of treason, tortured, and killed, and she hadn't even known. How could she not blame herself? You don't have to say anything. He knew what she was thinking. He knew she was seeing the past when she looked at him. He had been worried since he had sensed she had regained her memories. He knew she would blame herself. That was why he had told her that he didn't resent her. But seeing her break down like this made him uneasy. You don't have to apologize. She had done nothing wrong. It was he who had tried to die by her hand. If he had died alone or if he had paid more attention to her, she wouldn't be suffering like this. You don't have to feel sorry. He knew that saying these words wouldn't instantly restore their previous relationship. He could feel her struggling to get away, even as he held her tightly. It might be counterproductive, but he needed to say it. But the distance between them widened. Merigen pushed away Robert's arms, refusing to say anything. She knew if she smiled at him, they could return to their previous lives. I'm sorry. Her voice trembled. Her vision was blurry. She saw Robert die again and again, his head severed. Only darkness remained. She hesitated to reach out to him, as if she was afraid of what she might do. I'm sorry. I'm sorry. Her feelings for Robert remained. She had fallen for him again in this life, and her feelings had intensified after regaining her memories. That was why it hurt so much. How could she explain the guilt of killing the person she loved? She felt a tingling in her ears, and his usually empty eyes looked like a bottomless abyss. She had killed him again and again. Because of her, because she had wanted to be with him. She knew that it was difficult to bridge the distance between them, but she didn't know if she could approach him again. She needed time to heal until she had the courage to face him again. Merigen walked towards the door, glancing at Robert. She couldn't look him in the eye. If she did, the hot breeze would feel cold. The world was darkening, the darkness almost complete. She couldn't imagine Robert's expression. She was afraid to look at him. Her hand trembled, then she clenched it and dropped it to her side. She was too ashamed to say anything. She didn't know how long it would take her to heal. She walked away, a small tear running down her cheek. Her lips were white from biting them. Her face was a mess. She just wanted to be alone. She wasn't sure if she could talk to him again. She would be sorry for the rest of her life. Thump. She heard her footsteps echoing, walking through the empty corridor. Police car light, important notice, police car light. She heard a ringing in her ears. She chuckled, walking away from him. The further she walked, the louder her sobs became. She was sorry. She was sorry, but she could never be forgiven. She wondered if she could ever understand Robert's feelings. She was unworthy of him. She had killed him and would never be able to make amends. She thought that as her legs gave out. She knew she was going to fall, but she had wanted to. The pain of recalling the memories was too much to bear, but as if denying her wish, she realized someone had caught her. She chuckled softly. It was probably a nearby servant. She quickly covered her face, afraid of scaring them. You don't have to hide your face. His voice was gentle, familiar. She had heard it so many times. When Merigen opened her eyes, she saw blue eyes, but these eyes weren't empty. They were filled with so many emotions, just like in her memories. They were sparkling like jewels, like a sapphire with a touch of water. Robert slowly stroked her messy cheek. He had intended to let her leave, but he had changed his mind. When would he see her again if he let her go? He wouldn't let her go. He had resolved to end the regressions. He wouldn't abandon everything he loved. He wouldn't postpone it any longer. Merigen would be in pain, and she might remain in pain forever. Was it selfish to want to ease her suffering? If it was, he would be selfish. He had always been weak in front of her, but he would not back down this time. He would not yield. Will she be all right? The thought echoed in his mind, but he knew the question was pointless. She wouldn't be all right. If someone else recalled the memories that Adriana had seen, they would be shattered. He had been jealous. He had been forced to witness the deep bond she shared with others. He wished he had been a part of it, but there was nothing he could do to change the past. He could only focus on the present. He had never expected that others would regain their memories. He had seen it through the crown of memories, but if someone else recalled their past lives, they would be in immense pain. Dell might be able to endure it, but Merigen, who had spent so much time with Robert, would surely break. How many women could withstand the guilt of killing the man they loved with their own hands? Robert's arrival in the capital had triggered a series of rapid changes. The masked figures, the crown Prince Keitel, the four dragons. No one else seemed to realize the danger posed by the four dragons except for Robert. Adriana, who had heard Robert was heading towards the capital, stared into space, her expression cold. Sometimes it was better to remain ignorant. She wouldn't be experiencing this feeling of loss if she hadn't read Robert's memories. Murugan was probably enduring that same agonizing pain right now. It would be excruciating. She would probably tear her own heart out, her body covered in wounds. If there was such a thing as a fated connection, it was between those two. Their bond was so deep that the pain that came with it was unbearable. She didn't like it. She didn't like that she was shut out, that Robert and Murugan, Robert and Adele, shared emotions she could never experience. But she couldn't hate them for that. Perhaps there would be a future where they could laugh together. She wasn't even sure if they would remain by Robert's side in this life. Adriana worried about one thing. She worried that Murugan would be so broken that she might never recover, that Robert would be devastated by the sight. She could deal with everything else. She might be harboring selfish emotions for a servant of God, but she had no intention of abandoning her feelings. Her faith had started to change after she had seen Robert's past, after she had realized her own feelings for him. "I'll pray for you even if it doesn't help." She hoped everything would return to normal, that the destiny starting to take shape would lead Robert Taylor to his desired outcome. The rosary in her hand glowed, bathing the dark room in a radiant light. The sensation of a blade piercing her flesh, tearing through bone and muscle, the feeling of blood flowing and a life ending. A normal person would go mad. Even skilled knights sometimes faltered after killing their first person. She was slowly becoming accustomed to that feeling. She had experienced too many lives where she had never met Robert. The feeling of killing someone she loved with her own hands. How could she remain sane? She couldn't lift her head. She knew Robert was there, but she couldn't face him. She had seen his suffering, and she couldn't pretend to be unaffected. He had told her not to blame herself, but his words had only made her feel worse. He had suffered for centuries while she had been at peace. Could she say she understood his pain? Could she ask for forgiveness and ask him to love her again? It was impossible. Red blood flowed from her trembling lips. She had tried to forget the memories, but the pain only made them more vivid. She had beheaded the man who had smiled at her. She had loved him, but she had killed him out of resentment. Her legs trembled, and she was about to collapse when Robert caught her. He sighed softly. "Are you all right, Ugga?" She couldn't speak properly. Her mind was crumbling. Her eyes were empty as she silently confessed her sins. She had realized her fantasies were real. She couldn't help but blame herself, even if Robert didn't. Murugan's feelings for Robert were just as intense as his for her. The man she had met when she was worried about her position. The man she had encountered in a fated meeting where they had shared a fairy tale romance. The happiness she had felt when they first met was the most fulfilling in all her lives. That feeling had never changed. Sometimes she had seen Robert confessing his love in the palace. Sometimes they had met at the same ball. Robert had been an ideal lover. He had never lost his temper and had always shown her a smiling face. But the Robert she remembered from this life was different. He was dark, empty, and devoid of emotion. He was more likely to frown than to smile. She had been worried about him, thinking he was close to death, but she now realized it was all her fault. She knew he wouldn't blame her. She had lived countless lives with him. She knew his heart, but she couldn't help but feel guilty when he held her. The blue eyes that gazed at her were filled with so much concern that it made her heart ache. She had been silent for so long, but she finally looked up. It hurt to meet his gaze, but she knew she couldn't keep avoiding it. "Robert," she wanted to say sorry, but the words wouldn't come. Every time she looked into his eyes, she was reminded of all the lives they had shared. The deaths he had endured, the pain she had witnessed. She had watched him die countless times at the hands of Keitel. He had been falsely accused of treason, tortured, and killed, and she hadn't even known. How could she not blame herself? You don't have to say anything." He knew what she was thinking. He knew she was seeing the past when she looked at him. He had been worried since he had sensed she had regained her memories. He knew she would blame herself. That was why he had told her that he didn't resent her. But seeing her break down like this made him uneasy. "You don't have to apologize. She had done nothing wrong. It was he who had tried to die by her hand. If he had died alone, or if he had paid more attention to her, she wouldn't be suffering like this. You don't have to feel sorry." He knew that saying these words wouldn't instantly restore their previous relationship. He could feel her struggling to get away, even as he held her tightly. It might be counterproductive, but he needed to say it. But the distance between them widened. Murugan pushed away Robert's arms, refusing to say anything. She knew if she smiled at him, they could return to their previous lives. "I'm sorry." Her voice trembled. Her vision was blurry. She saw Robert die again and again, his head severed. Only darkness remained. She hesitated to reach out to him, as if she was afraid of what she might do. "I'm sorry." I'm sorry." Her feelings for Robert remained. She had fallen for him again in this life, and her feelings had intensified after regaining her memories. That was why it hurt so much. How could she explain the guilt of killing the person she loved? She felt a tingling in her ears, and his usually empty eyes looked like a bottomless abyss. She had killed him again and again because of her, because she had wanted to be with him. She knew that it was difficult to bridge the distance between them, but she didn't know if she could approach him again. She needed time to heal until she had the courage to face him again. Murugan walked towards the door, glancing at Robert. She couldn't look him in the eye. If she did, the hot breeze would feel cold. The world was darkening, the darkness almost complete. She couldn't imagine Robert's expression. She was afraid to look at him. Her hand trembled, then she clenched it and dropped it to her side. She was too ashamed to say anything. She didn't know how long it would take her to heal. She walked away, a small tear running down her cheek. Her lips were white from biting them. Her face was a mess. She just wanted to be alone. She wasn't sure if she could talk to him again. She would be sorry for the rest of her life. Thump. She heard her footsteps echoing, walking through the empty corridor. She heard a ringing in her ears. She chuckled, walking away from him. The further she walked, the louder her sobs became. She was sorry, but she could never be forgiven. She wondered if she could ever understand Robert's feelings. She was unworthy of him. She had killed him and would never be able to make amends. She thought that as her legs gave out. She knew she was going to fall, but she had wanted to. The pain of recalling the memories was too much to bear. But as if denying her wish, she realized someone had caught her. She chuckled softly. It was probably a nearby servant. She quickly covered her face, afraid of scaring them. "You don't have to hide your face." His voice was gentle, familiar. She had heard it so many times. When Murugan opened her eyes, she saw blue eyes, but these eyes weren't empty. They were filled with so many emotions, just like in her memories. They were sparkling like jewels, like a sapphire with a touch of water. Robert slowly stroked her messy cheek. He had intended to let her leave, but he had changed his mind. When would he see her again if he let her go? He wouldn't let her go. He had resolved to end the regressions. He wouldn't abandon everything he loved. He wouldn't postpone it any longer. Murugan would be in pain, and she might remain in pain forever. Was it selfish to want to ease her suffering? If it was, he would be selfish. He had always been weak in front of her, but he would not back down this time. He would not yield. Let go. Her tone was firm. Her gaze wouldn't meet mine. Her body trembled and her eyes were swollen. She was a woman he had loved, both Adriana and Adele and Murugan, and she was a woman he still loved. He brushed her reddened eyes, and the arm that swung to push his hand away struck him roughly. "I said let go. I let you go before." It had been Robert's role to persistently try to stop Murugan from going to the south. Murugan had insisted on going to retrieve the artifacts, and he had been mistaken in thinking she would always return safely. Murugan had died during the brief time they were apart. He had regretted it dozens of times, wondering if things would have been different had he seen her off when she returned. This was no longer a story only he knew. Murugan knew and Adriana knew. Someday Adele would know too. Murugan, who seemed to know when he was referring to, nodded slightly and released the hand that had been gripping his sleeve tightly. He looked at the loosened shirt, then lifted Murugan again and surveyed their surroundings. This wasn't exactly the place for this kind of conversation. It was a relief that there was no one around, but if someone had seen them, it would have been easy to misunderstand the situation. A crying princess and the duke who chased after her and grabbed her. It would have definitely caused a scandal, especially now when their relationship was somewhat widely known. Even if it's an order, I won't let go, I'll disobey. You can punish me later. He had tried to lift her up, but Murugan exhaled briefly as if in resignation and stood up on her own. He offered her a handkerchief, seeing that her face was still a mess. He preferred to see her smile rather than cry. The fact that her crying was because of him was also troubling, and Murugan rubbed her face and headed towards the room. He closed the door and rubbed his face. Where should he start this conversation? It was difficult to talk to someone who had been struggling to meet his gaze since earlier. He sat on the bed and looked at the silent Murugan for a moment, then cleared his throat and spoke cautiously. "I brought you here to talk. If you don't say anything, nothing will change. You know that, don't you? I know what I did. Didn't you hear me say it over and over again? I heard you." But Murugan, who was about to say something, closed her mouth again and lowered her head. He hadn't told her about the past because he wanted her to feel guilty. He had told her because she had a right to know the past, because she had asked about it. He would have rather buried the past and tried to move in a different direction. "I didn't tell you about the past so that Murugan would be sad. I know. I told you I don't resent you, didn't I?" He lowered his knees slightly to meet her gaze, but Murugan turned her head again. But this time he placed his hand on her cheek to prevent her from avoiding him. Their eyes met, just for a brief moment, before she closed her eyes tightly again. Murugan's eyes hadn't changed from before. They were bloodshot from crying so much, but her black eyes weren't tinged with red or anything. "I don't know what to say if you keep avoiding me like this. Can I ask you one thing? Was it my fault for telling you that's not what I'm thinking?" Murugan, still turning her head, answered. He smiled faintly at the gaze that briefly touched his, but suppressed his laughter, realizing it wasn't the right atmosphere. Her hair was a mess. It was because she had been tormented while listening to his past. He had considered stopping the story, but he couldn't stop, so it couldn't be helped. "I never thought it was Robert's fault. If you act like this, it only makes me feel like it's my fault. It's my fault. If I hadn't gone to the south, Robert wouldn't have had to do that. I'm grateful for it, actually. If I hadn't trained then, I wouldn't have been able to save you this time. If Muradin had been in the north and he hadn't been able to wield a sword, he would have had to watch her be attacked by the barbarians, and he would have been in pain again. He might have even taken his own life again, but he had saved her. He had been able to single-handedly deal with Temujin and the barbarians because he had accumulated experience with the sword. It meant that something like that would happen eventually. He had been able to tie up the loose ends he had been regretting in this life. He had saved Muradin with his own hands, and he had formed a connection with Adriana that he hadn't been able to before. Next, it was time to prevent Adele's death. That too, you told me not to blame myself, so why do you keep blaming yourself? He knew why Muradin didn't want him to blame himself. And he felt the same way now. Did she not know that blaming herself would only make the other person feel worse? Maybe she knew, but she couldn't help but feel pain for what she had done. I understand how you feel and why you're sorry to me. But he didn't want her to be sorry. He didn't want to see her cry, and he had a selfish desire to always see her smile in front of him. He no longer wanted to hide his feelings. That hadn't changed, the thought that this life was his last. However, he had no intention of ignoring the relationships he had formed before. If possible, he wanted them to be happy. Even if they didn't want it, it was his wish for everyone to smile and live on in a world without him. He chuckled at her, turning her head little by little. He waited for her to be able to meet his gaze on her own, and finally their eyes met completely, hers shining slightly. Drip. He wiped away her falling tears with his hand, and Muradin wiped her own tears with her other hand, slowly blinking. When the long eyelashes were free of moisture, and after all the falling tears were gone, a cracked voice came out from between her lips, which were red from being bitten so much. I mean it when I say I'm sorry. I know. When I asked you not to blame yourself, I meant it. I know. Then answer me. The hand that touched his chest slowly slid down to his solar plexus. Then Muradin pulled her hand back to his chest and gently clasped her hand over his. After confirming several times that they were connected, Muradin finally seemed relieved and drooped her eyebrows slightly. She sighed, thinking about her next question, then opened her mouth, holding his hand tightly. What should I say to Robert here? Well, he didn't want her to say anything in particular. He just wanted them to be like they were before. If they could go back to how they were when they first met in this iteration, even after hearing this story, he would be satisfied with that. It's enough if we can talk like we did yesterday. Like yesterday, just smile, joke around. Tease each other about waiting for each other. He fiddled with the pin under her messy hair, then combed her hair and put it back in place. He hadn't been able to put it on in the 35th iteration, but he had done it this time. In a way, this also had a lot of meaning for him. We can give each other gifts, or sometimes just listen to each other's voices through the artifact. It was okay if they weren't lovers like before. This life wasn't like the previous ones, and the relationships formed through special feelings weren't just with Muradin. Things would get complicated if they became lovers, and most of all, he didn't want to have a deep relationship with anyone else until he had dealt with Keitel. Then he realized that he had already crossed the line he had set for himself. He had trampled on the line, erased the boundary, and taken a big step forward to stand right in front of Muradin. It was a mistake. He shouldn't have done this, but nothing would change what he had already said. He should just accept it. Maybe it was time to redefine the line he had set for himself. He pulled her hand, and Muradin's body swayed forward. The distance between them narrowed considerably, and she fit snugly in his arms. He saw Muradin's ears turning red and smiled for a moment, then patted her on the back, and a small voice was heard. Is it okay to be held like this too? Of course. I was going to do it earlier, but you were crying so much I couldn't. If he had forced himself to hold her while she was crying, it would have obviously had the opposite effect. Muradin, who had slightly escaped from his arms, stared at him for a long time. She looked like she had a lot to say, but the way her lips moved slightly suggested it wasn't anything negative. For example, that she was sorry or that it was her fault. Muradin, who seemed unable to hold back anymore and giggled to herself, leaned her head against his chest with a thud. Do you remember when I asked you if you had dated before? I remember. You said you had only dated one person. Was that your fiancé by any chance? No way. His first crush had been Teresa, but his first love had been with Muradin. The reason he was so skilled at this, and the reason he knew so much about dating, was simple. I've only ever loved one person in my life, but that had happened dozens of times, so to anyone else it would seem like he had been in dozens of relationships. Muradin, now calmed, met his gaze without hesitation. His words and his promise not to let her go again must have had an effect. Even he felt a little embarrassed by his own words. Perhaps it was because he had never held onto someone so passionately before. Well, it was enough that Muradin had returned to her usual self. He chuckled, looking at her lying on his lap, then sighed, thinking about the task ahead. He had confirmed Keitel's intention to kill Adele. If he refused to cooperate, the trust he had painstakingly built would disappear. His expression darkened as he pondered what to do, but it softened slightly as he looked at Muradin below him. Judging by her soft breaths, she seemed to be asleep. She must have been tired after crying so much. He had been worried she might collapse from exhaustion, but thankfully she was sleeping peacefully against him. The end was truly approaching. Whether it was the end he desired remained uncertain, but Keitel would surely make his move the moment Adele was saved. After that, the plan to overthrow the emperor would begin in earnest. Dealing with Murugan was scheduled for autumn. There was still plenty of time left, enough to prepare for what comes after. He wouldn't be able to contact Murugan for a while. If their communication was discovered, it would be dangerous in many ways, and she wouldn't be able to head north after receiving such an order. She's going to hate me. She would probably come all the way to the capital if he didn't contact her, so he only hoped she wouldn't come until his plan succeeded. Still, it would be good to send her something that would give her a clue. He gently laid Murugan's head down and stood up, walking towards the window. If his memory served him correctly, there should be an imperial carrier pigeon. Chirp, he whistled, and soon the flapping of wings was heard. He had used the imperial carrier pigeon several times, so he knew it well. The fact that something like this hadn't changed gave him a strange feeling, but the message he would write was to prevent Murugan from coming to the imperial capital. The recipient was Lotus. He felt sorry for entrusting him with so much, but it was a pity that Lotus was the only one in the north who could understand these matters. He couldn't reveal everything he intended to do or the fact that he had regressed, but Lotus was the only one who could understand this code and inform Adele. I hope it gets delivered safely. She might hate him even more than just being disliked, but it was necessary. Even after Murugan's matter was settled, there was still a wall remaining, and this obstacle might be even more difficult than capturing the 4 dragons himself. To Lotus, he tucked the letter into the pigeon's leg and channeled his mana. The mana that enveloped the bird's body harmonized it with the sky, making it difficult for anyone to notice until the letter was received. He could keep in touch with Adele, but the most important part of his plan was to make everything seem natural until the very end. The reason he was going through all this trouble to send a letter was to mimic that naturalness. He rubbed his dry face and looked up at the sky. The presence of the bird, now completely harmonized with the sky, was faintly visible, but even that began to disappear, obscured by the sunlight. His plan started today. He had heard about Murugan, and he had been with Keitel, who had declared his intention to kill Adele today. But he couldn't delay any longer. If he didn't move quickly, Adele would die. Even if he saved Adele, he didn't think he could smoothly proceed with Murugan becoming Empress. Preparation, building the steps for everything, training to move forward. At the end of spring, the blowing wind was already becoming warm. The wind no longer blew from the north. The snow that had once blanketed the world had completely disappeared, as if it had been a fleeting dream, and the world was once again beginning to be painted green. Letter 1E5F, letter 1D63C, letter 22B, letter 1D51F. S. When the flowers bloomed, when the trees were lush with leaves, when the sky grew higher and the sun hung at its highest point. That was the time for everything to begin anew. He covered the sleeping Murugan's shoulders with a blanket, chuckled softly, and turned his gaze back towards the window. The letter to Adele seemed to have been delivered without any problems. This meant that there would be no contact between them until autumn arrived. He also had to tell Adriana that the plan needed to start soon, so he headed to the Moon Tower. I see the matter you were worried about went well. That's right. Well, for now, Murugan accepted it well. It would have been difficult if Murugan had continued to blame herself. Thankfully, she had understood his feelings and accepted them, allowing the matter to be resolved quickly. She had also accepted the fact that she had to become Empress surprisingly calmly. Murugan's concern about her position had only stemmed from her worry about being completely abandoned after Keitel became emperor. She hadn't desired power for its own sake. However, the fact that Keitel had killed him and the accumulated emotions from witnessing it repeatedly had turned into hatred. When he told her he was going to kill Keitel, she hadn't been shocked, but rather said it was only natural. Murugan now understood the situation with the 4 dragons and the masked figures as well. He could vividly remember her lamenting the fact that the imperial family was ignorant of so many things. Adriana, after a moment of contemplation, brought up another topic after he finished talking about Murugan. It was about Adele. Adriana already knew that Keitel was trying to kill Adele, so the question was how to save her. We'd have to prevent Adele from going to the imperial capital, right? If we save Adele after she arrives at the imperial capital, we'll have to fight Keitel immediately. However, he didn't think Keitel would summon Adele to the imperial capital again. Unlike before, Adele had refused to appear in the capital and was prepared to remain in the north indefinitely. He's more likely to send a subjugation force. I think Kane is the most likely candidate to go. And if he adds another person, he pointed at himself with his finger and gazed at Adriana. This was what he was aiming for. It was a plan that required his presence, and even if Keitel didn't send him, he was planning to go to the north somehow. Adriana, after listening to his explanation, nodded, agreeing that it was plausible. If things went this way, it would be quite helpful in dealing with Kane and his remnants, assuming the situation remained natural. But it was a mistake to assume that everything would go according to plan. If he saved Adele, he would become openly hostile with Keitel within a week, and after that, he judged that he would surely encounter something related to the 4 dragons. You know that the Minotaur wasn't the only demon we saw, right? Right, there's still a long way to go. Besides the Minotaur, there were 3 more. It was uncertain whether he could fight on equal footing with the recovered Minotaur, even with his current strength. and since he had to consider the 4 dragons as well, he had no intention of being satisfied with simply being called the Sword Saint. Fortunately, having seen the light once had helped him. He only had about 4 months left, but that was enough time to drastically increase his strength, which had reached a plateau. I probably won't be able to see you for a while. I have to prepare, and it will practically be like wall-gazing training. If you're talking about wall-gazing training, have you prepared a place? Not exactly, but I have a place in mind. Then I can help you. I can open the underground area of the Moon Tower. You're officially my friend, so none of the paladins will question it. He tilted his head at her offer of help, and Adriana began to explain the underground space. It was a space that only the saint could enter, but she said that the energy flowing through his body, which was mixed with the saint's divine power, would allow him access. If that's the case, I'm grateful, but are you sure it's all right? There would definitely be people who would find it strange that he was entering the underground area. His recent interactions with Adriana had increased, and he had heard that many people complained about the saint interacting with the opposite sex. He asked worriedly if it was really all right, and Adriana smiled brightly and said it was fine. It's okay. I don't really care about what other people think, and it won't affect me even if they say something. Besides, I'm the saint, directly recognized by God. And she lowered her voice and added with a slightly suggestive smile, I don't dislike that kind of misunderstanding. I actually rather hope for it, you could say. We're friends after all. Police car light, important notice, police car light, I suppose so. That friendship was quite impure, but it seemed she had no intention of crossing the line for now. She had seemed uncomfortable when he talked about Muradin, and he understood how she felt about him. But he would definitely have to think about how to resolve this complicated love triangle, no, quadrangle. These were women who would surely be devastated if he died. It wasn't easy to change their feelings, and if he left, they would surely chase after him. His countless regressions had led him all over the continent, and at the same time, it had become good evidence for narrowing down the search area. If Adele or Adriana were determined to find him, it wouldn't take long to find him no matter where he hid. He smiled bitterly and avoided Adriana's gaze, and she returned to her usual expression and stood up. She held out her hand to him, and he could sense a small amount of joy in her voice as she offered to guide him to the underground area. Well, for now, this wasn't so bad. Let's go then. While he was staying here, it wouldn't be bad to appease Adriana. She had seemed quite upset earlier. The reason he had been able to reach the level of Sword Saint after dying 10 times was because he had dedicated all that time purely to the sword. He could improve so rapidly because he was simply retracing steps he had already taken. What lay beyond this level? He had decided to undergo wall-gazing training, but the only enlightenment he had grasped was the faint clue he had felt while fighting the Minotaur. He would, of course, recover the full extent of his original power, but he knew from experience that wouldn't be enough. The sword in his hand was an ordinary iron sword. The reason he had stockpiled cheap iron swords instead of expensive ones was simple. If it was difficult to reach the next level quickly, it would be better to refine his skills at his current level. He could no longer say he had no talent with the sword, so he believed he could reach his desired level with enough time. He contemplated the sword in his hand, then turned his head at the presence he felt behind him. Adriana, holding food and a change of clothes, smiled faintly and spoke. He couldn't help but feel grateful. Not only had she provided him with a place in the Moon Tower's basement where Kairal wouldn't notice, but she was also providing him with meals. The fact that his current worries had been resolved so easily felt strangely awkward. If you get hurt, please tell me, I'll heal you. Providing me with this place is more than enough. And you're even providing me with meals, what more could I ask for? He needed to eat well to grow stronger. He had already experienced how his body would break down if he lived in the mountains with nothing, so he had been planning to create a simple environment for his wall-gazing training. Thanks to Adriana's help, these problems had been solved immediately. He tried to offer something in return for all her help, but she simply said that his presence was enough, which made him smile awkwardly. He enjoyed her company, but he couldn't help but feel self-conscious. Just a few days ago, he had been practically inseparable from Muradin, and now, after just a few days, he was spending a lot of time with Adriana. He wasn't sure whether to apologize or feel ashamed. It felt like his own principles had become quite blurry. He knew that he could no longer choose just one person. If he had to choose someone in the future, he would either live with all of them or disappear by dying. It was a distant future, but imagining it brought him some comfort. He felt that way because he knew it was slowly approaching. When he first arrived, he thought he had 3 years, but even that had been shortened, making it feel quite close. His feelings about this were still complicated. But it was true that he was feeling a bit more positive than before. He would be fine, and after this was over, he would be worrying about much more trivial things. He smiled at that thought, and Adriana coincidentally smiled as well. The pressure that came with the word Empress was, of course, considerable. She had never thought of becoming Empress herself, and she had always subconsciously thought that Kairal was more suited for the position. Our Retroflex A-Ring knew, oh yes, hadn't the Emperor always been Kairal in her time with Robert? But she knew she couldn't let things remain the same in this life. It was because of what he had done to Robert, but also because, from the imperial family's perspective, they couldn't just leave Keitel alone. The fact that he completely defied the moon-worshipping imperial family and wielded the power of the four dragons was a problem in itself. His actions could easily be considered treason and a threat to overthrow the nation. She had been foolish not to realize it clearly until now, but she felt Robert was even more amazing for having discovered it all alone without anyone acknowledging it. Looking back, she had received help from a young girl named Arwen later on, but even now, knowing what Keitel was doing, she still couldn't do anything about it. Robert had probably always lived with this frustration. So she couldn't complain. She had to think about how she could be helpful and prepare for the future in her own way. She wanted to mobilize her direct intelligence unit to gather information, but the mysterious organization Keitel had deployed made that difficult. Even though she now had a general idea of what they were doing, they had been exerting their influence throughout the imperial palace. If she acted rashly here, she might end up giving Keitel an advantage. Murujan pondered for a moment, then slumped back into her chair. She should have been friendlier with her father. If she had acted cute and tried to get on his good side, she might have gotten some scraps of information. But since she had been confined last time, he wouldn't just stand by and watch her act recklessly again. Still, my situation isn't that bad. She chuckled with a smug look and rested her chin in her hand, gazing at the mirror. Robert's plan was quite intricate, and it would only be effective if all the gears meshed perfectly. It wasn't as if he was proceeding with only one plan, Plan A. Even if it failed, he had other plans, but he wouldn't want to resort to Plan B unless absolutely necessary. Murujan, who knew how Adele Ygritte felt about Robert and how Robert was going to proceed with this matter, had mixed feelings. It's not like he's using her. The information Robert was going to give Adele Ygritte was based on facts. However, without a detailed explanation, it would be enough to make Adele feel betrayed by Robert. If it were the Robert she knew, he would have been working hard to save Adele. It wouldn't take long for that momentum to be cut short and for Adele to become isolated. She had heard that he was training in the basement of the Moon Tower, so Adele's messages wouldn't reach Robert. He had said that even if they did, he wouldn't check them. The success or failure of this plan depended on whether it appeared natural. To deceive the enemy, one had to deceive even their allies. In a way, it could be said that Robert was using a strategy of sacrificing a pawn to save the king. Of course, she couldn't help but feel uneasy having heard about this plan. In terms of experience and the length of time she had been Robert's lover, she had the upper hand, but the feelings Robert and Adele had for each other were far from ordinary. Knowing that, she couldn't think favorably of Adele Ygritte, but she couldn't help but feel sorry for the situation. She was a rival in love, but they had much in common. Their circumstances, for example, and hadn't Robert said that Adele Ygritte already remembered the past? Perhaps she was carrying the same pain as Murujan. She would regret it, and her feelings for Robert would be just as deep. That was why she had a headache. She had noticed early on that Adriana also harbored special feelings for Robert, and she had been secretly cheering for her. But now she couldn't give up, friendship or not. In that sense, she thought it was quite all right that she was becoming Empress. If she was the Empress, she could monopolize him using her authority as an excuse, but that might ruin their relationship in many ways. Murujan knew that this would ultimately remain a fantasy. She sighed and lay down on the bed. She counted the squares on the ceiling one by one, then frowned, clutching her head, but the frustration didn't disappear. In her memories, Keitel had always been close to perfect. Unlike herself, he always handled everything flawlessly, and he was always proficient, even at things he was doing for the first time. She had thought it was talent, a cold-hearted successor, yet thorough, without any complaints from his subordinates. That was probably why her father hadn't thought twice about Keitel becoming the next emperor. But the problem was that he had become completely twisted. In the imperial family, worshipping the sun was considered the ultimate taboo. And since he had used the power of the ancient dragon, which had been sealed by God himself, there was no turning back. She wasn't satisfied with the reality that she now had to fight against her own blood relative, whom she had always considered perfect. Could she do it? Murujan stared at the ceiling for a moment, then slowly closed her eyes. It wasn't a question she could answer right now. She thought she would only be able to find the answer after spending a lot of time pondering it. Robert Keitel, she wondered how their relationship would end. Murujan clutched her throbbing head and hugged the blanket tightly. Perhaps because it was where Robert had been, the faint, lingering scent strangely comforted her. There was a land where the wind blew particularly cold. Sometimes it was easy to forget the season, and walking on the snow-covered ground made her wonder if it was always winter. The hair of the woman standing at the highest point, looking down at the world below, fluttered slightly. The wolf fur cloak billowed in the cold wind as her gaze remained fixed on the castle in the center of the north. The reason she had come here was simple. To calm her complicated feelings, to think about Robert, who hadn't even included a simple greeting in the letter he had sent. Don't come to the imperial capital. When she received the letter containing Robert's warning not to come to the imperial capital, no matter what she did or what news she heard, she had been speechless. It was annoying enough that he hadn't even included a simple greeting, but he had even told her not to come. How could he know whether she would be rolling around with another woman or not? She had withdrawn all the spies she had planted in the capital to avoid being discovered by Keitel. Now, all she could do to find out what Robert was doing was wait for news. How could she not be frustrated? However, as he had said, she instinctively knew that she shouldn't move. If she moved now, something would go wrong. That feeling was warning her. So she hadn't said anything and had remained quiet, but there were two cats aiming for the fish in the capital, after all. What would happen if they marked their territory while she was away? Adele frowned slightly at the rising worry. There was nothing she could do. She had no choice but to follow Robert's words this time. But when they met again, then she would make him pay the price. Just you wait. When they met again, she would make sure he couldn't escape. There's no need to rush, that's true, but I still believe there's a problem. A problem? Keitel softly muttered, gazing intently at Kane, who sat across from him, sipping his tea, the surface rippling gently. Subduing the North had been part of the plan from the beginning. It was just happening a little earlier than scheduled, but there would be no problem even if they executed the plan right away. If he had to point out a problem, it would be the flimsy pretext for summoning Adele Ygritte to the imperial capital, but there was no need to bring her to the capital in the first place. The reason for summoning her had been to handle the matter quietly and swiftly, but the moment Robert Taylor became aware of the Minotaur's existence, the word quietly became an impossible prefix. Wouldn't it be better to act more boldly than others expected? Of course, he knew what Kane was worried about. The fact that he had informed someone about his plan to kill Adele Ygritte, and that the person he had informed was Robert of all people. He understood Kane's doubts about the necessity of informing Robert, but Keitel simply smiled and looked at him. Kane didn't know the full extent of his plans or how much of the recognized memories resided within him. He couldn't fully grasp it while it remained in his subconscious, but someday when he took full control, he would be able to move more freely. The red glint in his eyes faded, and Kane, who had been watching it intently, quietly swallowed and averted his gaze. The four dragons' thoughts were consuming the crown prince at an accelerated rate. The problem was that it was happening much faster than he had anticipated. Originally, he had planned to use him and discard him, but even with royal blood, the speed was too fast. He needed to come up with countermeasures to deal with this strangely rapid assimilation and somehow send the four dragons back. Kane. Yes. When Kane answered, barely concealing his surprise, he flinched and smiled awkwardly at the sharp gaze directed at him. He was wearing a mask, so his expression shouldn't be visible. Why did Keitel act as if he could see right through him? The atmosphere was definitely different from before. The four dragons' thoughts were influencing Keitel, and that influence was greater than he had anticipated. Kane took a breath and continued, choosing his words carefully. Did you think Robert Taylor would readily cooperate with killing Adele Ygritte? He has to cooperate. It's obvious he's trying to latch onto me, so I have to play along, don't I? Keitel had known Robert's intentions for approaching him from the start. He had been surprised that Robert actually became the head of the family, but it was about time to discard him. Keitel frowned slightly at the throbbing headache and exhaled quietly. It's dangerous to keep him around any longer. And I'm planning to drastically reduce the authority of the nobles, so it wouldn't make sense to have Robert on our side. Prescription letter 1D608, Nuo letter 1D401, Iagonek letter 219, then are you planning to brand him a rebel? There's no justification for that either. But well, things don't always need a justification. There wasn't always a reason for an outcome. Sometimes things were done simply because someone wanted to do them. Was there a reason to kill Robert Taylor? Keitel had thought about it seriously several times, but he couldn't find a reason for this unfounded hatred. There was no cause. He had never been interested in the black sheep of the Duke's family. He just wanted to kill him whenever their eyes met, whenever they spoke. So he was planning to finish things with him this time. He would be part of the subjugation force against the Grand Duchess, no, the traitor Adele Ygritte. It would be perfectly plausible if he were to be struck by a stray arrow and die during the subjugation. It was perfectly reasonable to use Taylor in the subjugation of a traitor like the Grand Duchess. There was the fact that Robert was publicly known to be on his side, but since it was the Grand Duchess's subjugation, it would look good for Taylor, the head of the nation's nobles, to participate. Are you planning to kill him? Yes, but how? He even fought against the Minotaur. Is the Minotaur the only demon? Keitel grinned, and Kane felt a chill run down his spine, his blood turning to ice. It was a thought that an ordinary person wouldn't have, especially not someone from the moon-worshipping imperial family. Saying that the Minotaur wasn't the only demon was the same as saying he would mobilize other demons in the north. For what purpose? From now on, the nobles are excluded. Everything will revolve around the imperial family. It has to be thorough. His plan to use Keitel was still valid, but was this rapid pace really right? His mind was filled with swirling thoughts, but Keitel didn't give him time to think. Before he could think of anything, Keitel came up with something even more extreme. He was thinking on a scale even grander than what the organization had planned. Just where had things gone wrong? No, he couldn't even be sure if things had gone wrong. Then what you're thinking of now is besides Adele? Yes, Keitel smiled faintly, and a faint red glint appeared in his golden eyes. I will kill Robert Taylor, along with Adele Ygritte. He's probably planning to kill me. He knew what Keitel was thinking. Considering how much Keitel had learned about him through the repeated regressions, it was obvious that Keitel would know his purpose in approaching him this time. That was why Keitel had specifically told him about killing Adele. Anyone would know what kind of relationship he had with Adele and that he had fought the Minotaur. If Keitel had intended to kill Adele regardless of him, he wouldn't have said anything. Then there was only one possibility. Keitel was planning to kill him along with Adele. Does he not know that Robert fought the Minotaur? He probably knows. He'll plan accordingly. Adriana's worried question was something he had already considered. Keitel was probably heavily influenced by the four dragons. Based on his investigations and what Arwen had told him, it was safe to assume that Keitel's mind was already being consumed by the four dragons. Even if their relationship appeared amicable on the surface, he couldn't let his guard down. If he dismissed the possibility and got caught off guard, he would likely be struck down. Considering all possibilities, Keitel would try to kill him while understanding his strength. He'll probably use something like a stray arrow as an excuse. The others don't know about my strength yet. Then will he use the Minotaur again this time? Probably not. Keitel wouldn't be foolish enough to reuse something that had already failed once. The Minotaur had said it needed time to recover its strength. It had been about a month since he encountered the Minotaur. It was hard to believe that it had fully recovered its strength. Then he had to assume that Keitel would use other demons instead of the Minotaur, which had been his equal. Adriana, her face pale, stared at him as if she had also considered the possibility of other demons. He knew if this possibility was true, he would be at a great disadvantage. It wasn't a possibility of death, it was almost certain death. You're not planning to avoid it, are you? He chuckled at her hesitant voice, but the discomfort within it was clear. There was no way he would avoid it. Even if all the demons gathered there, he would go. If he didn't, his regression would be meaningless. Everything has to change, you know that, don't you? What this regression means to me. Police car light, important notice, police car light. I know, that's why I'm not saying anything more. Normally, I would have tied you up here to prevent you from going. That's quite brutal. Adriana smiled faintly at his playful remark. Yes, demons. If several of them attacked him at once, he would surely die. But he had to go, so he couldn't avoid this fight. If things stayed as they were, he would surely die. If there was a way to overcome this possibility, there's only one way, isn't there? Instead of looking for other options, he gripped his sword. Nothing would change even if he racked his brains here. He had 3 months and 15 days left. There was no way for him to overcome this situation other than to somehow reach the next level. This time was different. It had to be different. Adriana's gaze was darker than usual, but he didn't show that he noticed. He knew how she felt, and he knew that her feelings were mixed with a lot of personal desires. But he couldn't abandon Adele. MF flows. Time, something intangible, once set in motion, moves at an unstoppable pace. It was overwhelming just trying to keep up. The sun rises and sets with the blink of an eye. He could never get used to this constant change. With each gust of wind, the heat intensified. The sun high in the sky beat down on him, its cursed light illuminating the world. Despite being an empire that worshipped the moon, ironically, they couldn't do anything without the sun. Some called it coexistence. But was that right? Perhaps even Keitel had realized that things were twisted far beyond simple coexistence. But if he wanted to be understood, he could have chosen a different method. Ultimately, the reason he was making plans and desperately clinging to his sword was to kill Keitel. It would be best to kill him before the 4 dragons were resurrected, but it was always wise to assume the worst. The 4 dragons would surely be resurrected. It was possible that the naming of one of the Empire's gates eclipse was a mere coincidence. Only the first emperor would know whether it referred to an eclipse of the moon or the sun, but it was unsettling. It meant it was best to eliminate the possibility, and he had no choice but to believe that what he was doing was right. So he erased his hesitation. He was doing the right thing, saving everyone. It was better to believe that everything he was doing, including killing Keitel and resealing the 4 dragons, was right. He had taken up the sword to save Adele. And to save Adele, he had to be prepared to face all the demons. It would have been difficult without Adriana's help. He was so preoccupied with his sword training that he could hardly focus on anything else. If Adriana hadn't taken care of him, his efficiency would have been halved. He kept thinking about the clue he had grasped while fighting the Minotaur. The reason he had been able to use the power of his true form even while not in his true form. What exactly had he realized during that fight that allowed him to improve his skills? Willpower, the driving force behind a person's ability to use power. Perhaps his mana had been drawn to his will to protect someone. So he tried focusing his mind, but nothing changed, so he gave up. Simply wanting to save Adele wasn't enough. Naturally, it was because he had already harbored such intense feelings. He had died dozens of times to protect one person. And hadn't those burning feelings turned him into the Sword Saint? Mere willpower wasn't enough to reach the next level. Our acute letter 1d6080 circumflex yo section, the realm beyond this, was one that no one had ever reached. He could become the wind with his sword in hand, become a rock, sometimes even the sky. He could cut anything he desired. It was a vague concept, but he realized he would reach the next level when he could cut what he couldn't cut before. Then, what should this level be called? He chuckled, realizing he didn't know. After that, he emptied his mind and swung his sword. He felt that nothing would change even if he swung his sword while thinking about the next level. He would meet Muradin, and when he returned to the Moon Tower, he would meet Adriana, but he didn't contact Adele. He couldn't, even if she was worried. He wanted her to believe he had betrayed her. He wanted her to be furious when he arrived. It would be better if she was angry at him, leading all her troops to attack him. That way there would be a moment of hesitation. He didn't think Keitel would personally come to the north. He wished he would, but he was certain that Cain would be the one to come. He would kill Cain there. He would take advantage of any hesitation, kill Cain, and deal with the demons that would appear afterward. After that, he would reveal what Keitel had done and immediately march on the capital. Adele would probably have guessed Keitel's plan. Knowing Adele, she wouldn't just sit back and take it. She would lead the troops she had gathered for counterattack and march on the capital, reaching it in less than a week. That's where it would begin. The plan to overthrow Keitel and deal with the 4 dragons. It should be all right to ask Arwen for help, right? If you're talking about Arwen the alchemist, it was comfortable to be able to talk to Adriana, who knew everything about his regressions without hesitation. Since she already knew Arwen's real name, she immediately understood who he was talking about, and her eyes turned slightly cold. He had no intention of developing romantic feelings for Arwen. There was no room for that, and she was too young anyway. It wouldn't be convincing to make excuses now, after having formed connections with 3 women. He scratched his cheek awkwardly, and Adriana sighed and nodded, as if urging him to continue. If we open a gate there and pass through with the troops, we can gather all the soldiers in the capital in less than half a day. The success of this plan depended on how many troops Adele had prepared, but he wasn't too worried about that. Knowing Adele, she would have prepared almost all her forces, no matter what. Now all that remained was to grasp the light he had seen. Grasping that light was something he had to do himself. It wasn't an opportunity that came often. He had a clue. He had touched the wall he could break through with his own hands, the wall that showed him he could move forward. I probably won't be able to see you for a while. When he said that to Adriana, who had brought him his last meal for a while, she looked at him with a calm expression, though her eyes seemed to hold many unspoken words. Unlike before, her eyes were open, and her clear gaze met his. He didn't know exactly what emotions those eyes held, but he could clearly sense her worry for him and her sulking at the fact that he was thinking more about Adele than her, even though she was right beside him. He knew he couldn't feel the same way about everyone. Muradin had her special qualities, and so did Adele. But that meant Adriana also held a special place in his heart. It seemed too early to express those feelings, but he had enough time to gently place his hand on her head. I know you have a lot to say. It's not like that. Even if you deny it, it's obvious. I'm not that insensitive. I know what you're trying to say. I'm sorry for pretending not to know, but someday we'll have time to talk. It couldn't be helped if she resented the fact that now wasn't that time. He didn't know how she would interpret his words, but he hoped Adriana would wait a little longer. If everything ended well, they would surely be able to talk about their feelings for each other. Adriana, after listening to his words, moved her lips slightly, then shook her head with a faint smile. She looked a little relieved, but her dissatisfaction was still evident. I wasn't trying to pressure you. I'm just a little impatient. I understand how you feel. He would be a fool or an idiot if he didn't think anything while being by her side. She had never complained about him visiting Muradin at the palace. He felt sorry for stopping her from saying what she wanted to say and looked at her quietly, and Adriana smiled bitterly, put down the food, and spoke softly. Then when will I be able to see you again? Well, he didn't have much time left. He wouldn't be able to fully grasp the clue he had barely managed to reach if he just stayed up all night. Then he had to invest more time, even if it meant pushing his body to its limits. I don't think I'll be able to see you for about a week. He felt the changing of seasons when the wind began to blow cold. The lush greenery remained. The vitality of the forest, which had painted the world green, showed no signs of fading, and the moss that had briefly covered the north was still there. But the red color that slowly began to appear from the western edge was surely a herald of autumn. Adele, as always, climbed the highest mountain in the north and looked out at the horizon. It was a habit she had started at the end of spring. From here, she could faintly see the distant landscape of the capital, and she would calm the burning anger within her by looking at it. I always thought you'd go crazy someday. She had never actually thought that. She was just saying it because she couldn't contain her anger. What he said he wouldn't be able to contact her for a while, she had been mistaken in thinking it would be about a week. She had thought he would contact her within 2 or 3 months at the latest, but it had already been 5 months without a single word, and her deeply furrowed brows reflected her anger. It was ridiculous. It wasn't like he had found another lover and she had checked just in case, but he hadn't found a partner. Was he avoiding her on purpose? She had thought that too, but as time passed, she only grew more irritated. She wondered if he had betrayed her, but Lotus had reassured her, saying that Robert wasn't that kind of person. She had sensed early on that he had sided with the crown prince to kill her, but she had trusted Robert. Even if that was the case, he must have had a reason for acting that way. She didn't know everything about Robert's lives, but she knew that his feelings for her were genuine, and her feelings for him were just as genuine. When I see him this time, I'll make sure to hold on to him tight. Should I tie him up so he can't go anywhere? Adele wasn't a fool, so she thought that Robert must have some kind of plan for this situation. The order Adele gave immediately afterward was simple. If the Imperial army arrived to subjugate her, even if Robert was leading them, she was to fight back with all her might. Robert wouldn't die, would he? What if he was struck by a stray arrow and died? Adele pondered for a moment, then smiled faintly and turned her head. In that case, she would die with him. What fun would a world without Robert be? There would be no meaning, and she didn't want to waste her time on pointless regrets. She could think that way now because she had finally realized how she truly felt about Robert. She was doing this because she liked him. She liked him quite a lot. Perhaps she was the one clinging to him. The fact that she couldn't even be truly angry at him in this situation, where she might die for treason, was she pathetic or just foolish? Adele pressed her hand to her forehead, shook her head, and chuckled softly. The wind blew. It was the sound of autumn arriving, and at the same time, it meant Kaitel was coming. Adele, seeing the dust cloud in the distance, slowly gripped the sword at her waist. He wiped his sweat-drenched body with a towel. He smiled wryly, looking at the puddle of sweat on the floor as if all the moisture had been wrung from his body. Today was the day he would head north. That was probably why he wasn't tired even after sweating so much. He was so focused on today that he had forgotten the fatigue that had accumulated in his body. Even that fatigue disappeared while he was washing his body, imbued with divine power, easily shaking it off. He was fine. He was in optimal condition for today's battle. There would be no problems. He felt like he could even fight demons with his sword in this state. He dried himself and stepped out of the bathroom, and Adriana, who seemed to have been standing there for a while, held his clothes. Were you waiting? Not long. I cleared my schedule for today so I can stay with you until you leave. My presence in the north would complicate the plan. I won't be able to see you for a while if I leave from here. Adriana smiled faintly, and he felt a pang of guilt. It was a natural thing to say, but he couldn't help but feel troubled. It wasn't like this was the last time he would see her, but he couldn't shake the feeling that they wouldn't see each other for a long time. Even if the plan succeeded and he went straight to the capital, he wouldn't be able to see Adriana. He had to push straight into the Imperial Palace and seize control, so he accepted the clothes and scratched his cheek awkwardly. Even after getting dressed, he continued to stare at Adriana. He didn't know what to say. He had to say goodbye. Do you have something to say? How did you know? It's a feeling that Robert is staring at me. Even a blind person couldn't ignore their senses. He knew Adriana's senses were sharp, but he chuckled quietly and patted her shoulder at her words. He had done it out of awkwardness. He was grateful and sorry, but he didn't know what to say to her as he left for the north. Should he say he would be back? Should he say they would meet again when everything was over? He had already told Muradin yesterday that he would be back, but it was difficult to say the same to Adriana. You should get ready quickly. You don't have much time left. Right. He forced himself to move amidst the awkward atmosphere. He wasn't even sure if his feet were moving him or if he was moving them of his own volition. Arsadilla letter 1D620 new Upsilon letter Windafa. He thought about Adriana's expression, and the awkwardness intensified when he caught her gaze and saw her smiling faintly. Adriana, who had followed him into his room, closed the door and looked around. Judging by the divine power emanating from her feet, she seemed to be examining the surroundings. While he was packing, his mind was elsewhere. He was preoccupied with the thought of what Adriana might say, and her soft voice brought him back to reality. Robert, he barely managed to suppress his surprise. He placed his trembling hand on his chest, took a deep breath, and looked back. Adriana's expression was normal. The face he saw every day, the expression she wore when she talked to him. That's why he was even more nervous. The Adriana he knew wouldn't act so normal at a time like this. Why are you so surprised? I was just lost in thought. You seem to be. You've been like that since yesterday, haven't you? He was probably so easily startled because the atmosphere felt unusual. Or maybe it was because the wind was cold today. Maybe it was because he had woken up a little earlier than usual. Even with all these thoughts swirling in his mind, Adriana's voice clearly pierced through them. Are you afraid? Well, he wasn't afraid, but it wasn't like he wasn't afraid either. He didn't know how to express these contradictory feelings. He wasn't afraid of being hurt or dying. He was just afraid that everything would go wrong. There was nothing more frightening than the thought of none of his plans working out. Of course, he didn't want to tell Adriana about these feelings. He was worried that she would be concerned if he left her alone. Not really. I'm scared. I tried to act normal, but I guess it's not working. The emotions hidden behind her faint smile were complex. Cracks appeared in the expression that had seemed so calm just moments ago, and small ripples began to spread. It wasn't that she had been like this from the beginning, he just hadn't noticed. His hand, which he had unconsciously reached out, stopped in midair. It was because Adriana had approached him and embraced him. He registered the warmth of her body against his in an instant. Before he could say anything, she held him tightly, her forehead resting against his chest, her lips moving slightly. Can I whine a little? He chuckled at her smiling face as if she knew she was already whining. Whining. It wasn't something Adriana usually did. Neither was hugging him silently like this, nor looking up at him like this. He felt an indescribable feeling, like a cat snuggling against him. The atmosphere was different. It wasn't the Adriana he knew. It was as if another woman who had always been hidden within her had emerged. He couldn't read all of her emotions, but he could clearly sense what this atmosphere meant, even in this silence. He felt like Adriana's suppressed emotions were about to burst forth. I know that you have to go to save the Grand Duchess. If I tell you not to go, you'll hate it and you'll think I'm being selfish. I've never been jealous before. When I felt that Muradin liked you, I considered giving up, because Muradin was the first person to become my friend. I was happy to see you two get along so well, but I can't just be happy. Her grip on his chest tightened. She squeezed until her hand turned white. When the strength left her trembling hand, Adriana slightly pulled away and her hand reached for his cheek. Her touch was gentle, but it didn't seem like she intended to let him go. If you go today, we probably won't see each other for a long time, right? Probably. Then, during the time I'm not with you, you will be with the Grand Duchess. I don't know what will happen, and maybe you'll spend all that time fighting. But I'm a selfish person, Robert. Adriana smiled wryly and traced her hand across his face. As if gauging his features, she slowly caressed his face, which was leaning against the wall, and then chuckled, looking at the hand that had returned to his cheek. I know why you're going. I know better than anyone else. But why do I feel this way? I wish you wouldn't go. I think that even though I know I shouldn't. Isn't it funny that I'm like this, even though I'm the saint? Various emotions were mixed within her bright smile, self-loathing, yet an unwillingness to let go. He understood immediately, knowing what feelings she harbored for him. Adriana had romantic feelings for him. The feelings that had been faint before were now completely clear, and he couldn't help but chuckle at the emotions she was confronting head-on. Should he say it wasn't funny? He knew why she was saying these things, but he had to leave her and go to Adele. His mind was a mess. He didn't know how to respond to the situation, but before he could even think, Adriana's hand pulled him by the waist. I know I'm not your first. I saw your time as Muradin's lover. I know you felt the same way about the Grand Duchess. The force in her pull was so strong that he was dragged towards her without a chance to resist. It wasn't that he lacked strength. It was just the atmosphere, her voice piercing through him, that made him lose his strength. They were close enough that their lips would touch if he moved even slightly. Their breaths mingled, and the heat rose to his ears at the sound of their breaths intermingling. Their eyes didn't meet. His gaze was lost in her clear eyes, and he smiled faintly at the various emotions they conveyed. But I want to be your first. The saint can't love anyone, but Adriana can, right? It's selfish, I know. Even if I say this, it won't change the fact that I wasn't there in the lives you've lived, I know. Adriana, the ribbon that always tied her hair came undone, and her characteristic platinum blonde hair cascaded down. The white waves covered her shoulders, and a sudden breeze carried a sweet fragrance. He gazed at Adriana, or rather, his gaze was drawn to her lips, so close that they seemed about to touch. This was the first time he had formed a connection with Adriana in his 101 lives. So he didn't have as many memories with her as he did with the others. All she had seen was the past, memories that might be quite unpleasant for her. Was that why she was so upset? He had a feeling that no matter what answer he gave here, if it was a rejection, he wouldn't be able to see her again. And he had no intention of rejecting her. This life was a first, everything. Meeting someone and smiling again, killing someone and crying, resolving the grudges he thought would never disappear, and reconnecting with the people he had met in his past lives. Perhaps this was what it had all been for. He saw the tears flowing down her cheeks and gently wiped them away with his finger. And he didn't say anything more. Their lips met, their tongues intertwined, their gazes locked, and their breaths mingled. He wasn't sure whether to describe it as sweet, but it felt different from being with Muradin, a strange and new sensation. A first, yes, this was also a first. The connection that had begun with him having more than one woman who loved him was heading towards a strange end. On a certain morning of his 101st life, when their lips first touched, he smiled faintly, looking at Adriana's flushed face. Perhaps the fear he had been feeling had completely dissipated because of that moment. See you later. He couldn't tell how Adriana had been affected by what had just happened, but judging by her blushing, she didn't seem to regret it at least. It was rather awkward to see someone who had been so approachable suddenly act like this. He chuckled, watching Adriana repeatedly touch her lips as if she didn't know what to do with her mouth. I won't take too long. It's better for me to finish quickly if possible. It shouldn't take more than a week at most. I'll be waiting. He glanced at Adriana, who was now properly meeting his gaze, gently stroked her cheek, and replied that he understood. The atmosphere was quite different from yesterday. If there had been a line, they had completely crossed it, and the slight awkwardness that had existed between them had vanished completely. All that remained was to join the Crown Prince's army. He had heard that Kane was the vanguard, so he needed to arrive quickly and confirm. He didn't intend to keep them waiting long. Hoping that he could return to the Moon Tower with Adele next time, he gazed at Adriana, who had placed her hands over his. They're coming in large numbers. Adele muttered quietly, watching the pale dust cloud. Treason. It was a ridiculous accusation, even after hearing it again. She didn't know how desperate they were to find a reason to kill her, but thinking back, it seemed the Crown Prince hadn't liked her very much from the beginning. The reason she had been able to prepare in advance was because of her past memories. Adele's eyes narrowed as she thought of Robert, who wasn't here this time, unlike before. She could roughly guess what he was thinking. Had he been by the crown prince's side all this time, pretending to be his confidant to save her? He can't possibly not know that he died. After all, Robert had experienced more deaths than she had. He was tight-lipped and hadn't told her everything, but Adele didn't believe that Robert had only died twice. If he had, he wouldn't have looked at the other women with such longing. She wanted to lock him up somewhere, but she couldn't bring herself to do it, annoyed that he was using her feelings so skillfully. He had sent a letter saying he wouldn't be able to contact her for a while after he went to the capital, and now she understood why he had made that bet last time. It was his way of saying he would definitely save her. What are you going to do? Will you fight back? Adele looked at Lotus's face, smiled wryly, and sighed. The accusation of treason wasn't good for the morale of the troops. It would be strange if they could bravely fight against the imperial army, who were declaring that her actions were treasonous and that they would execute her the moment she was captured. Fighting back was a given, but if they fought like this, defeat was certain. She knew that the masked man in front of her was Kaitl's subordinate, but it would be foolish to clash head-on with an opponent whose power she didn't know. Besides, Robert Taylor has appeared at the East Gate. Betrayal. Adele pressed her hand to her forehead, seeing the wavering morale of her troops, but that didn't mean a miracle would happen to reverse this unfavorable situation. She knew why Robert had come, but she couldn't let on that she knew. Robert would be waiting for her response. She hadn't realized it when he was on her side, but now that he was her enemy, Robert was more troublesome than anyone else. He had defeated the Minotaur. Where else in the world would there be a swordsman who could single-handedly defeat a demon from a book? Adele couldn't even imagine it, but she couldn't just give up. If she fought back, there would be casualties, but if she didn't, the entire plan would be ruined. Adele gripped the sword at her waist and stood up quietly. When her adjutants looked at her, Adele walked towards the door, slowly looked around, and spoke. You will defend against the Imperial Army here as much as possible. If you fight aggressively, they'll use it against you, so fight defensively in preparation for any unforeseen circumstances. Minimize casualties. Then the East, I'll go. She had only one sword left after giving one to Robert. She wondered if he had brought that sword this time. Adele, recalling the sword Robert had wielded at the full moon festival, gazed into the void for a moment, then exhaled softly and drew on her mana. Her adjutant's expressions hardened as mana leaked out with each step she took. The power she emanated now was far greater than when she had first received the title of Grand Duke, so much so that they felt intimidated just being near her. It was possible because she was a naturally talented woman. The Grand Duke, who had unified the North single-handedly, had dozens of tales of her prowess, like cutting down hundreds of barbarians while riding a single wolf. There had been a woman who was called an army all by herself, even without any support troops. Why else would the nation have tried to control her by granting her the title of Grand Duke? When she reached the shaking gate, Adele looked at the soldiers holding onto it and quietly moved forward. As light as the wind, she arrived in the midst of the crowd and looked at the gate with an impassive expression. Robert was beyond this gate, probably appearing as if he had betrayed her, but with a hidden dagger in his heart. Letter winda fa a letter to win fav letter winda fa tayet letter win six data yo a symbol threat tunen. Could she buy him enough time? She wondered if she could fit into the picture he was painting, but she knew she didn't have time for such concerns. Adele cut down the mana seeping through the gate, chuckled softly, and moved her lips. Open the gate, but should I open it myself? The soldiers retreated at her command, and a faint light shone through the slowly opening gate. She felt as if her whole body was being cut by blades just from sensing it from afar. A power far more intense than before, a mana so overwhelming it was difficult to even face. Adele, drawing on all her mana, gazed intently beyond the faint light. It's been so long, I almost didn't recognize you. You seem to have lost some weight. Have you been well? I haven't, because someone didn't contact me for months and didn't even show their face. And this is the second time, so I really wanted to know what was going on in their head. Robert's lips curved into a smile at Adele's voice, and Adele frowned and stared at him. She sensed a different atmosphere from before. It was closer to a woman's intuition than her usual sixth sense, but the unease she usually felt when looking at Robert was a little different now. Did you sleep with the princess? It's not like that. You look like you're in love. I almost threw my sword at you. When she had a rough idea, Adele couldn't help but let out a hollow laugh. She thought it was the princess, but it was the saint, huh? She had tested the waters just in case, and his eyes wavered. Robert was particularly bad at lying to her. His eyes always flickered when he was hiding something, and Adele gritted her teeth, noticing the subtle movement. Well, Robert, I'll commend you for making me angry. She didn't mind that he hadn't contacted her. She mostly understood why he had contacted her in that way, but she couldn't forgive the fact that something else had happened in the meantime. He had said he had hoped she would fight back with all her might. It was fortunate that he had thought that way. Now she could finally be truly angry at Robert. Whoosh flames, burning more brilliantly than usual, engulfed Adele's body. Mana stemmed from a person's emotions. She couldn't use her full strength when she was depressed or sad, and she became faster and lighter when she was happy. Naturally, she was at her strongest when she was angry. The mana that burned like flames disappeared quickly, but it exerted a power stronger than at any other time. It was a power that even created the illusion that the surrounding space was distorting. The snow-covered ground melted, and light flickered in Adele's eyes as she glared at Robert. It was too much to call it a misunderstanding, considering what he had done with Adriana, and Robert, smiling wryly, had no choice but to draw his sword. He had thought it would be best to clash head-on with all their might, but he wasn't sure whether to consider this a good thing or a bad thing. I always thought that something like this might happen someday. Sorry, I'm not saying this because I want to hear an apology. I'm just saying I was too late. It was too late for regrets. While she hadn't been aware, the foxes had already taken their seats, so those seats couldn't be as clean as before. But Robert, Adele's eyes turned cold as she recalled her memories, and at the same time, her mana began to surge even more fiercely. It was a power that even Robert couldn't ignore now. Police car light, important notice, police car light. Would she have been by his side if she had grabbed Robert a little sooner? Would things have been different if she had forced him to become her adjutant when he first came to the north? Adele shook her head at the distracting thoughts that grew stronger as she tried to erase her regrets and charged forward, stomping on the ground. Crash faster than the wind, the speed of a swordsman who had drawn on all their mana was no longer comparable to the wind. Clang. Robert lightly parried the blow, and their eyes met between their swords. Countless emotions flashed through their eyes in that brief moment, and the emotions that had flared up simultaneously began to subside. But their swords didn't stop. Irritation, jealousy, anger, envy. The swords, infused with those complex emotions, created new emotions with each clash. She swung her sword to release her own emotions and to properly complete the plan he had envisioned, but the emotions that melted away in their shared gaze were enough to make her forget her anger for a moment. It seems I've made you angry after such a long time. I apologize. Robert, wielding his sword with a composure different from before, said so as their swords rained down on each other. Adele frowned, averted her gaze slightly, and casually deflected his sword. She was annoyed, but at the same time, she was also happy to see him after so long. This made her feel like she was the one who had lost, but she could clearly see one intention in his eyes. Adele smiled faintly at his will to save her, no matter what, so he wasn't feigning loyalty. Kane, wearing his mask, frowned as he watched the flashes of light in the distance. The Crown Prince had said that Robert would be joining them deceitfully, but judging by that momentum, it looked like they were crossing swords in earnest. He had heard they had a complicated relationship. Perhaps Adele was truly enraged by Robert's betrayal. Of course, the Crown Prince had ordered him not to make rash judgments, but Kane had no intention of blindly following those orders. The problem was that the 4 dragons slumbering within Kyril had grown too powerful. If this situation continued, he too would be swept away by the 4 dragons' growth, so he had to nip this dangerous bud in the bud. Kyril had made a mistake by giving him control of the demons. Once the north was subdued, he would eliminate Robert and march on the capital. Then he planned to kill the Crown Prince and seize the imperial palace before the 4 dragons appeared. Wasn't that the reason he wore this mask? Kane, gently tracing the painted face of a laughing clown on his mask, quietly looked out over the wall. Stones and arrows rained down, but his forces weren't suffering significant casualties. They're being more defensive than I expected. If they were going to do that, they shouldn't have fought back. I don't understand what they're thinking. Another masked figure beside Kane nodded at his words. While the masks made them equals, he had to hide this fact for the time being since he was leading the Imperial Army. A considerable number of soldiers had already been eliminated by Robert's rampage, so this newly revealed force had to appear entirely under Kyril's control. The Imperial Army had to follow his lead until the north was subdued and order restored. But if they continued to drag things out like this, Kane glanced around and clicked his tongue. I'd like to unleash the demons. That's dangerous. If they lost control, they might not be able to handle the situation if a demon like the Minotaur went on a rampage. And hadn't the demons been brought out as a last resort in case Robert betrayed them? If the demons appeared while they were still trying to breach the North's gates, he didn't know how the Imperial Army currently attacking the walls would react. Of course, this was a thought born from not understanding Kane's intentions. Kane smiled faintly at those words and touched the jewel in his pocket. The Imperial Army. The main force wasn't the Imperial Army, but the demons. He had brought 2 demons with him as a precaution. He had failed to gain control of all 4 demons, as Kyril had opposed it, but it didn't matter. The 2 demons he had brought were known as warriors even among demons, Minotaur and Mephisto. Kane recalled their names and pondered for a moment, watching the soldiers pounding on the walls, and then the momentum and flashes of light he felt from afar. It was unexpected that Adele was that strong. But she couldn't be stronger than Robert, who had fought the Minotaur. She would probably be subdued soon, and the Northern Army, currently putting up such a fierce defense, would lose their motivation. Shall we wait a little longer? The moment we unleash the demons, we'll be at odds with Kyril. I don't mind if you're prepared, but brother, I think we should be more cautious. I've already considered it several times, and I have no intention of giving up. The masked figure's eyes narrowed at Kane's casual tone, despite being called brother, but he knew that the more Keitel lost control, the more disadvantageous the situation would become. If the 4 dragons were to awaken in this state, it would truly be the end. If they quickly unleashed the demons, swiftly subdued Robert and the North, and used that momentum to march on the capital, there was certainly a possibility of killing Keitel, seizing the capital, and eliminating the threat of the 4 dragons. But the man, still unable to erase the worry that lingered in his mind, sighed. He couldn't identify the source of this inexplicable unease. Kane's obsession with the demons must have stemmed from his personal desires. The gaze directed at Kane, clutching the jewel in his pocket, grew increasingly sharp. As time passed, Adele's sword slowed while Robert's gradually accelerated. She hadn't expected such a difference in skill. Adele, who had thought she had seen Robert's swordsmanship many times, chuckled hollowly at the disparity in their skills that became more apparent as her emotions subsided. I can't even hold him back anymore. If I try to hold him, he'll just break free with his strength, won't he? I wouldn't try to escape if you held me back, but it's not like I'm only connected to the North. It hadn't mattered much when he was only connected to Adele. For example, when he first came to the North, no one would have said anything if Adele had held him back. But if that happened now, Muradin and Adriana would come running. Adele's position as Grand Duke had prevented that before, but now, having been charged with treason, she was undeniably a criminal until the Crown Prince was dead. Well, that fox of a saint wouldn't stay still if she saw me like this. Clang, their gazes met between their swords, which momentarily stopped in midair. Robert's sword, not a single drop of sweat on him, seemed to have improved even further. She had never seen him fight at full strength, not even when he fought the Minotaur. But if she was being pushed back this much while fighting with all her might, the difference in their skills was clear. She had actually intended to stop him. Robert had done something unforgivable, but it wasn't right for him to do something so reckless to save her. The reason she had responded earnestly, with her emotions mixed in, was because she had thought Robert could withstand it. But she hadn't expected to be so overwhelmed. Now, even blocking his attacks was becoming difficult. They weren't exchanging blows intended to injure each other. They were simply exaggerating their momentum to make the fight appear intense to outsiders. But even that was becoming a struggle. She wanted to stop him, but she couldn't. Would a man who had risked his life to save her be easily swayed? Clang. Adele pushed his sword away forcefully and took a quiet breath. She brushed the sweat-drenched hair from her cheek, her gaze fixed on Robert. If I told you to go back, you wouldn't, would you? You know why I came here. You're a fool. You came here knowing you were walking into a death trap, and now you won't leave even if I tell you to. I think Adele is more like that. Why didn't you run away? If you realized what I was thinking, you should have run away and saved your own life. He hadn't been summoned to the imperial capital this time. The imperial army had simply been dispatched to the north to subjugate the Grand Duke, who was waiting there. If she had realized his intentions, she would have had plenty of time to escape. Of course, the plan would have been ruined. She would have missed the opportunity to properly counterattack Keitel, but Adele's survival would have been enough. I don't mind dying. Adele said so with an indifferent expression, then looked at him and smiled faintly. He was startled by the gentle smile on the woman who usually wore a sneer or cold smile, and she continued, twisting her lips even further. But you can't die. I know it's selfish, but I'm a selfish woman. She had already considered running away. She had thought about disappearing from the north, depriving Robert of the opportunity to use the subjugation force to attack the Crown Prince. Would Robert be all right if that happened? He might be targeted under the pretext of colluding with her. He might figure it out after repeating the same time loop several times, but Adele didn't want to consider even the slightest risk. If Robert's plan succeeded at the cost of her life, it would be a small price to pay. So she thought it was all right to throw away one life. There were plenty of other women for him, she thought self-deprecatingly. Adele sighed quietly, realizing that Robert's gaze had turned cold. She had expected him to be upset. He seemed quite angry at her words about not minding dying. What could she do? Her longtime friend, her intuition, had told her that the Imperial army wouldn't just attack the north. And she could easily guess that Robert had rushed here to stop it. I'll say it one last time. Leave me and go. I'll say it one last time. I'm not going. Then I have no choice but to cut you down here. Try it, if you can. Adele gripped her sword and pointed it at Robert. They were close enough that the tip of her sword almost touched his neck, but Adele's hand only trembled, not a single drop of blood spilled. She couldn't cut him down. From the beginning, it had been predetermined that she would lose this argument. Grit. Adele gritted her teeth and glared at him, but Robert's expression remained calm. His attention was focused on the waves of mana he felt from afar. The energy emanating from the north gate was unusual. It was even greater than the mana he had felt when he first saw the Minotaur. It was probably the Minotaur, having recovered its strength, or another demon. Adele had to escape now. Robert, looking at the sword pointed at his neck, smiled wryly. He flicked the sword away with his finger, and it was sheathed. It was a sword that had never been intended to pierce him. There hadn't been a single trace of killing intent from the moment she first pointed it at him. Aren't you going to stab me? I will. Then do it. My neck is right here. As Robert stepped closer, Adele took a step back. Her trembling arm finally dropped the sword to the ground. Her empty hand, her weakened legs, continued to retreat until she was pressed against the wall. Kaboom! The purple flash of light erupting in the distance was a sign that the demons had appeared. There was no more time to waste, and Robert smiled gently, looking at Adele's moving lips. "I'll be fine, but still, knowing how I feel about you, this should be enough to reassure you." Boom, he wasn't planning to die. He hadn't come here to die, and the power he had exerted while fighting Adele was just a fraction of what he had gained. The mana that stretched towards the sky finally erupted with a roar like a flash of lightning. Adele stared blankly at the flash of light, far more powerful than before, and then, with a dull thud, her body went limp. Robert looked at the edge of his hand, then lifted Adele into his arms and approached the soldier standing at the gate. Adele couldn't be involved in this fight. It was his fight alone. He handed Adele over to the soldier and gently stroked the unconscious woman's forehead. "She'll be fine. Probably nothing will happen." He had cultivated this power to protect her. If he had been going to be defeated by this kind of trial, he wouldn't have come here so confidently. "Even if something happens, I'll make sure it's nothing." Robert, gripping his sword, turned his head again. And as he ran towards the demons, he didn't look back, to let go of his lingering attachments, to steel his resolve for this fight. He had already given much thought to what he could do. The possibility of all 4 demons being unleashed, the possibility of him defeating all of them. He knew it was a slim chance, but he hadn't expected to encounter all 4 of them. Kaido wouldn't completely trust Kane. Or rather, it was more accurate to say that the 4 dragons wouldn't trust Kane. Why would Kane stick with Kaido? They were using each other. A relationship like that couldn't be bound by trust. Naturally, he realized that they would inevitably turn on each other. Would they hand over all their forces if they didn't trust each other? If the 4 dragons had completely taken over Kaido, the demons wouldn't matter much. They would follow the 4 dragons' control anyway. But the fact that Kaido was keeping 2 demons meant that the 4 dragons hadn't yet gained complete control. It was a battle with a time limit. He didn't know how long that limit was, but it should be enough time to gamble. I knew this would happen. The Imperial army that had been pounding on the North Gate had vanished. Some of the masked figures were lying scattered around, suggesting there had been internal conflict. A rampage. Kane was more ambitious than he had thought. He had known it since Kane had revealed his face, and he had also grasped it to some extent when Kane had been clinging to Teresa. He could roughly guess why the mana he sensed here was familiar, because those 2 had the greatest fighting power. He had already fought one of them, and the other was a name he had read countless times in books. If the Minotaur represented violence, Mephisto was a symbol of fear, a name that instilled subservience. Violence, fear, domination, and slaughter. Weren't these 4 demons the symbols of the 4 dragons, the harbingers of the apocalypse? It was a fitting combination, but he didn't have time for such jokes. He didn't see demons amidst the surging mana. Instead, he saw Kane's lifeless body lying sprawled out. He had finally done something he couldn't handle. North Gate was intact, and there were even a few adjutants overlooking the area, suggesting that Kane had ultimately failed to control the demons. He must have thought he could do it. But the Minotaur hadn't been included in their control from the beginning, which was evident from the moment he saw Robert, broke free from his chains, and attacked. R tilde letter 1D51E letter 1033D Omicron beta E hatchek letter 1E63. His head throbbed. It wasn't the first time he had seen the aftermath of a massacre, but this was closer to carnage. Imperial soldiers trampled by the immense power of the demons, and even the suspicious masked figures. Well, he couldn't say they were innocent. The moment they attacked the north, they were either going to be eliminated by him or killed by the demons. Thud. The adjutants in the fortress turned their heads at the loud thud. He, too, slowly turned his head towards the sound. It was rare to see mana flowing so visibly, but sometimes the mana contained within a single body would leak out. It was a tingling sensation, a dizzying feeling just from looking at them. Even though he had enhanced his senses, the mana emanating from the demons was overwhelming. Could he do it? He asked himself, then realized it was a meaningless question. He had come to this battlefield prepared. Rather than questioning whether he could do it, he needed to steel his resolve. He had to. He had to defeat the 2 demons here and march on the capital. "Your Excellency." He turned his head at Lothos's voice, and Lothos gestured to him and pulled the soldiers back. He could roughly guess what it meant. Lothos was going to retreat the troops and was waiting for his order on whether to deploy the adjutants. The adjutants seemed to understand why he had come here, judging by the fact that he had knocked Adele unconscious and handed her over to them. He would be grateful if they believed he wouldn't betray them, but it didn't matter even if they didn't. He stared at the dark circles under Lothos's eyes, which seemed to have deepened from the stress of the past few days, and chuckled, shaking his head. This action had only one meaning. There would be no more retreating. Lothos, understanding the meaning, pondered for a moment, then retreated, and the Minotaur, watching him, chuckled softly. He hadn't expected them to wait this long. Mephisto's eyes beside him sharpened considerably. "I think we've waited long enough. It's a bit early to finish our last fight, but you don't seem to have any intention of backing down." "Of course not. I don't want to hear any more nonsense, Minotaur." "Don't we have work to do?" Mephisto's dark red body turned even blacker, and the Minotaur snorted, glancing at him. The white steam melted and burrowed into the ground as it touched it, and Mephisto, seeing the reddening rock, turned his gaze back to Robert. Are you the human who cut off the Minotaur's arm? That's how it happened. It's a shame I couldn't kill him, though. If he had pushed himself and finished him off back then, no, forget it. It wouldn't have been possible anyway. Even if he had succeeded, it would have been a mutual destruction. And he hadn't come all the way here without a plan. As he drew his sword, a storm of mana erupted. The time he had spent in the Moon Tower hadn't been meaningless. Why else would he have cut off all contact and lived in seclusion? Why else would he have spent months immersed in sword training, barely contacting Adriana or Murugan? It was all for this moment. He had climbed the steps, and now it was time to reach the top. His sword, moving slowly, sliced through the air, and the Minotaur flinched. They would be getting the idea now that this thing he held was extremely dangerous, and that if he let go, it would take their lives. We can't let our guard down. Slice. Mephisto's charge stopped, and the Minotaur's body, about to reach out, was sliced apart. The soldiers gasped, seeing the demons' bodies being torn apart in an instant. The adjutant stared in shock, and the killing intent in the demon's eyes still fixed on him. He looked at the tangled mess and thought about who would be standing at the end of this fight. Slice. Robert still held the upper hand in the fight. Unlike before, even though the demons were regenerating at a sickeningly fast rate, they couldn't maintain their momentum if they focused on healing. The parts that were cut again, and the regeneration of the severed parts slowed down. A relentless, unending barrage of attacks. How many people in the world could withstand this? The Minotaur, enduring the bone-deep cuts, let out a cackling laugh. He was on a completely different level compared to their last encounter. Even though he had almost fully recovered his true form's power, he couldn't even approach Robert now. Mephisto, you're still alive, right? I'm alive, that's about it. Mephisto, having faced Robert's mana head-on, replied with a groan. There weren't many ways to break through the situation. He wasn't at full strength, having already used a lot of mana just by being summoned. It was too much to draw out more power here. If he did, he wouldn't have enough power left for regeneration and would collapse. Naturally, this fight couldn't continue in its current form. There was no such thing as an infinite attack. If Robert could maintain this explosive mana indefinitely, he would have poured it all out at once and destroyed the demon's cores. He didn't think the human was foolish enough not to know that. Is this a diversionary tactic? If not, perhaps Robert was hoping for the mana consumed by their regeneration to be completely depleted. Naturally, humans didn't know much about demons. It was an effective tactic. The mana consumed by regeneration was considerable, especially for a demon like the Minotaur, who couldn't properly control mana. Mephisto, realizing that the Minotaur was struggling more than he had expected, quietly looked at Robert. And Robert had already anticipated what Mephisto was thinking. Mephisto would probably think that this attack would eventually stop, and that was true. His mana was slowly running out, and he probably wouldn't be able to keep cutting like this for much longer. But there was another reason he was stalling for time. Adriana told me something. The memory of his visit to Adriana was vivid, and he had received a lot of help from her. And among that help, there was a tactic effective against demons. The most important thing to execute that tactic was to somehow slow down their regeneration. Even if it looked like he was pushing himself too hard, it was a necessary step. He hadn't reached the next level in the Moon Tower. He had grasped a clue and improved, but he hadn't broken through the wall and reached the next level. He had simply become more adept at controlling mana at his current level. When this attack ended, he would be able to unleash the attack he had been planning. Robert smiled quietly, looking at the demons whose bodies were still being torn apart. Perhaps there was nothing more enjoyable than imagining what would happen to them soon. The battle continued in a stalemate. The slashes that had been tearing the demons apart were gone, but Robert's skill was still undeniable, almost reaching the heavens. The 2-to-1 numerical advantage was meaningless. What a single human wielding a sword was accomplishing was close to a miracle. Crash, the power that had cut the mountain was his full strength, but now he could wield it effortlessly. That was what it meant to master the use of power. He could pour all his strength into a single point without spilling a drop. Before, he had been wasting the overflowing mana, but now he could contain it within his body and strengthen his physical abilities. It was on a completely different level compared to his previous enhancements. He wasn't out of breath. The consumption of mana had also drastically decreased, so even though he couldn't unleash the same slashes as before, he could still fight. The Minotaur, its bones broken, looked at its dangling arm and smiled wryly. He didn't know what Robert had been doing in the past few months. There hadn't been many humans who dared to challenge him 1,000 years ago, but now he was being carved up like a livestock animal. It was ridiculous. He had thought he could overwhelm Robert once he regained his strength. Humans were like that after all. Even if they improved, there was a limit. To fight against a demon, one had to be at least a deity. Interesting. Don't let your guard down. If we make even the slightest mistake, we'll be the ones slice. Mephisto's head was severed. It regenerated soon after, writhing, but a more serious glint appeared in his cold eyes. He was the one who had been beheaded, but the tide of this battle would change now, or rather it had to change. Thump! Mephisto stomped on the ground and his figure vanished. Unlike the Minotaur, Mephisto's power was focused on speed. It meant he usually dodged attacks, but even so, the sword kept cutting him. He didn't know why. At first, he thought it was because Robert had been caught off guard, but considering the level Robert had reached, he would be cut down eventually, even if he poured all his strength into dodging. He would break through. One of his arms, sharpened like a blade, thrust forward. The sword strike, tearing through the air, headed towards Robert, but Robert dodged it with an almost superhuman movement, swinging his sword. He had honed his swordsmanship alone in the mountains. Although it was a style learned through observation, he clearly remembered the footwork mixed within its principles. Letter 25D, a small Capen Armenian, Oenus Beta's right side. Mephisto's speed was fast enough that he normally wouldn't be able to dodge, but he could easily dodge thanks to the training he had accumulated. Robert, gauging the force that grazed his cheek, smiled wryly. He was amazed that he was holding his own against this. Wells, he would be in trouble if he couldn't even do this after decades of training. It wasn't that Robert lacked talent. He had realized that recently while training in the Moon Tower. It wasn't that he lacked talent, but rather that his body couldn't keep up with his mind. His mind was already moving forward, but his body hadn't grown at all, barely able to swing a sword. How could he gain speed in that state? His impatient body hadn't developed properly because it had been pushed too hard, and it had helped that he had focused on refining his body first in the situation. He would embody the swordsmanship he envisioned in his mind. Robert deflected Mephisto's sword, which was thrusting diagonally, slammed the Minotaur into the ground, and chuckled softly. He had enough mana. Even though he couldn't unleash it as wildly as before, it was enough to maintain his advantage. It would be a different story if one of them decided to self-destruct and attack, but he could destroy the demon's cores before that happened. Amazing. The adjutants watching could only stare in awe. The battle between Robert and the demons was like something out of a myth. They had thought the descriptions in books were exaggerated, but their opinions changed when they saw lightning strike and thunder rumble with every swing of the sword. Bunta, who had been confident in his own skills, had been speechless for a while now, unable to comprehend the speed at which Robert was wielding his sword. You fought against someone like that, do you know? How did you even manage back then? He must have gone easy on you. Maybe he won on purpose to impress the Grand Duchess. Back then, Robert's power had only recovered to about 10%, but no one knew that. Thinking back to the time he had fought Temujin, covered in blood, he couldn't even remember how many people he had killed. Had there been hundreds of them crammed into that narrow space? How's the Grand Duchess doing? She hasn't opened her eyes yet, but she'll probably come running here when she wakes up. Do you think she'll stay still while her lover is like that? I was so worried that he had really betrayed us. Did she already know? When they heard that Robert was coming to subjugate the north with the Imperial army, the adjutants had been most worried about Adele's state of mind. They had been concerned that she might break down, with the man she had been so close to now betraying her, but Adele had simply chuckled and gripped her sword without a care. She had told them to worry about saving the soldiers instead of worrying about such things. They had thought she was pretending to be fine while suffering from the shock, but she had actually known all along. Lothos scratched his head and shuddered, watching the mana emanating from the demons. He couldn't even imagine how Robert was fighting against them, but it was his role to prepare for what comes after. How many people could come up with a proper plan besides him? Organize the remaining troops and get them ready. In the worst-case scenario, we'll have to retreat to the border, and if not, we'll have to march on the capital immediately. To the capital? Yes, it's time to get serious. The adjutants' faces turned pale at his words, and Lothos shrugged as if it was obvious. The moment the Imperial army came to subjugate the north, all the northern troops were treated as rebels. And if that Imperial army was annihilated along with the demons in the front yard of the northern fortress, it was obvious what kind of accusations they would face. Adele had said that the command authority belonged to Lotus in her absence. Although he didn't have a deputy commander's badge, Lothos tapped the badge on his chest and gave the order to the entire army. Rebels, huh? He had never thought of starting a rebellion in his life, but now he couldn't just stand by and do nothing. We are now entering a state of emergency. All troops, arm yourselves and prepare for battle. Contact your families in advance. If Duke Taylor defeats the demons immediately, it was a small comfort that his family was in the west. At least the Capital Defense Force wouldn't go after his wife and children. He had also sent a letter telling them to hide, so there shouldn't be any problems. We launch a coup. Although he hadn't intended to overthrow the Imperial family, it was time to fight for their survival. Crack, the Minotaur's completely shattered arm fell off. The Minotaur's face, having personally torn off the arm that could no longer regenerate, was also a mess. Mephisto was in a similar state. Now, Robert was also covered in wounds. What would Murugan say if she saw me like this? No, Adriana too, and Adele having 3 women was a headache. Before he had 1 person worrying about him, but now he had 3, which meant 3 times the nagging. What could he do? It was all karma he had created himself. He chuckled, finding it funny that he was thinking about other people even though he was in a situation where the slightest mistake could cost him his limbs. It was probably because he had formed such deep connections with them. He shifted his sword to his other hand, barely managing to move the arm that was too damaged to be of any use. Adriana would probably heal him later. A week, that should be enough time to recover. A week for healing his injuries. A week to march and attack the capital. He didn't know how Keitel would move during those 2 weeks, and the sight of the demons still stubbornly clinging to life gave him an even bigger headache. Wasn't it about time for them to die? The Minotaur was incapacitated after losing both its arms, but Mephisto still had some fight left in him. The reason he had been able to win this cowardly fight was simple. He had so much energy left just from using his power efficiently. If he had gone a step further, he might have finished them off instantly. Although you are not a demon, I must commend you. Not only did you cripple the Minotaur, but you also crippled me. It will probably take a long time for these wounds to heal, so Robert Taylor, was it? He remained silent, listening, and the Minotaur, who had been staggering, finally collapsed. Mephisto stared at the scene, dust rising with a loud thud. A single human had defeated one of 2 demons. Could he finish off this human? It would be difficult. His initial carelessness was the cause. He had used a tremendous amount of mana for regeneration and had lost the advantage. Police car light, important notice, police car light. If he had attacked the moment he saw Robert, he could have killed him by now. Mephisto wasn't foolish enough to continue this losing battle. A chance to turn the tables. Mephisto suddenly looked at the northern fortress where the remaining northern troops were stationed. If he couldn't win, he could at least demoralize them and prevent them from fighting. Even if he disappeared from here, the 4 dragons would continue to fight. It was a gamble worth taking. I respect you. BZZT, the mana gathered at his fingertips, was almost all that Mephisto had left. He poured everything into it, even the last bit of mana needed to sustain his life, mana solely for annihilating the northern fortress. Robert, realizing the nature of that mana, desperately stomped on the ground. It wasn't aimed at him. That was so, I will destroy not you, but what you protect. Slice as Mephisto's head was severed, the beam of light headed towards the fortress. And Robert, without even confirming Mephisto's death, unleashed his mana and threw himself towards the fortress. Are you truly determined to go? Dozens of fragmented rays of light from the stained glass window touched the floor, shimmering with an almost mystical brilliance. The pure white clothes reflected the light in the same way. The Pope's voice was gentle, as always, but Adriana decided to ignore that gentleness for a moment. She had just made a decision that was too harsh, arbitrary, and selfish for a saint. I am. You will retain your position as saint, but even so, there will be criticism. Even if that's the case, isn't it wrong to act on personal desires? Some pitied her for being brought here as a child and made into a saint. However, this religion wasn't a place where everything could be decided based on sympathy. The sympathy she had received as a child had faded, and there were countless followers who fervently followed the grown saint. Even the Pope himself couldn't deny that the saint's value lay in that aspect. He knew that Adriana had recently formed a deep relationship with Robert Taylor. He was the Pope, after all. He had to know everything that happened within the church. The reason he hadn't said anything about it, despite her being the saint, was simply out of consideration, not as the Pope, but as an old man. But now that she was leaving, he had to hold her accountable. I ask again. The aged Pope moved, and Adriana, recalling the day she had first arrived at the church, nodded slightly. Back then, the current Pope, who had still been a cardinal, had been the most frightening person to her. But now his former sternness was gone, and he simply looked like a grandfather. She was certain that he would eventually give in to her unreasonable demands. Are you truly determined to go? Going to the north in its current chaotic state is something the imperial family could consider an act of treason. If God has commanded it, I must follow. Did God truly command it? Is the face you envision in your heart truly God? Adriana remained silent, not answering the question. But wasn't the meaning clear? The Pope smiled wryly, ran his hand over his wrinkled face, and sighed. He had thought this day might come. She hadn't been born and raised in the church. She was too free-spirited for a saint, and she had experienced too much. Letter 211, letter 1D586. Now letter 1D664, letter 162, Igrava Sedilla. He had thought there would be a time when she would leave, harboring intentions completely different from the church's doctrines. Love. If the saint truly believed in and followed that romantic emotion, what should he do? If the saint left, the ensuing criticism would be directed solely at him. He hadn't stopped the saint. The Pope had gone senile and abandoned God's grace. But if he didn't stop her here, if the Robert Taylor, whom the saint loved so dearly, was buried somewhere in the north, this is giving me a headache. He didn't know what God's will was. He had never wanted to be burdened with such complicated problems in his old age, and just perhaps even this was God's will. The Pope looked at Adriana, who had lowered her head and slowly extended his hand, holding his staff. Adriana, the divine power emanating from his hand, enveloped Adriana's body. It was the first time the Pope, who had always called her saint, had called her by her name, and Adriana, startled, looked at him. A stern glint, reminiscent of her childhood, momentarily returned to his faded green eyes. His eyes narrowed slightly, then softened as he sighed. I have always wished for your happiness. How could he feel at ease bringing a clueless child here in the name of God's grace? He had pondered countless times whether this was truly God's will, but now he had come to believe that even releasing Adriana was God's will. If this was truly what God desired, preventing it would be against the doctrines. So I will grant you permission. Your Holiness, leave immediately. The followers who hear this news will soon flock here. Treason. It was an incident that had erupted for terrible reason. The Grand Duchess and Robert, caught in this inferno, would likely not be unscathed. He had bestowed his power upon her, so she would be able to heal them even if they were severely injured. If necessary, he could even unleash the divine power that had been sealed away. It would probably be possible. Adriana looked at the Pope for a moment, then stood up and turned her back. Adriana's secret journey to the north was decided. Mephisto's body crumbled. The disintegrating body had a simple meaning. It meant that he was gathering all his accumulated mana, even the mana that sustained his life, into that finger to unleash an attack. He ran as fast as he could. Gritting his teeth was a habit, but he felt a sharp pain, as if he had broken a tooth from clenching his jaw too tightly. He had considered it that something like this could happen, but there wasn't really a way to prevent it. Facing two demons meant pushing himself to the limit to even have a chance. If he had been at full strength, he could have somehow deflected that mana, but now it was impossible. One of his arms was crippled, and all the mana he had left was just enough to finish off Mephisto. It felt like everything was happening in slow motion. That short span of time was fragmented into dozens, hundreds of pieces, allowing him to observe even the smallest details. The gazes directed at him, the soldiers falling beneath the crumbling walls. There weren't many bodies that could withstand the mana. He couldn't read any emotions on the faces of those who crumbled the moment the wave of mana touched them. Perhaps he was ignoring them. It was a selfish thought, but there was only one person in his mind right now. Coincidentally, he sensed a familiar mana at the edge of the direction the mana storm was heading. It was a presence he had become quite familiar with, having met her shortly after his latest regression. Adele, the reason he had come this far. The person he had vowed to save, no matter what. Yes, no matter what. He had anticipated this kind of self-destruction, but he hadn't been able to find a way to prevent it. What was he supposed to do in this situation? He had only thought of one thing. He had said he would make it as if nothing had happened. There was probably only one way. He saw Adele in the distance, and he ran towards her, throwing himself in front of her before the mana could reach her. Adele frowned slightly, rubbing the throbbing back of her neck. She hadn't expected him to knock her unconscious there. She had thought something was up, but she hadn't imagined he would knock her out so unceremoniously. Judging by the three powerful mana reactions outside, Robert was probably fighting the demons. She wanted to go out and help, but Adele knew why Robert had knocked her unconscious. She would probably only be a hindrance in that fight. The reality that she was nothing but a hindrance was ridiculous, and she couldn't even begin to guess what Robert was thinking. What did I tell you? Adriana and Muradin were there too. It wouldn't matter if she died. It might even be more helpful if she died, damn it. Adele knew better than anyone that Robert wouldn't think that way. If she were Robert, she would have definitely come here and tried to save her. But she was worried, so she couldn't stay here forever. Their adjutants were probably watching the battle. Adele grabbed her sword and opened the door. The hallway was quiet. The few soldiers she saw were busily preparing something, and sometimes she saw one of the adjutants running off in a hurry. Lothos was in command in her absence, so what orders had he given for everyone to be acting like this? Adele pondered for a moment, then realized that it was all for one purpose and chuckled softly. A coup. If Robert won against the demons, they would have to march on the capital immediately. Ironically, the moment she was branded a traitor, the lives of everyone in the north were at stake. If they couldn't advance from here, they would have to sit and wait for death, so Adele inwardly praised Lothos for understanding the situation and started walking. She sincerely hoped that Robert wouldn't be injured. He was probably fighting for his life. But the fact that he had knocked her unconscious and gone ahead meant that he had done it because she was there. If he had really thought she was going to die, he would have at least told her to withdraw the northern troops. He must have done it with the intention of winning, to be able to march immediately after winning. Her steps, which had been continuing for a while, stopped abruptly because of the intense wave she felt from afar. A powerful mana storm, completely different from before, aimed in this direction. She felt Robert's mana too, but it was only for a moment. The mana, not completely neutralized, struck the fortress, and Adele was about to draw on her own mana amidst the collapsing debris. Robert, she instinctively knew that she couldn't block this mana with her own power. She would either die or be crippled even if she survived. But why was Robert there? Robert, not saying a word even though their eyes met, stood in front of Adele, shielding her with his bloodied body, panting. The meaning of his action was clear. Adele's hand, which she had instinctively raised to block the attack, was stopped in midair and thrown back. Robert's mana had already formed a barrier in front of her, and her shouts didn't reach him. "Robert, what are you?" "It's nothing. Police car light, important notice, police car light." Hadn't he lived countless lives trying to save her? Robert met Adele's gaze and smiled gently. It was the same sly smile he always wore, as if soothing a crying child, but the mana storm behind him was clearly breaking through the barrier. Crack. The mana struck his body and exploded, and even though he felt a sharp pain as his body was pierced, he continued to smile. It's nothing, he had decided that from the beginning. Even if he died, saving Adele would be a small price to pay. In his fading consciousness, amidst the completely vanished mana, Robert smiled quietly, confirming that Adele was unharmed. This was enough. This was enough. T/N, not a repeated line, but how it is in the raws, Robert. There was no reply. Adele, her trembling hand reaching for his limp body slumped against her shoulder, moved her lips at the warmth she felt. It was still warm, but it was growing cold. Why, how could this be? Robert, her hand touching his back, came away covered in blood. Robert was there in a world painted crimson, his back pierced, his chest pierced by the mana blast from moments ago. Adele stared blankly at the wound, her eyes slowly beginning to tremble. He was dead? No, that couldn't be. He had said it would be nothing. He had always returned unharmed whenever she thought he was dead. He would be fine this time too, Adele thought, slowly lifting Robert. He was like a puppet with its strings cut. He must have fainted. He always went limp like this when he was exhausted. She could heal his wounds. Even if she didn't have a clear method in mind, Robert couldn't be dead. Robert had died and come back to life countless times. Someone like that couldn't die so easily. Adele steeled her resolve. Someone will come soon. We can be a little late in marching on the capital. We can leave after you're healed. It could be delayed. No matter what Keitel was planning, it wasn't more important than Robert's life. If he lived, after seeing him get up as if nothing had happened, she could scold him, get angry at him for doing something so reckless. Robert's feet, slung over her back, dragged along the ground. Blood flowed down her back, then stopped, and Adele chuckled hollowly. His blood was cold. The hand she was holding, his body slumped against her, was cold. She tried to ignore it. There was still hope. It wasn't too late, but she couldn't deny the fact that she couldn't even feel the faint breath she had always felt. Her bitten lips turned white. Her trembling legs gave way, and Robert's body slid off her back. It was unnatural. He wouldn't be like this even if he had just fainted. A living person couldn't not breathe. His body wouldn't be this cold if he were alive. The northern wind was cold, a bone-chilling wind despite it being autumn. His blood congealed, and his pale face, eyes still open, was pressed against the ground. Renuo Iagonek, letter 1D668, he's alive. The hazy memories she thought she had forgotten, the things she had wanted to forget, resurfaced. Her father, who had disappeared, and when she found him again, he was dead. She had always been the one to die first when she was with Robert, so this was the first time she had felt this way. She didn't want to feel it again. Her trembling lips were bitten until they bled, and the hand that had been caressing Robert's cheek now clutched his shirt, crumpling the fabric. She couldn't even remember the last time she had cried, and she lowered her head, feeling the tears streaming down her face. Her chest ached with each sob. She had so much she wanted to say, so many things she hadn't said yet. Me. Adele, holding his completely cold body, muttered softly. Her voice wouldn't come out properly, her throat constricting, and she felt a sharp pain. It was happening again. She had lost someone precious again. Back then, it was because she was powerless, and this time she had only been on the receiving end of his help. She had become stronger. She was called the Grand Duchess, and she had never shown a single moment of weakness in front of Robert, always pretending to be strong. Just where had things gone wrong? The adjutants had noticed Adele crying uncontrollably for the first time in her life, but no one dared to approach her. Robert, his chest pierced, still didn't respond. The warm breath she had always felt, the smiling lips, didn't move. He was dead. Adele, realizing that she could no longer see him, stared blankly into the void. She couldn't maintain the composure she had always held. She couldn't accept reality, so she just stared blankly at Robert, wishing it was all a dream. Don't leave me. The woman who had been alone since childhood was alone again. She had lost him last time, and her vow to protect him this time had been broken. She wiped away the tears that wouldn't stop flowing, but her tear-streaked face wouldn't return to normal, and Robert wouldn't come back to life. As everyone held their breath in the silence, unable to even utter a word, a soldier rushed in from the side and delivered an urgent report. Urgent report. Be quiet. Can't you see the atmosphere here? It's not that. The saint has arrived. The silence that had seemed eternal was broken in an instant. Everyone present realized that the saint was their only hope in this situation. Adele slowly raised her head and gave the order. A simple order to bring the saint to her. It was a time when a miracle was needed. A winding white path wasn't what he saw. At first, there was only pitch-black darkness. He wondered why the regression wasn't happening, then remembered his vow at the beginning of his 101st life about eternal death and laughed in disbelief. He hadn't wanted it to happen like this. Was this some kind of cosmic joke? Well, if the regression had started in this situation, it would have been quite difficult to endure. He didn't regret dying in Adele's place, but he couldn't help but wonder if there had been a better way. He didn't know what Adele was doing right now. This darkness where he couldn't even tell how much time had passed since he opened his eyes, this abyss that didn't seem to want anything from him, perhaps it was his personal hell. As he lay there, unable to even grasp the passage of time, a light suddenly leaked from the ceiling, touching him and flowing towards a certain point. He followed the flickering light, as if it was urging him to follow, and finally he saw this space. Ruins. The problem was that it was so collapsed and destroyed that it was difficult to discern its original form. It definitely looked like ruins, but he couldn't tell what it had been used for. There were towering pillars, probably meant to support the ceiling, but that was all the information he could gather. He continued walking, but nothing changed except for the stones that crunched under his feet. The light dimmed and the darkness that had enveloped the surroundings receded. He looked up at the sky, and brilliant stars showered their light down on him. The destroyed ruins and the star clusters embedded like jewels, the pitch-black canvas painted as if in a picture, a new stroke of white beginning. He felt something change and turned around and saw a woman wearing a hooded robe. When had she been standing there? He instinctively reached for his weapon, then frowned slightly, realizing he didn't have one. Had his senses dulled so much that he couldn't even feel her presence? It might have been because he was dead. He didn't want to acknowledge it, but he was definitely dead. Fortunately, the woman didn't seem hostile. The light that had been wriggling in the air disappeared, seeping into the woman, and he realized that this space belonged to her. He wondered why she had summoned him here. "We finally meet. I've been waiting for this moment for a very long time. That sounds like you've been waiting for me to die. That wouldn't be wrong. Your will was crucial for this eternal regression to end." Her quiet smile seemed mocking, but strangely, he didn't feel angry. He felt a familiar presence, but she seemed to notice his observation and turned towards him, moving her lips. "I was planning to explain everything even if you didn't stare at me like that. From the fact that there will be no more regressions to the reason you're in this space. I'm curious about that, but I'm more curious about something else. What is it? What's Adele doing right now?" He was more worried about what would happen afterward than about his own death. Was she devastated? Was she crying too much? He hoped she wasn't too sad, and he felt uneasy about their parting without any preparation. The woman, pondering the name Adele, chuckled and looked at him intently. He frowned, wondering what was so funny, and the woman sighed and continued. "You don't have to worry. You'll see her again." "What do you mean, see her again?" "It means you're not dead yet. Although your body was pierced, your heart briefly stopped in that mangled state. A miracle is still on your side. I will also intervene to some extent. I had anticipated that something like this would happen." The more he listened to her, the more his eyes narrowed. She spoke as if she had known about his regressions from the beginning, as if she was aware of everything. She had answered his question, but he had only asked out of desperation. He had thought this space was unusual from the moment he saw it, but what kind of being was this woman to be able to give such an answer? It didn't take long for that question to be answered. The woman removed her hood and he saw a familiar face. "Adriana, I imagine the resemblance is quite striking. That child inherited my divine power, so she would naturally resemble me. I've always been by Adriana's side and also with you. There was only one being who could be described as such. The one who had bestowed divine power upon Adriana, the one he had expected to be involved in his regressions in some way. Allow me to introduce myself again. I am Eden, the goddess who created and observes the moon." The woman, who looked exactly like Adriana, smiled, but he still couldn't answer. He needed time to process this situation. He had thought it was all over, but it wasn't. Nothing was over yet. The moment he heard the title, Goddess of the Moon, his emotions became incredibly complicated. It sounded as if she was saying that he was the reason the regressions had been repeating. He could remain calm because she resembled Adriana, and because he already knew the regressions were related to the 4 dragons. "I thought you would be angry, but you're quite calm. Waking up is more important than venting my anger here. As you said, you're the goddess of the moon, but how am I supposed to believe that? I believe knowing about your regressions is reason enough, and if you still can't believe it, doesn't my appearance serve as proof?" He already knew he couldn't help but believe her. The moment he saw her face, he had made the connection to the goddess of the moon. Doubting her here would only stall the conversation and get him nowhere. He probably had to believe her for the conversation to progress. He still couldn't get used to the goddess's face after she removed her hood. He instinctively knew she wasn't Adriana, but they still looked alike. As if sensing his gaze, the goddess smiled faintly, just like Adriana would, and spoke quietly. "I know you have many questions, but I can't wake you up right away. It would be quite painful if you woke up immediately, and you probably wouldn't be able to fight properly against Keitel. You know about Keitel too. It's embarrassing, but I'm aware that people worship me. Even though I hid after being defeated by the 4 dragons, I've known why the people of the Empire seek me." But the reason she couldn't appear, the goddess brushed her hair aside and quietly gazed into the void. The mark on her exposed forehead was a black symbol that looked ominous at first glance. At the same time, the moonstone within his body reacted, and the goddess, seeming to sense it, looked at him and moved her lips. "I was defeated by the 4 dragons 1,000 years ago, and I was sealed away, stripped of my power, separate from the 4 dragons. I was simply lucky to be able to seal them. You didn't seal them after defeating them. The wounded 4 dragons escaped to another dimension, and it became known as a sealing because they were unfortunately trapped in that dimension. All I did was take some measures in preparation for their return." The goddess pointed at his chest, and he realized that the measures she spoke of was the moonstone embedded within his body. It wasn't an artifact created by the 4 dragons. The goddess immediately began to explain that question as well. The moonstone is an artifact of the four dragons, but I infused it with my power, anticipating that the four dragons would escape to another dimension, so that someone could fight against them even if they returned through the moonstone. So that someone was me, that's right. Although the four dragons played a significant role in you obtaining the moonstone, it was my power that prevented them from entering your body. The more he listened to her explanation, the more he wanted to say something to the goddess. It was true that the regressions were caused by the four dragons, but the fact that his mind hadn't broken and that he had felt the pain so vividly, it meant that the goddess had orchestrated it. He was about to lash out, goddess or not, but his anger subsided at the sight of her face, identical to Adriana's. It felt like a sin to yell at that face. He had done something quite regrettable. It was highly likely that Adriana would come to the north. The fact that he wasn't dead was surely a miracle brought about by Adriana's divine power. I'm not that curious about the regressions. Of course, it was the most significant of all the suffering he had endured, but investigating the regressions wouldn't change anything. The four dragons had possessed Keitel instead of him, and he already knew that his countless deaths were related to the four dragons. There was no benefit beyond confirming that Arwen's research was correct. Then the most important thing here was why he was still alive, the reason she had summoned him here, and whether this mindscape had been prepared from the beginning. What happened to Adele? He had asked the same question several times. The goddess, as if trying to read his mind, pondered for a moment, then shook her head and smiled wryly. Yes, she probably wasn't all right. There was no way she would be fine after seeing him die right in front of her. She would either be blaming herself, be devastated, or be acting indifferent to hide her pain. Adele Ygritte was very emotionally dependent on you. From the moment she regained her memories of the past, you became a very special existence to her. As for the feelings of the women who shared your regressions, you probably know better than I do. He scratched his cheek at her intense gaze. It wasn't like he had done it on purpose. It couldn't be helped. He had needed someone to lean on, and they had become connected because their feelings were mutual. It was the same with Adele and Merigen, just like it had been with Adriana in this life. If Adriana hadn't arrived in the north a little sooner, we wouldn't be able to see each other. If Adele Ygritte hadn't poured all her mana into you, if Adriana, upon hearing about you, hadn't immediately headed to the northern fortress, if you hadn't finished off all the demons, many things would have crumbled. A miracle. That was how the goddess explained why he was still alive and he couldn't refute it. A miracle that could only occur when all the gears meshed perfectly. He couldn't deny it. He understood his situation. He was still alive thanks to Adriana, who happened to be in the north, but he wasn't in any condition to wake up. In this situation, there was probably only one thing the goddess wanted from him: to listen to her story and end the situation. In other words, to kill the four dragons. Then what am I supposed to do now? He asked, sitting down, and the goddess smiled quietly and spoke, wearing a seductive expression that Adriana could never make. I'll tell you now, the northern wind was colder than ever. The biting wind, like a winter gale despite it being autumn, cut at their cheeks and the soldiers shivered. It wasn't just the cold weather that made them feel this way. The news of Robert Taylor's death alone was enough to bring another wave of cold to the entire region. So what happened when the adjutants, all wearing somber expressions, gathered? Lothos, his eyes bloodshot from lack of sleep, spoke. He had heard that the saint had arrived, but he didn't know what had happened after that. He was already uneasy about having formed a rebel army to march on the capital, and now they had to stay in the north for a week in this state. He felt like his blood was running cold. If this much time had passed, there should have been some reaction from the capital, but nothing had happened so far, which was also unsettling. He didn't deny that things could only start moving once Robert Taylor woke up. The expression he had seen on the Grand Duchess's face last time was one he had never seen before, even after spending so much time with her. Anyone who would suggest marching on the capital after seeing that must have something wrong with them. The only consolation was that nothing had happened yet and that Robert was still alive thanks to the saint's help. Even though he hadn't woken up yet, everyone thought he would recover soon if the saint was with him. There's still no sign of him waking up. Is that so? What about the Grand Duchess? She's a mess. She's been by his side every day, refusing to eat, so she'll probably collapse soon. Anyone would think they're married. They needed to put aside such hopeful fantasies for now. After all, the Grand Duchess wasn't in a good state either. The saint was also holed up in Robert's room, refusing to come out, and if they left things like this, both of them would surely break down. He wanted to come up with a solution, but he felt helpless, trying to revive the two of them while Robert lay unconscious. What should they do? The adjutants who spoke all wore dark expressions, and the fact that he was the only one who could make a decision made him feel even more gloomy. The Adele he had seen last time had looked like she was on the verge of death. She would collapse like a puppet with its strings cut if he touched her, or burst into tears while looking at Robert's face. It wasn't the first time she had collapsed from exhaustion after crying for a long time. The saint had also collapsed on the spot after seeing Robert Taylor's condition. Police car light, important notice, police car light. Having so many women around wasn't always an advantage. It had become a headache in many ways. If Robert didn't wake up, 2 people would break down, or 3, judging by the rumors. He wasn't sure, but if the rumors were true and he was also involved with the princess in the capital, there will be a series of funerals. No, it's just if Robert Taylor dies like this, the capital might explode. The saint, the princess, and the grand duchies of the north. He wasn't sure how many people could withstand it if those 3 joined forces to kill someone. Of course, that would only happen if they regained their spirits. Lotho sighed, rubbed his forehead, and then had to look up again at the presence he felt from afar. There was no reason for anyone to be running around in the hallway right now, so what gave them the nerve? The door burst open, revealing a soldier panting. It was the same soldier who had reported the saint's arrival, so he recognized him immediately. Lothos, who had asked casually what was going on, froze. Duke Robert, he just woke up. Goddess. Though she wasn't sure if she deserved to call upon a deity, it was all Adriana could say when she first saw Robert's condition. It was a truly horrific sight, a miracle that his soul still clung to his body despite the gaping hole in his chest. Tears welled up every time she touched his cold body. She had braced herself for the possibility of this happening, but the reality was far more gruesome. What happened? How did he sustain such a severe injury? He saved me, that's all. Adele, about to say it was her fault, closed her mouth. She didn't think Robert would want her to say that, and if she did, it felt like he would truly die. Both Adriana and Adele were consumed by anxiety. Robert had started breathing again when Adriana arrived, but that didn't change the fact that he was about to die. If Robert really died like this, could she find a reason to live? Adele shook off the pointless thought and slowly approached Adriana. Robert lay like a corpse. He was so cold that she would have mistaken him for dead if he hadn't been breathing. A chill ran down her spine every time she touched his body. Robert, who had shielded her and herself, who could only watch had he been planning to die like this, she was furious. She wanted to grab him by the collar the moment he woke up. But her feelings of guilt and affection were stronger than her anger. Her trembling fists clenched, then loosened, and Adriana, who had been watching Adele intently, moved her lips. You should rest for a moment. You look exhausted. I'm fine. I wouldn't be able to sleep even if I lay down. I understand, but there's nothing more foolish than blaming yourself. Robert wouldn't want that either. Whoosh, the light emanating from the saint's hands seeped into Robert's body. The divine grace she had received directly from the Pope granted her greater power, a miraculous power that could even save someone on the verge of death. Adriana's face paled as the gaping hole in Robert's chest slowly closed. Cold sweat trickled down her face. How much would fate be twisted by saving someone who was dying? Of course, this miracle would prevent the consequences from deviating too much, but she didn't know how long she could maintain this healing. Adriana, panting, checked Robert's condition again. The gaping wound in his chest had completely closed. It was only superficial. To completely heal his shattered heart, she needed more power. For now, Adele's mana was serving as a substitute, but she had to heal him, even if it meant pushing herself. Adriana coughed up blood and stumbled back. She rubbed her blurry vision, grasped the floor for support, and then slowly raised her head, feeling a hand supporting her back. It was Adele. You told me not to push myself, but you're the one pushing yourself too hard. To return your words, I don't think Robert would want this either. It's a situation where I have to save him, even if it means pushing myself. Can't be helped. Adele sighed softly, seeing Adriana wipe the blood from her lips. She knew that the saint was the only one who could save Robert, but she hadn't intended for Adriana to push herself this hard. Her own mana was enough to sustain his heart. The reason Robert was still alive was because of Adriana's presence. For some reason, Robert's regeneration had begun the moment Adriana arrived in the north. If you're not going to rest, I'll knock you unconscious. You need to rest until your divine power is fully restored. Adriana, glaring at Adele at her forceful tone, smiled wryly. They were in the same boat after all. There was no need to fight over a man like this. They had to save Robert, especially now. She grabbed Adele's hand and stood up, but she wasn't in good condition. She stumbled several times, pressed her hand to her forehead, then leaned against the wall and forced herself to speak. Then I'll accept your kindness. I'll come back when dawn breaks, so until then I need to rest. Thud. Adriana collapsed in Adele's arms, breathing softly. The amount of divine power needed to regenerate the wound in his chest was equivalent to that of dozens of high-ranking priests combined. It was only natural that she collapsed after handling it all by herself. Adele pondered for a moment, then carried Adriana to the sofa. She should leave her alone until she woke up. She knew it was impossible to keep performing miracles like this. Strange. The words she had said to Robert before the fight with the demons swirled in her mind. The memories of accusing him of being involved with Adriana and getting angry and the uneasy feelings that had proven true made her feel complicated. Now she was just like Adriana, anxiously trying to save him. She smiled wryly at the reality that she couldn't simply like him purely, slumped into a chair and looked at Robert. The wound that had made her shudder was gone. His eyes, which she always saw open, were closed, but she could clearly hear his breathing. How long would it take for him to wake up? Even though she couldn't afford to waste any time, she couldn't just leave Robert like this. When would he wake up? What if he didn't wake up like this? Adele shook her head, dispelling the negative thoughts. It was better not to have such pessimistic thoughts. She noticed that night had fallen when the faint moonlight filtering through the closed curtains touched Robert, and Adele quietly closed her eyes. With her eyes closed, she could hear the overlapping sounds of Adriana and Robert's breathing. The playful voice she was used to hearing was gone. His usually mischievous, smiling face was pale and still in sleep. The thought that this sleep might never end drove her crazy, but Adele, biting her nails, was quite familiar with this feeling. Before she regained her memories, this anxiety would always creep up on her whenever she thought about Robert. Come to think of it, it was all Robert's fault. Was this what he had meant by their bet last time? And when he asked if she would be able to spend the winter with him, had he been trying to tell her that he would find a way to save her? She hated him, but she couldn't hate him. She had come too far to harbor such feelings. If she hated him, she would only end up hurting herself. She buried her face in the empty bed, perhaps because she had cried all her tears earlier. Her eyes only stung, no tears flowing. Idiot. Who was she calling an idiot? It was directed at herself for being saved by him again, and at Robert at the same time. She had so much she wanted to say. She had been preparing to finally convey the feelings she hadn't been able to express before. She hadn't been able to convey even a single one of those things. She knew it was pointless to regret it now. He would wake up, and she knew she could tell him someday, but she felt complicated. He had clearly had the strength to completely avoid the demon's attack, yet he had come to save her and taken the attack that would have killed him instantly if Adriana hadn't arrived just in time. If Robert had died there, she would have regretted it for the rest of her life. Perhaps she might have died there with him. Even though she knew she shouldn't, she had momentarily lost her reason in that situation. Her cautiously outstretched hand touched Robert. He wasn't cold like before. Perhaps because his breathing had returned and his body had regained some warmth, Adele smiled faintly, caressing his slightly warmed hand. Many memories flashed through her mind. The time she had held a sword to his neck when they first met, the time she had ordered him to come to the north simply because she had taken a liking to him, a stranger. And Robert, who had actually come to the north after hearing those absurd words, the fight that had broken out with Bunta. She hadn't been pleased about him forming a connection with the princess, but her heart had skipped a beat when she saw Robert lying there, covered in blood. She had secretly thought he was dead, but who would have known that he would survive and defeat them all by himself? I finally understand why you didn't hate me. She hadn't remembered Robert, but Robert had remembered everything back then. They had been looking at each other from different perspectives. She had been living in the present while Robert had been living in the past. How would it feel if every action seemed to overlap with the past, if she had witnessed the death of such a person multiple times? It was an emotion Adele couldn't even begin to fathom. Many things had changed after she met Robert. She had started to see the rain and the snow. Sometimes she would be lost in sentimental thoughts. Sometimes she would have fantasies that anyone would laugh at, wondering if she should really bring him to the north and make him stay. She had smiled for the first time, held hands for the first time. She had worried for the first time about whether she should possess someone. That hadn't changed even after she regained her memories of the past. Her first time had always been with Robert Taylor, and it had always been Robert who had made her, a woman who had only ever known how to swing a sword like a butcher, realize her own femininity. I had something I wanted to say, but she had missed the opportunity. Adele, holding Robert's hand, quietly took out a small box from her pocket. She had been preparing it for a while, but the saint had beaten her to it. She should have just kidnapped him. Adele sighed softly, reached out, and opened the box. She took out a pair of rings and looked at them for a moment, then slipped one onto Robert's finger. The other one, well, wouldn't it be better if Robert put it on her himself? It didn't have to be a confession. It was a magically treated artifact, so it would be enough if it saved her life once in a dangerous situation. I think I like you, no. She caressed his hand, and her hand slowly moved up to his cheek, more gently than when he had been bleeding in the northwest, recalling her past memories. Adele smiled quietly and added, I think I love you. Even though she knew he couldn't hear her, she wanted to say it now, when the time came. She would be able to tell him properly. Adele renewed her resolve. She held on to the hope of later. As time passed, he felt his body recovering. Adriana and Adele must have been working hard. Miracles weren't something a god created. They could lend their power, but the act itself depended on willpower. About a week has passed in the outside world. I have much to tell you, but time is short, so I'll only tell you the important things. The goddess told him about Kaitl's current state. She said that the assimilation that had begun in the first regression was now on the verge of completely consuming his mind. The assimilation accelerated with each regression, meaning that it was probably almost complete by the time this regression began. Then, the reason the starting point of my regressions was always the same, that was the point when the 4 dragons' assimilation began. Unfortunately, there was nothing I could do besides preventing your assimilation. So, it meant there hadn't been any divine intervention in what he had built up so far. It was a bit disappointing. He could have changed more if it had been earlier, but he couldn't blame the goddess. It was thanks to her that he hadn't been assimilated by the 4 dragons. The 4 dragons are not gods. It's impossible for humans to defeat a deity, but the four dragons were born as magical beasts. Magical beasts like demons. Magical beasts are originally weaker than demons. It's just that the four dragons are a bit special. The four dragons were born as predators. They devoured their own kind, then demons, growing in power, and they even controlled space and time. How could they be treated as mere magical beasts? He couldn't defeat a god. It was a restriction placed upon humans, but the goddess said that the four dragons weren't gods, and this time they're manifesting in a human body. The four dragons' goal is to deny my existence. They're using Keitel to seize control of the imperial family, and the emperor is also practically Keitel's puppet. His soul was taken long ago. The emperor too. He hadn't realized that something was wrong with the emperor. It was because he hadn't been wary of the four dragons when he met the emperor. If even the emperor was in that state, it wouldn't be strange if Murugan was in danger. His eyes sharpened, and the goddess, as if trying to reassure him, spoke quietly. If you're thinking about the princess, she'll probably be fine. She possesses a mind that the four dragons can't easily assimilate, naturally because she inherited my bloodline strongly. Bloodline, not just anyone can be involved in the regressions. Even if you have a deep connection, you have to inherit the power of the four dragons or myself who are connected to the regressions. He understood Adriana becoming a saint after receiving the goddess's power. Murugan had inherited the goddess's bloodline and received the memories, as she had just said. Then what about Adele? The goddess, hearing his question, looked at him as if she was surprised he didn't know. Adele hadn't inherited the goddess's bloodline. According to the goddess, there had to be some kind of connection to inherit the memories. Just where had she inherited them from? Lunatic. One of the divine weapons I created. He tilted his head at the name lunatic, then realized it was the sword Adele always carried and chuckled hollowly. It had seemed unusual, so it was a divine weapon created by a god. It made sense that it was more powerful than most weapons. It wasn't just some nameless sword, but a divine weapon. Then it made sense that she retained her memories even within the regressions. She had wielded the goddess's power countless times, so it must have seeped into her unknowingly. The reason she couldn't recall all the memories, it was because she wasn't a direct descendant. On the other hand, the reason Adriana could see all the memories was because she had received power directly from the goddess, in addition to the casket of memories. Keitel received power from the four dragons, so he must know about your regressions. It was the same in your previous lives. He was trying to kill you. No matter what I did, I always died. That's because he anticipated what you would do. He's not foolish enough to be unable to prevent what he already knows. Then he could understand these countless regressions. It wasn't simply fate twisting things, but Keitel personally ending his life. He felt a little empty, but he thought it was better this way. It meant that everything would end if he just defeated Keitel. Of course, since so much time had passed, he would probably have to fight the four dragons directly. There's not enough time to fight the four dragons. I know, but it's also true that we can't delay any longer. I know you're not ready, but this is your last chance. There will be no more resurrections. Remember that you have to end everything in this one life. He knew, that's why he was saying this. He wasn't hoping for a victory achieved through someone else's help. He was simply anxious. Would it be all right to march on the capital like this? Even if he recovered from his injuries and woke up, he might return to square one and break down. Such thoughts sometimes crossed his mind. The goddess looked at him and smiled faintly, but that didn't alleviate his anxiety. Yes, it was his duty. He had started this, so he had to see it through to the end. Being anxious wouldn't change anything. Time continued to flow even now, and Adele, Adriana, and Murugan were waiting for him. He took a deep breath, and his mood improved slightly. He felt his completely healed chest and quietly raised his head. The space began to collapse. The sky, which had been filled with white starlight, was once again covered in shadows, and the ruined temple began to crumble. The space shattered like scattering dust in the blowing wind. Little by little, he frowned at the fading presence of the goddess, and the goddess, still with Adriana's face, smiled faintly and spoke. Even her voice, similar to Adriana's, bothered him. It was a little gentler than the Adriana he knew, but its essence remained the same. Perhaps Adriana's voice originated from here. Adriana is happy to have met you. In the countless repeating cycles, the chance for her and you to connect was only possible once. Is that so? It's a blessing. I assure you, it's a once-in-a-lifetime connection for both of you. Unlike the other women, her eyes turned cold when she mentioned the other two, suggesting that even she couldn't help but feel affection for her child, but he couldn't differentiate between them now. They were all precious to him, and that was why he could throw himself away for them. The goddess's eyes narrowed slightly, as if she understood his feelings, but it was only for a moment. Her fading form signified the disappearance of her power, and the goddess sighed softly and moved her lips. This is as far as I can help you. I've told you everything I needed to tell you, and the solution to defeating the four dragons is already within you. The solution. You can do it. I wouldn't bet everything on something impossible, so the proof tap. The goddess's finger touched the area where his heart was. He flinched at the cool, refreshing shock and stared blankly at the goddess, feeling the power flowing through his heart. It felt like something that had been empty was being filled. This must be his heart regenerating. The child I entrusted everything to will succeed. I have no more regrets. Are you disappearing completely? I'm not disappearing. As long as there are those who believe in and remember me, this name will remain in the heavens. A time may come when I'm forgotten, but I will at least be able to witness the end of everything. Then there was no need to mourn her disappearance. It would be troubling if the goddess, who looked exactly like Adriana, disappeared. He met the eyes of the goddess, who was fading faster after giving him her power, but he didn't add anything. Police car light, important notice, police car light. What she had said was enough, and he had a feeling that words wouldn't change anything now. The world crumbled. The mindscape shattered, the goddess completely disappeared, and silence returned. He carefully took a step forward onto the winding white path that stretched out before him. He would probably wake up when he reached the end. It was time to wake up. A ring. Adriana, noticing the ring on her finger after a week had passed, looked at Adele. Although her eyes reflected nothing, Adele coughed slightly, thinking that those clear eyes looked particularly cold. I put it on. There were some things that happened. I'm not saying this to blame you. It's just it seems like you've finally become a little honest. The fact that Adele, who had been hiding her feelings the most, had done this meant that things would change considerably once Robert woke up. The strange tension between them would probably disappear. Instead, it was highly likely that a more blatant situation would unfold. Well, that wasn't what Adriana was worried about. After all, she was the one who had taken Robert's first time in this life. It was a thought that would horrify Adele, but Adriana sighed calmly and gently stroked Robert's forehead. When will he wake up? His wounds are healed, but he hasn't regained consciousness. He'll wake up soon, I believe that. How wonderful would that be? She chuckled, but she couldn't bring herself to smile genuinely, so Adele forced a smile and slowly touched her forehead. In that silence, she heard a very faint sound. A sound no one else noticed, the sound of life returning. Thump. In the darkness, Robert's life force began to return. What had he thought when he first saw the light? A child wouldn't have many thoughts as the dawn broke before his eyes. He must have wanted to live well. The frail young lord, having lost his mother early, faced countless hardships as he grew up. His fingernails were pulled out, he bled, his flesh was carved. Even amidst the searing pain, he hadn't forgotten his mother's teachings. Trust people even though their nature is inherently evil. How could he have given up so easily? It was attachment. He couldn't abandon his attachment to his own belief that all her teachings were right. He repeated the path he knew was wrong, and he crossed the easily passable path with difficulty. He wasn't a saint. He wasn't that great of a person. He was just someone who had been lucky enough to have the opportunity to regress. He had accidentally come into contact with the power of the four dragons, and perhaps someone would pity him. It wouldn't have been strange if he had broken down during the regressions, and if the goddess hadn't intervened, he would have been corrupted by the four dragons and ravaged the world. He had fallen in love. It hadn't taken him long to realize it was a one-sided infatuation, but his heart hadn't been broken. His first unrequited love had been painful, but the rekindled relationships were sweet enough for him to cling to the impossible dozens of times. He had challenged a twisted fate, knowing it was twisted. He didn't have to protect them, but he had grown stronger, intending to die before them. He had gripped the sword, and with that sword he had seen the end. It was refreshing, perhaps because it was the first time he had felt that way while regressing. He could finally move forward. He had gone mad from the unchanging fate, even after dying several times. He had torn at his own throat, tortured himself, wishing for eternal death. Did he still wish for that death now? Well, Robert chuckled, finding his own thoughts absurd. At first his goal had been peace. Now it wasn't. He had formed countless connections, and this incident had made him realize something clearly. That the connections he carried his own life weren't so light. He still had too many attachments to die without regrets. He couldn't act thoughtlessly. He admitted it. This sacrifice had been too reckless. He could have blocked the attack with only minor injuries. If he had combined his mana with Adele's, they could have ended it with only minor injuries. He had been blinded by the name Adele. He had valued his own life too lightly. Amidst the clearly crumbling light, the man who had been a duke sighed. The collapsing space, a space where only fragments of light remained, buried amidst darkness. Everything in existence was mixed together. A mindscape, the inner world of someone who had experienced not just an ordinary life, but 100 regressions. Could it be considered normal, even if it only contained fragments? Simply observing it gave rise to enlightenment. Just feeling it allowed him to take a step forward. And if the owner of that inner world, the one who had lived through those times, directly confronted it, he couldn't regain consciousness immediately, even as the space crumbled. The energy he had received from the goddess, the icy energy that had been buried within his heart, began to circulate throughout his body. It was cold and chilling, like a winter wind, but within it there was Adriana's kindness. Like Merigen's playful smile, there was a unique charm. The coldness, like the winter wind, reminded him of Adele. It might be embarrassing, but he couldn't help but feel complicated emotions whenever he thought of the three women. He had long abandoned the thought of choosing just one. He would either die or take all three of them with him if possible. It's not like I'm greedy, but it had to be that way. He couldn't let anyone feel left out and sad. If he accepted the feelings of all three and it caused conflict between them, he would leave the continent altogether, to a place where even Adele couldn't find him. There were also distracting thoughts he had in the mindscape. He acquired knowledge he hadn't known before. He discovered techniques he hadn't seen, opened pathways for mana he hadn't found. The sword, something he had grasped to protect. That's why he had to be stronger than anyone else. Was he the strongest now? He wasn't enough. He was far from being able to defeat the 4 dragons, far from being able to defeat all the demons and remain unscathed. He couldn't grow physically stronger just by swinging his sword in the mindscape. Even if his body grew stronger, it would only slightly increase his strength. What he needed was to fully reach the enlightenment he had only faintly sensed. His breathing grew ragged. As the mindscape crumbled, Robert's energy fluctuated. It was the same in the real world. His heart pounded, energy overflowing. The mana that had started as a small spark now surged, filling the room. Adele and Adriana's faces paled. There weren't many emotions that flickered in their trembling eyes. Confusion and a glimmer of hope that Robert might be waking up. What if he didn't wake up? That couldn't be. As that conviction passed, their hands reached out to stabilize Robert's mana. Thump, thump. A beating heart meant flowing mana. If the heart stopped, the mana would stop too. Robert, sensing the external influence, actively circulated his mana. He found techniques amidst the hundreds, thousands of imagined sword swings. He could sense the power of the 4 dragons within the energy the goddess had infused him with. Great evil could easily manifest just by sensing its power. It obscured the mountains, covered the sky. The earth trembled with its roar. Even beasts went mad just by meeting its gaze. Its scales couldn't be easily pierced by a sword, and even the most powerful mages would struggle to defend against the smallest flames the dragon conjured. "Saint, what's going on? I think he's about to wake up." As Adriana calmly replied, Robert's body showed signs of revival. Flames flickered from his perfectly healed body. The life force within his heart, which even the saint's miracle hadn't been able to replenish, surged forth, circulating throughout his body like a newborn child. It was different from before. Power close to resurrection was surging within his body. Whether he could endure this process and wake up depended on the synchronization of his inner world and reality. The mana they wielded had to be perfectly aligned. It was dangerous. If he failed, the two would be separated, forever unable to harmonize. How could they achieve perfect synchronization unless their hearts were connected? An ordinary person wouldn't even attempt it, but Robert and Adriana simply circulated their mana without hesitation. Through the heart to the legs, through the legs to the arms, through the arms to the chest, through the chest to the head. It would be hard to find something more difficult, but the weight of their accumulated connection made it not so difficult. Now they could understand each other's feelings just by hearing each other's voices. Rumble Adele enveloped the room with her mana as Robert's mana erupted. Others couldn't be alerted to this commotion. The inner world where Robert existed was also collapsing at an accelerated rate, but his enlightenment was also rapidly filling up. He was moving towards the realm he hadn't been able to reach before. The realm beyond the wall he was only now glimpsing because he hadn't realized he had talent. He had learned and mastered countless techniques he hadn't known or seen before. But techniques weren't important in defeating the 4 dragons. Return to the origin. He wouldn't be able to defeat the dragons simply by knowing how to grip the sword or how to swing it. The moment he thought about his will to kill, something responded. His tightly closed lips twisted into a smile. He had a feeling. The enlightenment that had seemed so distant was now approaching as his body throbbed. Sword, body, mind. Countless images surged forth of how he had gripped the sword, how he had swung it, with what intentions he had cut. It didn't take long for them to become one and blend together naturally. Light flickered in his empty eyes. Like a flower bud blooming, as the surging mana calmed down, Robert's breathing gradually stabilized. He was coming back. He wasn't foolish enough not to know that, and Adele, wearing a complicated expression, tightly gripped Robert's hand. With a hand that didn't have a ring, she held his left hand, which had a ring. What would he say when he woke up and saw his finger? What is this? She imagined him throwing the ring away in disbelief. Would he really do that? Perhaps he would be offended. It was a confession she had made without his knowledge while he was unconscious. It was her wishful thinking that their feelings were mutual. He might have feelings for another woman. In fact, he might have already done so with the saint or the princess. "I prefer Muradin. I prefer Adriana." Adele gasped, her expression hardening. It wasn't easy to hide her killing intent from Adriana, who was beside her. What should she do with the saint if that happened? If it had been before, she would have acted immediately, but her wild nature had been tamed for a while now. She wouldn't act rashly, especially if it was something Robert would dislike. Adele could endure anything for him. Twitch. As the mana completely spread, Robert's body began to move slightly. His mind and body were becoming one, and his consciousness was about to return. There was no need to hold onto his mana any longer. His body revived, his mind returned. Robert's eyes opened in the completely vanished mindscape. He no longer needed his inner world. It was time to return to the world. His body twitched more frequently. Adriana quietly held back the tears that threatened to spill. It was better to act normal. It would be embarrassing if she looked too eager to see him. Robert. Finally, the twitching stopped. His eyelids fluttered open, revealing his blue eyes. Adele rushed to his side and grabbed his hand. It was so fast that Adriana, who hadn't learned martial arts, couldn't even react. His voice, hoarse from days of silence, was heard, and Robert, realizing that Adele was in front of him, smiled faintly. He had a lot he wanted to say, about the ring on his finger, about what he wanted to say to Mergen and Adriana. Of course, he wasn't planning to say it now. It would be enough to say it after everything was over, but he could at least answer her. His expanded senses allowed him to perceive the world differently than before. He knew where the other ring was without even looking. He sat up naturally, reached out, and took the ring from the box. Police car light, important notice, police car light. He took Adele's hand, which was frozen in place, and slipped the ring onto her finger. Adele's eyes, which had seemed to be living in a world of stopped time, finally blinked. She looked as if she couldn't believe the ring on her finger. An illusion, a hallucination, it didn't matter. Even if she died now, Adele felt a euphoria strong enough to make her die smiling. I think I like you too. Why yes. Me too, I like you. Although it was something he was saying to another woman in front of the woman whose feelings he had already accepted, what could he do? Since he had to accept the feelings of all three women, he had to be prepared for this. Robert chuckled, looking at Adriana, whose aura had turned noticeably colder, and moved his lips. He wasn't planning to apologize. Such a time hadn't even existed, and it was enough that he had answered her the moment he woke up. Let's move forward. He would defeat the 4 dragons and end this chaos. It was time to end his 101 lives. No matter what the outcome might be, Robert wanted to end everything within a week. Robert had awakened. The impact of this event was naturally immense, filling everyone stationed in the north with joy. Aside from being the Grand Duchess's lover, his single-handed defeat of 2 demons alone made him incredibly valuable. All eyes were on Robert as he rose from his bed, though in reality, he was being held captive by Adele and Adriana, unable to move. It had been a day since he woke up. He hadn't been able to move immediately after regaining consciousness. It wasn't uncommon to be unable to move after dying and coming back to life. His intention to depart immediately was thwarted by the 2 women. They didn't even have to say anything. Robert couldn't move after seeing Adele draw her sword. Do you think I'll let you go? If you truly believe that, then cut me down and leave. I also object to you leaving immediately. I can't let you go. His body had fully recovered, but the 2 women's worries hadn't subsided. Adriana's clear eyes held a faint madness, and he couldn't say anything after hearing her calm voice. This was also a chance to confirm what he had gained, so it would be all right to move a little slowly, but he wasn't planning to delay indefinitely. Robert, rising with Adele's support, focused on assessing the current situation. He desperately wanted to contact Murugan, but he didn't know how Keitel would react if he did so now. The other methods weren't without risk either. If he contacted Murugan in any way, Keitel would likely do something. After a moment of contemplation, Robert sighed, took Adele's hand, and stood up. You could have stayed in bed. There's no time for that. Rest is rest, but we have to decide what to do now. We've been delayed a lot. We might be too late by the time we reach the capital. A week. Although it had been spent recovering, he couldn't deny that it was lost time. If he couldn't move around to make up for this lost time, it would be better to reorganize the north with Adele and complete their preparations. He smiled faintly at their worried gazes and gently stroked Adele's hand. He could do this naturally now, with Murugan, Adele, and Adriana. He didn't know how the 3 women would accept their future relationship. Slowly adapting them would be the best method. If he continued like this, wouldn't it become natural for the 4 of them to live together eventually? He hoped that time would come soon, a time when he could confess all these thoughts, a time when he could simply indulge in such lighthearted fantasies. They were almost there. Robert took a deep breath, and the cold air filled his lungs. He was worried about Murugan, but it couldn't be helped. Even if he rested, it would only be for 3 days at most. He had to complete all preparations and march on the capital within that time. I think I need to see Lothos first. He probably handed over command while taking care of me. I won't deny that, but are you planning to take all the soldiers with you? If the Crown Prince doesn't make any moves, it would be better to disband them. Robert shook his head firmly at her words. Even if he disbanded them, they would all die if he couldn't defeat the 4 dragons. And the most important thing was, the Imperial Palace will likely be completely destroyed by the time we arrive. It would be better to assume there's no chance of recovery. We'll be severely short-handed. We'll likely be the ones fighting on the front lines. Robert glanced over the dust-covered table, then looked towards the square where the Imperial Palace was located and moved his lips. We'll need the soldiers after we defeat the 4 dragons. If the capital is almost completely destroyed, the northern troops will be the ones rebuilding it. Wouldn't it be meaningless to continue defending the north? That's true. Having been branded as rebels, their only option was rebellion. Even if they hadn't intended to, they had to do it. The shrinking of the Empire's territory was probably a predetermined future. Even if he defeated the 4 dragons, it would take a considerable amount of time to recover from the damage. Adele, understanding Robert's words, nodded quietly. Since she understood that there was no other way, there was only one thing left to do. I'll gather the troops. That's all right. That's enough. As Robert turned his gaze, dark clouds gathered in the sky. It hadn't been long since he had coveted the titles of King Emperor. It was because such desires had vanished at some point. How many people would covet something they already possessed? Keitel chuckled quietly. The soldier's corpse being dragged along the floor bothered him, but it wasn't something he needed to worry about. Everyone in the imperial palace would die today anyway. Your Highness, what in the world? As flames engulfed the imperial palace, the ministers began to enter one by one. It was better this way. He wouldn't have to go looking for them to kill them. He had dealt with all the masked figures. They hadn't been of any help despite calling themselves a grand organization named Illusion. It was about time to kill them all. It seemed he had handled Robert well too. That was enough. Without Robert Taylor, this world would be his once again. Once again, a question flashed through his mind, but a red glint flickered in his eyes and calmness returned. I will ask you. The aura emanating from his sword was unusual. He had already cut down all the knights guarding the imperial palace. There were no more skilled individuals who could stop him. Even if there were, he could just unleash the demons. Robert had managed to defeat 2 of them, but he still had 2 left. Will you follow me? He held his sword to their necks and counted. 1, 2, 3. He beheaded those who hesitated and slowly listened for their answers. Those who would follow him, those who wished to be killed. He didn't kill those who wished to be killed. Would he grant such a wish to those who desired death? He simply severed their limbs and threw them somewhere. If they didn't follow him, the price would be pain. Kairal muttered softly, his eyes now filled with a red aura. His head was dizzy, and he could hardly control the impulses surging within him. There was something there. But there was something he had to do before he could figure out what it was. Since when had he desired to become emperor? He didn't know, but it felt right to kill the emperor now. He was simply acting on that impulse, without any reason, simply following the commands of something deep within him. Kairal's unfocused eyes scanned the burning imperial palace. The place he had watched since childhood now looked horrific. The people lying around him, they were all corpses he had killed. Among them was his teacher, the one who had taught him academics, the principles of knighthood. Don't kill the weak. The crown prince always prioritizes the nation and its people. Then where were his people? Emptiness. Kairal stopped abruptly at the sudden emotion. He was right in front of the door to his father's chambers. What was he doing? As his fading reason returned and he looked around in confusion, something in his mind whispered. Of course, he didn't hear it, because those were the last words Kairal could utter. In his fading consciousness, it wasn't Kairal who rekindled, but another being. The red glint no longer flickered in his eyes. His golden irises were simply dyed red, naturally settling in as if they had always been that way. Silence fell as Kairal, who had closed his eyes, opened them again. A perfect silence where even the groans of the fallen couldn't be heard. He liked this. Kairal, or rather the being who was no longer Kairal, smiled. The light shining through the automatically opening door bathed Kairal's body, and black smoke rose as if burning. Damn moon, Kairal muttered, shielding the light with his hand as he walked forward. Beyond the door, the emperor, his father, sat on the throne. No, he wasn't his father anymore. He was just a creature created by the goddess. Kairal, brushing off his body, which no longer burned in the light, looked at the emperor. The emperor was calm, as if he had known this would happen. The retainers around him were all dead. As expected of you, astute. Did you know all this would happen? Since when have you been pretending to be my son? Pretending? You've noticed something strange? I'm more pleased than I thought. Then you must have also known that you were being played. The emperor didn't answer, but his clouded eyes held regret. Kairal, seeming to realize something from that emotion, cackled. He had realized it too late. It was all too late now, but perhaps he had resisted to some extent because he was of the goddess's bloodline. Kairal, no, the being impersonating Kairal. Just who are you? I thought you had a vague idea, but I suppose it's easier to deny it. It wasn't even interesting, the typical reaction of those who followed the moon. Kairal, dragging his sword along the floor, slowly approached the emperor. Until he reached the foot of the throne and stepped onto the stairs, the emperor stared at Kairal with wide eyes. Finally reaching him, Kairal looked at the emperor, chuckled, and ran his hand over the emperor's heart. Police car light, important notice, police car light. He could feel the faint remnants of Kairal's consciousness. Well, it wasn't his concern. He couldn't contain the joy he felt from this. Destruction was his instinct. Kairal, exhaling a turbid breath, followed his inherent instinct as naturally as a human breathed. He was getting tired of the emperor, who still hadn't said anything. If you're not going to answer, Slice Kairal casually kicked the cleanly severed head and roughly pushed the cooling body. The body tumbled down the stairs with a thud, and a new owner stepped towards the empty throne. How many times had he properly sat here? He no longer felt anything. But this time was a little different. It was the time when all the conditions were finally met. The fact that the timeline hasn't collapsed yet means he's still barely alive. Or the goddess has pulled some strings. It was the only possibility of his death, but conversely, it meant that everything would be over when he personally dealt with it. Kairal, not hiding his red eyes, glared into the void, or rather, the 4 dragons glared into the void. I'll be waiting. Robert Taylor. The 4 dragons chuckled lowly. The imperial palace had never burned before. Whether invaded by foreign enemies or during rebellions, had its thick, magically reinforced walls ever been breached and burned like this? Some said it was the resurrection of the 4 dragons. Others said the goddess of the moon was angered, that the imperial family was cursed. Murugan didn't deny either. The resurrection of the 4 dragons, the curse on the imperial family, both were true. Her escape from the imperial palace had been a near miracle. She had made a scene, demanding to be let out in a frenzy after hearing of Robert's death. Murugan, gently rubbing her aching chest, quietly looked out of the carriage. If it weren't for the church's help, I wouldn't have been able to escape. I'm eternally grateful. There's no need for thanks. The saint relayed the message, so please express your gratitude to her directly when you arrive in the north. She had realized long ago that her brother was no longer the person he used to be. Recalling Robert's memories had played a significant role. The Keitel she had seen there had been undeniably strange. She would have been a fool not to notice. She had a headache. Even though she didn't believe Robert was truly dead, if the rumors were true, she had repeatedly considered contacting him but had stopped herself each time. He was probably alive. She simply believed that he was alive. Regarding the current occupant of the imperial palace, the person she was facing was the Pope himself. The moon-worshipping church had decided to evacuate to the north. Since the saint was already there, the church hadn't hesitated. The Pope cautiously asked about the being residing within the crown prince. It seemed like it was no longer trying to hide itself. Murugan sighed softly, nodded, and answered. It's probably the 4 dragons. It would take that much power to create the flames that burned down the imperial palace. Although the capital had never been breached, there had been several rebellions. But the imperial palace had remained intact because of the magical barrier protecting it. The fact that it had been breached meant that the protective barrier created by the goddess of the moon had been broken. Who else could do such a thing but the 4 dragons? The Pope sighed quietly, but nothing changed. There was only one solution to this situation: defeat the 4 dragons. But how? With the goddess's power weakened, he couldn't be certain of anything. Their best hope was Robert Taylor, but the church, not fully aware of his power, couldn't help but feel uneasy. There were probably demons among the subjugation force this time. Robert said so we'll have a better idea of the situation when we reach the north. I pray that everything goes well, but everyone in the carriage knew that the chances of that were slim. We have to march directly to the capital. We don't have much time left. He was aware that the energy of the artifact embedded in his chest, or rather its influence on him, had intensified. Adele nodded in agreement. Adriana also knew that his words, though dangerous, weren't wrong. The 4 dragons would definitely be resurrected. They might have already been. 3 days had passed since he woke up, so he couldn't stay here any longer, using rest as an excuse. They would use the portal in the moon tower to travel, but the soldiers' movement would be delayed as much as possible. He, Adele, Adriana, and the adjutants would move first, and the soldiers would follow later to the capital to handle the aftermath. He had discussed this beforehand, so those who wanted to leave had already left. The remaining people were all prepared for the final battle with the 4 dragons. They had to prepare. Adele and Adriana didn't seem to object to his actions. The problem was Murugan, but that had been somewhat resolved by the urgent report he received yesterday. Her Highness is coming this way, right? That's right. I contacted the Pope earlier. The church in the capital coming this way was a positive sign. Did the label of rebel even matter anymore? But the church was important for how the people would perceive them. It was funny that he was already thinking about the future after defeating the 4 dragons. What else could he do? If he couldn't defeat the 4 dragons, there would be nothing left. No survivors, nothing to hold on to. They would be taking a big step towards the apocalypse, so it was best to think positively. It was his role to defeat the 4 dragons. Dealing with the remaining demons was also his duty. The only consolation was that fighting the demons wouldn't be as difficult as before. The enlightenment he had gained from meeting the goddess of the moon and his time in the mindscape had definitely taken him a step further. He was incomparable to his past self, who had simply boasted about reaching the pinnacle of swordsmanship. He felt confident that he could finish off the Minotaur in one blow if they met again. Of course, it was a feeling only he could perceive, and Adele and Adriana's gazes held a considerable amount of worry. It would be easy to alleviate their concerns with a few words, but if he stayed silent, he didn't know what might happen, so he spoke slowly in the quiet room after the others had left. Aren't you worrying too much? Anyone would think I'm about to die. It's natural to worry. You already died once, and in front of me. He was speechless. He smiled faintly and gently placed his hand on Adele's shoulder, about to blame herself again. That won't happen again. Shall we make a promise just in case? He took Adele's hand and linked their pinkies, and Adele, startled, tried to pull away. Of course, he didn't let her. He stopped her from withdrawing her finger and gently intertwined it with his, and only then did her hand relax. Adele frowned slightly, staring at their linked fingers. She wouldn't like it, of course. She knew better than anyone that a forced promise like this had no effect, but he wanted to do it anyway. It would give him motivation. It was his way of solidifying his resolve. This won't bring back the dead, Grand Duchess. Adriana chided her, and Adele finally sighed and looked at him. He remembered the first time they met, in this life, that is. Back then he had only seen interest in her eyes, but now, seeing only worry, he found it quite amusing. He gently stroked her cheek, and she tilted her head like a puppy, making him burst into laughter. Who else would know that the Grand Duchess could act like this? If he had more time, if he had more leeway, he would have said more, made a more reliable promise. As he let go of her hand, Adele seemed to understand what he was about to do. The shadow that had momentarily fallen over her expression disappeared quickly. He had to leave, to the imperial capital to defeat the 4 dragons. It would be nice if he could meet Muradin and go together. He suddenly turned his head towards the presence he felt from afar. Muradin and the Pope were definitely coming this way. He didn't sense any danger around him, so he could just leave and face the 4 dragons. It would be better to leave together, but it's better for me to go alone. I don't think the 4 dragons will appear from the beginning anyway. The 4 dragons would send the demons they controlled first, and only then would they reveal themselves. He had already wasted a lot of time. The imperial capital might be completely destroyed. If he wanted to save even a few people, it was better for him to go first. He gripped the sword Muradin had given him, and the blue blade was revealed. It was definitely different. With this, he wouldn't be defeated by the demons. Adriana and Adele looked at him. He knew how they felt as they sent him off. That's why he would definitely return alive. He wouldn't die. He was tired of dying over and over again. I'll be back. Step. He took a particularly heavy step forward. No one answered. Perhaps because they were afraid their emotions would burst forth if they spoke, he also remained silent. He walked through the silence, past the soldiers who looked at him, down the quiet hallway. There was no one waiting at the portal Adriana had used. Perhaps it was because she had come alone. With the entire church having passed through, no one knew when the portal would collapse. He looked at the portal, shimmering with blue light, and closed his eyes. He would arrive in the imperial capital as soon as he passed through, and he would have to head straight to the imperial palace and deal with the demons. He refined his plan in his mind, the plan he had been thinking about since he was in the mindscape, the things he could do with the level he had reached. By the time he opened his eyes, his pounding heart had calmed down. He took a deep breath. He stepped forward and threw himself into the portal, his mind cold and clear. And when he opened his eyes, he was in the basement of the church, a space he had visited with Adriana once. Fragments of a broken rosary were scattered in a corner. He knelt down and touched them, and a familiar feeling welled up. Had Adriana used this? He chuckled softly and put the fragments in his pocket. He would think of it as a talisman. He could do anything to calm his mind before the battle. His hand, fiddling with his sword, trembled slightly. It's okay. Everything would be all right in the end. There would be no more tragedies in the future. Hadn't the 100 lives he had repeated, the tragedies he had experienced, all been orchestrated by the 4 dragons? The path he was walking now was to erase all of that. He repeated "it's okay" several times, and his senses seemed to sharpen. He heard something, the sound of something burning. He emerged from the basement, and twilight greeted him. It was late enough to be considered night, but the sun, refusing to set, devoured the moonlight. The starlit darkness disappeared, and only the blood-red sky remained. He looked at the burning flames, the completely ruined church, and drew his sword. 101. He had wanted to die. He had resolved to die to end everything completely. Hadn't everything he had wished for been for eternal rest? His lips twisted into a natural smile. He had believed that death was the only way to end life as a comedy. He had always walked towards death. Now it was different. He wished to live. He had too many people to protect. He could no longer choose death for himself alone. If his past self, the one who had just regressed, saw him now, wouldn't he say that living was a tragedy? The light emanating from his drawn sword stretched towards the sky. The radiance covered the red sky, momentarily restoring its blue hue. It was a signal to the 4 dragons that he had arrived. They would surely know now that he had returned alive. 100 tragedies. They were all just pieces needed for a single ending. It was time to move forward, towards his, or rather their 101st ending. So this is the thought form you developed. Yes, we believe it originated from beyond this dimension, but the 4 dragons first discovered Keitel when they sensed his intention to use their thought form. Before Robert's lives began to repeat, desperate to escape the trap set by the goddess of the moon, the 4 dragons hadn't thought much of Keitel. There had been countless humans who tried to use them. It was intriguing that a follower of the goddess of the moon would try to use them, but they simply assumed his body would collapse, unable to withstand the power. By this time, they had already established a general understanding of the concept of regression. They had found a target to initiate the regressions, but the goddess's interference, preventing them from fully realizing their intentions, was the biggest problem. Since 2 targets were needed for the regressions to continue, they had to find another person who could withstand the flow of time, separate from Robert Taylor. The 4 dragons, having forgotten about Keitel, dismissed him. They simply thought they would sense the thought form again in a few days. It had been a long time since they had contacted the imperial family, but they had never achieved any results. Time held no meaning for the 4 dragons. A few blinks of their eyes and months would pass. After letting a couple of months pass, the 4 dragons finally sensed something amiss. A human was successfully harboring their thought form, allowing them to faintly connect with human senses. It was a sensation they hadn't felt in 1,000 years. Trapped within the flow of space and time, even the slightest touch felt like pain, a tingling sensation on their skin, and the 4 dragons chuckled softly. They had finally found it, a human to become their sacrifice. Robert Taylor had to repeat the regressions. Originally, they had planned to completely break his mind through the regressions, but after embedding the regression stone within him, they realized the goddess of the moon had interfered. They had inadvertently created their own downfall, but they couldn't give up on resurrection. They had to be alive to do anything. Now that the thought form had been implanted, they planned to slowly assimilate Keitel while Robert Taylor repeated the regressions. His fiery personality was also helpful. The greater the emotional turmoil, the wider the cracks became, so they spent their time eliminating those around Keitel. His teacher, for example, or the ministers who had long supported Keitel. It was quite entertaining to watch the human blame everything on himself, to see him slowly descend into ruin, unaware that he was breaking down. The desperate struggle of a passionate human trying to achieve his dreams was rather amusing. Sometimes he would lose control and hold a sword to his own father's throat, or execute his younger sister, who pitied Robert. At first, it had only been confinement, but as the four dragons' thought form grew stronger, rampages became more frequent. Unification of the continent. The previous emperors had also spoken of such things, but they all died by my hand. Their senses had mostly returned. The goddess of the moon's power had faded, unable to bind them any longer, and their thought form implanted within Keitel's body was growing stronger. The more Robert died, the stronger they became. They were gradually regaining their former power, waiting for the time to destroy the empire created by the goddess. The emperor who had unified the continent, the warrior who had reached the pinnacle of humanity, the swordsman who had reached the pinnacle of swordsmanship, the mage who had created the grimoire containing the essence of magic. They had all died by the hand of the four dragons. And hadn't they been the ones to kill hundreds of demons and leave only 4 alive? They knew that their nemesis was gradually growing stronger, but they weren't worried. He was still weaker than them, so they had used Keitel to kill him whenever he tried to twist fate. They had been relieved when his spirit broke and he repeatedly killed himself, but they had also seen him take up the sword again. Why wouldn't he break? Keitel, who had even forgotten his own dreams, was no longer of interest to the four dragons. Robert had finally achieved what he desired. He had reached a level no other human had ever attained, and no human would be able to defeat him. If they were going to kill him, they had to do it early in his regression, but as time passed, Robert began to avoid all such attempts, as if he knew their intentions. They wondered if the goddess had intervened and searched for her presence, but they couldn't sense it. Then how? It was strange. Whenever he was about to break, he would form connections, and Robert Taylor would rise again, fueled by his emotions. He would unleash unbelievable power whenever he neared death, like the heroes of the past, like the leaders of humanity who had challenged the demons from the demon realm. He was stronger than them, his spirit firmer, but they didn't feel threatened. He was just at the level of a demon after all. The four dragons knew that his sword couldn't reach them. They had been somewhat relieved that Robert, having experienced 100 deaths and begun his 101st life, desired death. But the four dragons, having completely taken over Keitel's mind, chuckled. It was a hollow laugh. The imperial palace, obtained by eliminating all their followers, their plan finally complete, they had thought they had reached the end. They had believed they would succeed perfectly, even with Robert Taylor in the picture. You've managed to survive. They hadn't expected him to defeat 2 demons and reach this point. The flash of light stretching towards the sky was undoubtedly Robert's mana. Robert was the only human who possessed such pure mana, that level even demons struggled to reach it. The expressions of the demons watching also hardened. They probably knew better than anyone that they would die if they challenged him. They were nothing but meat shields if it wasn't for them. Had that goddess interfered after all? The four dragons clicked their tongue and slowly rose from the throne. It was still too early to manifest in their dragon form. They needed at least an hour to gather the necessary power. How long would it take for Robert to arrive here? The four dragons' brows furrowed slightly as they estimated the time. He would arrive within minutes at most. Even 2 demons attacking him simultaneously had only resulted in mutual destruction. The power they sensed from Robert now was on a completely different level. What are you going to do? The 3-headed wolf asked. Considering that the remaining one wasn't much help in battle, this one was the only demon who could stand against Robert. The 4 dragons stroked their chin with their slender hand and sighed quietly. Why wasn't there a single useful one among them? If they just had an hour, they could easily crush him. He probably didn't come alone. The saint who was with Robert and Adele Ygritte, whom they hadn't been able to kill in the north. They couldn't sense their presence now, but they would surely arrive soon. They weren't planning to touch the portal beneath the church. They would just have the demons attack it when they arrived. The crack, which had deviated slightly from their expectations, had widened and was now threatening to strangle them. They would have planned more carefully if they had known this would happen, but they no longer had the power to turn back time. They had used up all their time-manipulating power for their resurrection. Their red eyes scanned the void. A powerful presence felt from afar was approaching them, tearing through the air, shattering the army of the dead they had raised. They recalled the first time they met Robert. Had they known they would be facing each other like this back then? The 4 dragons descended from the throne and slowly walked forward. They sent the 2 remaining demons in different directions and shaped a bone from their arm into a sword. It was a sword they often used when fighting in human form. 5, 4, As the countdown continued, the four dragons' gaze shifted to the ceiling. He was coming quite boisterously. Well, it was natural, considering he desperately wanted to kill them. By this point, the four dragons no longer thought of it as buying time. They would win anyway. Their characteristic arrogance resurfaced, overwhelming their other emotions. Thud. As their countdown reached 0, a human figure appeared, crashing through the shattered ceiling. The human, enveloped in a white light, looked like a demigod. Perhaps that wasn't wrong. From this perspective, the four dragons looked more human. It's been a while. No, is this the first time you've seen me? The four dragons chuckled. Robert simply stared at them silently. Many emotions surged within him, but strangely he felt calm. He didn't know why, but his mind felt frozen cold. It looked like Keitel, but it was just a shell. Within it, the four dragons recited, "I'm impressed by you, human. Honestly, I didn't think you would endure all those regressions. Ordinary humans break down, unable to withstand even a single death. You know that they can't even endure torture, let alone death. I acknowledge it, that you are the strongest among humans. Daring to raise your sword against me, yes, I'll forgive you. But of course, that doesn't mean I'll let you live. Everything ends today, right here." When the four dragons first appeared, they hadn't killed humans for any particular reason. Did a human have a purpose when they stepped on an ant? They hadn't particularly desired the world's destruction. They had simply removed what was in their sight. It had grown into this. A massive wave they hadn't even imagined had finally reached its peak. How could they not be amused? Rumble the dragon's heart, a heart only a dragon could possess, pulsed, and a light even brighter than what Robert had unleashed enveloped the world. The light, containing the essence of the sun, began to melt the imperial palace. Amidst the slowly melting ruins, the four dragons spoke. "I know you've come to stop me." This massive dragon loved amusement and pleasure. The four dragons, finally recalling what they had initially sought, cackled. Blood trickled from their lips, staining Keitel's white clothes. "Then try to stop me." Twilight, the only time when light and darkness coexisted. The hourglass flowing towards destruction was flipped, heralding the end. "I didn't want to see you like this." A simple sentiment, yet the emotions it contained were quite complex. He had spent most of his life filled with hatred for Keitel. He sometimes wondered if it was strange, but since Keitel was the one who had killed him, wasn't it natural to feel this way? He had hated him. He had hated him so much that he had thought countless times about plunging a sword into his throat the moment he saw him. He had imagined decapitating him instantly upon meeting, and he had often fantasized about making Keitel suffer all the pain he had endured. He had thought that rage would consume him the moment he saw Keitel's face. "I should have investigated a little more. Foolishly, I didn't think he'd be inside himself. What does it matter now? Keitel is gone." Keitel was dead, truly annihilated without a trace of his soul remaining. Knowing that, he felt a slight sense of emptiness. He had so many things he wanted to say, so many memories he had experienced. A strange pity bloomed for the soul that had been tormented by the four-winged dragon for centuries. Of course, he knew it didn't matter now, so he didn't bother dwelling on those feelings. He focused on the sensation in his hand, on what he saw with his eyes, and simply faced the dragon. Since everything would end if he killed the dragon here, he would simply swing his sword and cut it down. The dragon seemed to realize this as well. It closed its mouth, which had been about to speak, and stared intently at him. Its crimson eyes were different from Merijan's, a scarlet close to the color of blood. Afraid of being tainted by the madness within them if he looked any longer, he slowly raised his sword and slashed through the air. The power he gained from the mental space was indescribably potent, faster and stronger than when he called himself a sword saint. The ceiling of the imperial palace, already crumbling and destined to collapse, was cleanly sliced through. The dragon's eyes, fixed on the falling debris, flickered with a strange light. It seemed impressed by human prowess, as if observing something quite intriguing. "I sometimes wondered, if a single life form held infinite potential, could it one day rival me? Is that why you appeared here? I don't exist simply to kill, rather. It's better to explain it this way." The smiling face, borrowing Keitel's body, was quite grotesque. He had certainly seen that familiar face smile like that several times, but because the personality within was different, he couldn't help but feel a completely different impression. "The reason for my existence is to break the balance between the gods. For example, if there is a moon goddess and a sun, my purpose is to eliminate a god by destroying the sun." Crack. The debris lightly crushed underfoot instantly blackened and burned. The dragon's power wasn't limited to space and time. It controlled all aspects of death, a power usurped from a god that once existed. The dragon flicked its tongue and chuckled, reminiscing. "The reason I want to kill the gods is simple. It is simply to stand above all things: death, the sun, the moon, and even space and time. Most of the elements that make up the world were mine, and once I find the moon, everything will finally be mine." Swish. Following the dragon's finger as it sliced through the air, the already fractured imperial palace crumbled further. However, unlike his own clean cut, the destruction was less precise. Slightly surprised, the dragon added, "The reason I killed humans is simply because I considered them accessories of the world. Do you care about the ants you step on when you pick up a stone? It's like that. To be precise, that's what humans were." The mana circulating within him grew denser, and the deepened mana flowed into his sword, forming a shape. The sword that cuts all things. The sword, given only a hilt, held infinite possibilities depending on the wielder's power. As if bothered by this, the dragon blocked the radiating energy with its own magic and smiled wryly. "It seems you're not amused, judging by your expression. There's no reason to be." Perhaps because his expression darkened considerably, the dragon sighed softly and drew a sword from its own hand, a bone-white sword. It looked more sculpted than forged, and he could clearly sense it was a flawless masterpiece. "And so, facing you, my thoughts have changed slightly. After encountering Robert Taylor, that thought shifted a bit. Since you are the only human who can find value if I erase you, there will probably be no one left to hinder me." The finely trembling magical power was intense and overwhelming. He had thought the dragon hadn't fully recovered its strength, but even this much, he had reached a certain level of mastery so he could face the dragon's power objectively. This was dangerous. "It's simple. If you kill me, you will achieve what you desire. If not, I don't know why you ask when you know very well." What he desired, he hadn't thought about it clearly yet, but what he had to do here was extremely simple: kill the dragon somehow. With that thought, he thrust his sword forward. It took only an instant for it to be blocked in midair. Kia Jia Kwang, the wind, unable to withstand the speed, exploded and a strong tremor resonated. The dragon couldn't transform into its dragon form yet. Then he would finish it before it could. With that judgment, he lunged again, his attack seemingly close to the mark. The dragon, with a troubled expression, furrowed its brows slightly and a faint red light flickered from its mouth. "Oh dear, I didn't expect you to attack like this. You should have been more careful." The twitching eyebrows returned to normal, and the dragon, wearing Kaital's characteristic sly smile, moved its lips. It twirled the sword that had blocked the attack, returning its point to its original position. Confirming that it was back at the starting point, the dragon slowly gripped the sword. "It can't be helped." Suddenly, he saw the illusion of his face being pierced. He desperately tilted his head to dodge, and the pillar behind him exploded. Was the sword something that caused explosions? He barely had time to glance at the cleanly round hole before the next attack came, and he slowly raised his sword to block. The trajectory wasn't complicated. If he responded calmly, he could block it. The problem was that the force behind the attacks was steadily increasing, and the dragon's intentions were clearly revealed through the sword. Unskilled, yet quickly adapting swordsmanship was noticeable. Did that mean it was learning human swordsmanship? He frowned slightly, his breath misting in the air. If possible, he needed to move quickly. Nothing had changed in the goals he had set for himself. He swiftly darted between the dragon's raised sword, half a step. The distance between the swords wasn't that great, so even that small gap was enough to plan something. It wasn't for nothing that footwork was considered crucial in swordsmanship. One breath, one beat. If he could just take one step faster than the one swinging the sword in front of him, the opportunities he could create were endless. Talent. When he finally encountered what he believed he lacked, he realized something. He could read so much in a single moment that his crude senses couldn't process it all, so he had simply assumed he lacked talent. The blink of an eye, the brief moment before sweat dripped to the ground. The information he could read within that time was vast. He felt as if time slowed down as he processed it. The direction of the dragon's sword, its intent, its power, and whether he could deflect it. Deflecting is unlikely. He assessed what he could currently achieve, how much damage he could inflict if he thrust his sword forward. Amidst the storm of information flowing like an electric current, the thought that arose was simple. One syllable: possible. As soon as he made the judgment, the flow of time returned to normal, and he thrust his sword towards the dragon, who was pulling back. It wasn't an illusion. The dragon's skin was as hard as scales. He was trying to cut not a human, but a dragon, so it was only natural. Therefore, the only way was to explode his mana, concentrating everything on the tip of his sword. For a moment, the mana flowing through his body surged outwards. Like wings, the exploding mana propelled him forward. Ugh-grrr rumble. Even if it didn't tear, the impact was certainly there. The force penetrating beneath the compressed skin would definitely take its toll. His body, constantly pushed back, tore through the imperial palace, through the buildings in the street, and continued to destroy everything in the imperial city. Kwang. The distance he was pushed along the extended road was considerable, but still, the dragon's toughness remained unbroken. He couldn't help but admire it inwardly. Supreme hardness. Well, a dragon should at least be this tough. The corners of his mouth twisted. For a moment, admiration for the dragon flickered, but then the memory of what the dragon had done flashed through his mind, turning the admiration into rage. The mana that bloomed like wings accelerated him further. The speed amplified to the point of tearing the air, and once again the mana concentrated at the tip of his sword. He realized that a small amount of blood had spurted only after the dragon's expression hardened slightly. Shock and bewilderment. Seeing the supreme being with such an unfamiliar expression brought a smile to his face, so it could make such a face after all. So facing you with a sword was arrogance. A sudden wave of energy enveloped his body. Police car light. Important notice: police car light. The dragon, covering its bleeding body, silently wiped its face and slowly rose from the shattered debris. Fragments rained down. the debris falling from its skin and onto the ground piled up high enough to cover the surroundings. Hundreds of meters from the imperial palace, after being hit by a blow that pierced and destroyed everything in its path, all it suffered was a few drops of blood. The thought of how to kill this thing made his head throb. He was about to grasp his sword and attack again when my power hasn't fully returned, but it seems I underestimated you. I commend you. You are the first being since the goddess to wound me. Crack, wings began to emerge from between its grotesquely twisted spine. The human-shaped body shattered, the skin tearing, spilling blood and spinal fluid. It was losing its human form. It meant he was facing the scenario he least wanted to see. A dragon, a creature that existed only in legends and myths. A ferocious and cruel being said to be so powerful that no one who saw it ever survived. The moon hanging in the sky was completely obscured. The dragon's massive body blocked the little light that remained, plunging the surroundings into darkness. Finally, he could only sigh at the sight of its majestic form. The dragon, the four-winged dragon, now fully transformed, met his gaze. When faced with a dragon, human reactions were never varied. They trembled in fear, submitted, or simply gave up on life. He had wondered what it would feel like to encounter a creature of myth. Even if it was the being he had yearned to take revenge upon, he couldn't ignore the fear rising from deep within his heart. A dragon, the being he had waited for so long. Why did the resolve he had held so tightly, the promise to cut it down, waver even for a moment? Was it because it defied common sense, exuding an overwhelming pressure with just a glance? He gritted his teeth. It had simply become a dragon. Nothing had changed. He was still at disadvantage. He reassured himself with this thought. Kraya the dragon, its wings now fully unfurled and then folded, turned its gaze back towards him. The arrogance in its eyes was understandable. A dragon whose mere flight could erase mountains, whose breath could incinerate a nation, even such exaggeration seemed fitting. Because this was the four-winged dragon, he gripped his sword. Hiding his fear, he filled the void with his surging mana. He mustn't falter. He had to face this dragon with the single-minded intent to cut it down. Turning doubt into certainty, with the mindset of ending the 100 repetitions of waiting he had endured. He wouldn't retreat. He stepped forward, gripping his sword tightly. He sliced through the wind pressure from the dragon's wings and faced the shadow that enveloped the entire imperial city. Could he do it? It was time to put aside such questions. He had to do it. Come to think of it, today, he belatedly remembered that today was always the day he died. Perhaps it looked like a grand play. Though each person fought for different reasons, their eyes, united against a single enemy, held a common solemnity. Some fought to protect the imperial palace, their lifelong home, others to protect their loved ones. He simply wanted to break this seemingly eternal cycle, but his purpose didn't seem to matter much to those who had reached this point. Murujan stared blankly as the imperial palace, boasting 1,000 years of history, burned. She seemed to have much to say as she watched him fight the dragon, but she couldn't speak, preoccupied with the demons swarming the soldiers. Flames roared, and the remnants of buildings turned to ash, swirled in the wind. It was a moment long enough for the word apocalypse to flash through everyone's minds. The moon set, and the sun, brimming with heat, rose, eclipsing the moon. An eclipse, surely this was the moment the dragon had been waiting for. He faltered. Everyone who had made it this far felt fear again as they looked at the dragon. Even Adele, Adriana, and Murujan, who had never wavered in their belief that they could win, seemed unable to hide their feelings in this moment. You must be struggling to even stand. Why not give up? Ha! He was breathless. All he could do was slash at the dragon's wing joints, but he couldn't guarantee it would change the tide of the battle. Perhaps it was foolish from the start to try to slay a dragon with a few swords. He knew that, and yet he had charged in. It was harder than he had imagined, and a laugh escaped him. The dragon watched him chuckle. Being reflected in eyes as big as a person was a strange experience. How amusing it must be for the dragon to see something so small challenging it. Just imagining the dragon's perspective sent chills down his spine, and the sword in his hand trembled. So, could he defeat it? He was close, but the damage he had inflicted was minimal. The power he gained from the mental world, the sword he had made his own, the sword Murujan had given him couldn't withstand any more magical power. Even though he had infinite time, the sword he had crafted was insignificant against a dragon. He clutched his throbbing head and stared at the ground. He calculated his next move, listening to the sounds around him. What would happen next if he stayed still? He closed his eyes, pondering this. It would be all right just for a moment, he thought, trusting that the people who had come with him could endure that brief respite. He heard countless sounds. The screams of soldiers dying while fighting demons, the sobs of the clergy listening to their cries. I don't know how much longer we can hold out. At this rate, not even an hour. We have to defeat the dragon. But he smiled wryly at Adrian's hesitant voice, then chuckled at the sound of Adele running. It suited her personality to run instead of wasting time talking. What had he changed? In the lives he had lived, what had he changed? Within his broken and shattered mind, hope bloomed again. The boy who had been trapped in the swamp of despair had finally experienced change in his countless repeated lives. Those who had tormented him no longer existed. Teresa, Yuria, he reminded himself that they now meant nothing to him. What he had built, the reason those who should have died were alive here. Wasn't this the result of his relentless efforts? The feeling he felt now wasn't emptiness nor complaint, it was far from that. He felt strangely good. He gripped his sword again and slowly rose. His knees at their limit creaked in pain. He tore off the burned scraps of his clothes, his body covered in cuts and burns, and faced the dragon once more. He didn't know why. He didn't know why the pressure he had felt at first had completely vanished. Perhaps his body was so broken that he couldn't even feel that pressure anymore. Life is a cycle. The deaths and births of people are connected like threads, woven like knots. If someone lives, another must die. Had he killed someone to save everyone else? Was he now, by killing this dragon, moving towards another act of saving someone? It doesn't matter. He would live a little selfishly. Saving everyone was something heroes did, and he wasn't that grand, nor did he have such ambitions. It was enough that the people he cared for were alive. If he could save them with his power, if he could protect them, wasn't that enough? In which life had he first harbored such desires? In a past he could no longer recall, he had first resolved to protect. He had wandered after realizing that resolve was a lie, but in the end this was where he found himself. Facing the dragon, standing before it, sword in hand. If this wasn't an opportunity, what was? What he held in his hand wasn't a sword, but a chance. A key to see tomorrow, to move beyond the past that always ended today. All that remained was one swing. Are you giving up? No, never. There was a level of mastery he had always dreamed of. A mere fantasy, a what-if scenario where he wouldn't have any worries if he could just do this. Amidst the muddled thoughts in his head, a thrilling sensation surged and that past fantasy resurfaced. Intent, what was he doing now? He was trying to cut down what was in front of him. Who? The answer was, of course, the dragon. What he held was a sword. The purpose of a sword was to cut. Was that enough? A sudden breeze wrapped pleasantly around him. It carried the scent of flowers, though there were none. The air, which should have been scorching from the flames, felt cool. Even though it was probably an illusion, it felt real. His body felt strangely light, and he felt like he could do anything. He delved back into his thoughts. Swish, the sword, infused with mana, had long since shattered, unable to withstand the power. The unbreakable sword was merely a tool to test his limits. It was probably right to assume that no sword remained that could withstand his power. Of course, that didn't mean he would give up. A sword is a sword. Why did a sword exist as a sword? It was a tool for cutting. Its sharpness and pointedness merely made the task easier. Was a sword truly necessary to cut? No, there was no need to define it so narrowly. It felt like something blocked within him had burst open. An intense energy emanating from his heart spread, pouring out towards the sky. He wasn't the only one who felt the difference this time. This time he could see a clearer path. In a monochrome world, a space painted in black and white, the only thing that moved was the hilt of the sword falling downwards. There was no blade, it had already broken. But for one who held a sword, for one who had reached that pinnacle, yes, for one who would be called a sword saint, shouldn't they be able to cut even with a twig? He would cut. Fueled by that single intent, the flames of his will roared like a raging storm. He crossed space, cut through the wind, and moved forward. He barely registered the heat engulfing him. Was that someone calling him? In his hazy vision, he felt nothing. Hadn't he said it? He had poured everything into this, and now there was only monochrome. He swung his sword as if falling forward, like when he first imitated the movements of night, just like that, slowly. Only the sword swinging forward was clear. Everyone on the battlefield witnessed the dragon's fall. They stared blankly as Robert Taylor's single sword stroke split the sky and cleaved the monstrous being. The dragon's expression, frozen in the moment it was bisected, held only shock, but no one cheered. Too much had been destroyed. They stared blankly at the full moon rising beyond the split sky, then at the dragon lying dead, cleaved in two before collapsing to the ground. They had no strength left to rejoice. The moment the dragon vanished, the demons dispersed as well. Adriana speculated that the contracts bound by souls had been broken. Perhaps when the four-winged dragon disappears, they all disappear. Just like the dragon said, they were probably contracts tied to its soul. If that's the case, Adele slowly walked towards where Robert lay. He looked as if he might collapse at any moment, and she couldn't leave him like that. She planned to take him back to the north anyway. With the capital in ruins, it was likely that others would stay in the north for a while. With both the princess and the saint in the north, well, it might as well be the capital. She was relieved to find him still breathing, but then she frowned at the sight of his blood-soaked body. She wished he hadn't pushed himself so hard to the point of completely exhausting his mana. You've always worried me sick. Ever since way back, the reason she cried was always Robert. The reason she was hurt was always Robert. She had thought she had no particular connection with men, but now she realized that most of her countless lives had been intertwined with Robert. Adele stroked Robert's unconscious cheek and smiled faintly. It was over. Robert's worries, the lives that always ended today, were no more. With the brilliantly shining full moon so clear, there was no need to harbor such worries anymore. Now it was finally over. Good work, Robert. The life of a man, once filled with bad endings and tragedies, had finally been saved by himself. Adele kissed his forehead. She wore an uncharacteristically gentle smile, a refreshing smile like the breeze, like a gentle tailwind.
Hello, everyone. As we wrap up this video, I want to share a quick note. I have a Patreon account. If you'd like to support me and enjoy on-demand audiobooks, you can become a Patreon member. Alternatively, you can check out my Google Drive link, which has 500 plus novel audiobooks available through my Ko-fi or Patreon shop. I appreciate your support.